Criminal masterminds. We've seen plenty of them, whether that be in real life, at the theater, or on the television sets in our living rooms. From the Zodiac to Hannibal Lecter to Light Yagami and Gus Fring, we can't help but obsess over them, even though they're the utter scums of the earth. There's just something alluring about watching a man operate outside of the law, befuddling and discombobulating enforcers of the law at every turn. Now, at the core of every master criminal is an intelligent mind that can whip up intricate and airtight plans to achieve whatever it is they want to do. Steal gold, or cover up a murder, or scare a bunch of people off of a spooky island to steal your employer's inheritance. Every plan they make needs to be thought through and impregnable, but malleable to any unforeseen complications. Naturally. This leads us to Scooby-Doo. There are very few franchises I've been a fan of for as long as the one following a group of meddling kids and their talking Great Dane. Yes, that's somehow supposed to be a Great Dane. But this dog's design is easily the most iconic part of the franchise. I mean, it's named after him, what else did you expect? Most people can also recognize the rest of the Mystery Incorporated gang along with a handful of the more popular staple monsters, primarily from its earlier days. However, what tends to go underappreciated are the men and women beneath the masks of these spooky and sometimes goofy creeps and creatures. Part of this, I think, is because of how frankly stupid a lot of their overall schemes end up being, though there are a couple of good ones in there. So I figured it would be fun this Halloween if I highlighted some of the guys and girls behind the ghosts and ghouls in this franchise by evaluating their overall master plans. Now, seeing as how there are literal months worth of Scooby-Doo stuff to watch, trust me, I've run the gauntlet once before and have no desire to do that again anytime soon. I'm going to focus on what I consider to be the classic era of the franchise. In other words, I'll be taking a look at the pre-Scrappy-Doo cartoons, namely Where Are You?, the new Scooby-Doo movies, and the Scooby-Doo show. And if this video does well enough, or frankly if I just feel like it, I'm going to do another installment next Halloween. But for now, you, me, and my handy-dandy whiteboard that is filled out like a report card, kind of. I don't know, it's also like a tier list. Who knows? We're all going to be evaluating every single Scooby-Doo villain from the classic era.
Scooby-Doo, where are you?
We begin at the beginning. Despite being an incredibly basic idea and design, the Black Knight has really become a cornerstone monster of the franchise, appearing in everything from live action to Lego to Velma. Oof. Sorry, guy. But of course, we're here to talk about the man under the mask. Before that, though, I'm gonna let you guess who from our lineup of suspects is the dastardly criminal. There's Wickles, the museum curator, and that's it. That's the only suspect we have. Who could it be? Yeah, early Scooby-Doo tended not to realize the importance of having multiple suspects, or any suspects at all, really, in a mystery. Anyway, Mr. Wickles is the curator at the County Museum in Nondescript Town, USA. He also runs an underground black market scheme with a gang we actually never see to sell off many of the museum's priceless paintings, replacing them with handmade fakes. However, a wrench gets thrown into the midst of this perfect system. Archaeologist Dr. Jameson Hyde White comes over to Nondescript Town, USA to personally deliver a suit of armor to the County Museum. Now, why an archaeologist would be used as a simple delivery service, I have no idea. For some reason, he's also familiar enough with paintings to be able to immediately spot that these are in fact fraudulent. So Wickles does the only logical thing to counteract this. He shows up to the train station, slips into the armor before it gets loaded up on Hyde White's truck, and kidnaps the guy on the road to ensure he doesn't expose the forgery scheme. The curator then leaves the armor behind in the driver's seat to lend credence to a curse he creates that it comes to life every full moon. He also hides Hyde White in an Indian effigy exhibit to silence him. This is when the Scooby Gang gets involved, stumbling upon the crime scene and then finding Hyde White's inspecting spectacles that have fallen on a jade statue, prompting further investigation, petty trespassing, and most importantly, a whole lot of property damage. In order to ensure his criminal activities stay secret, Wickles once again dons the Black Knight armor in an attempt to either scare the kids away or maybe also kidnap them. Either way, he does a pretty not great job as he gets run over by a plane that somehow is still functional despite being on display in a museum. Now, before actually evaluating Mr. Wickles' plan, we must establish that there are simply things we must accept as a part of Scooby-Doo. A, the criminal's first resort for their crime will always be to dress up as a monster or ghost, no matter how practical or impractical such an action would actually be. B, the criminal will never actually kill somebody. We'll see later that they'll attempt murder, but they'll never actually succeed or do it when they have somebody at their mercy. And And see, the criminal will almost always behave like a silly goober and play along with gags while they're in costume. These things in my mind don't take away from the actual merits of their plans, they're just unfortunately stuck in a kid's comedy cartoon, so they're forcibly neutered a bit. Which, to be clear, I do enjoy. That all being said, Mr. Wickles' scheme is kind of rough. He's got a decent racket going on at the museum, although he's going to be stuck with a very limited supply of paintings to sell. That's not to mention that there are definitely going to be more people after Hyde White who show up at the museum with the ability to spot the fakes, without their inspecting spectacles even. And I highly doubt there are enough Indian effigies to hide them all. But let's give him the benefit of the doubt that this is a scheme that is designed to only last a short amount of time, long enough to get the paintings all sold off before he goes underground like I think most competent criminals would do. That's not to say I'm giving out advice, by the way, just to cover myself legally. All of that's going to be behind the paywall. Wickles' plan to get rid of Hyde White preemptively before he can expose the fake paintings isn't too bad either, until you realize he hid the guy inside the museum itself, in an exhibit no less. Frankly, I'm surprised that nobody noticed that there's an exhibit that moves its eyes, breathes, maybe even spits out muffled cries. If Wickles is going to hide Hyde White inside the museum, would it not be better to put him in the secret room where people are less likely to find him? Or better yet, just stow him away somewhere else where no one would accidentally stumble upon him. As per the rules, I will give Wickles a pass for not just killing the guy, which would have erased the problem altogether. Maybe he was planning on letting Hyde White go once he was done selling the paintings, but it's just idiotic to leave the archaeologist sitting there for anyone to find. If not for this really bad hiding spot, I'd be willing to give Wickles credit as a criminal mastermind, but unfortunately, he hid a hostage inside of a museum exhibit, the place in which he's working and also committing crimes. That's gonna have to dock him some points and land him a C grade. Oh, and while we're here, why does Wickles punch one of his paintings? That's either thousands of dollars down the drain or a lot of labor hours that are gonna have to be made up. There's goober activities for sure, and then there's just randomly assaulting your merchandise. Next, we have the ghost of Captain Cutler, who in reality is Captain Cutler. Hey, do what you know, I guess. Cutler runs a ship hijacking scheme with his wife, stealing fancy yachts from the local marina of Rocky Point Beach and taking them to a hidden underground cavern with his little mini-sub, where he repaints them presumably to sell on the black market. Now, to ensure no one would suspect that he's doing this, Cutler and his wife faked his death in a boat collision with one of these fancy yachts, claiming to come back from the grave for revenge. This would then throw some confusion into the investigation into the boat disappearances, as some would indeed blame Cutler, or rather his ghosts, for them, while the actual authorities would never properly consider him a suspect, nor would they think to investigate some Bond villain hideout in the cove. And while it isn't explicitly explained, I do think you could read into Cutler's motivation being a little more personal here, if you want to believe that the boat collision was actually real and it was only afterwards that Cutler came up with this whole plan, seeing as how he's only targeting expensive luxury yachts and ignoring local fishing boats. This means that his scheme could very well be a form of class warfare. Again, it's not explicit, but there's some interesting things to read into there. Back to his actual plan, though, it's pretty solid. He waits for the cover of fog, steals the yacht out of the marina with his mini-sub, which also makes them look like ghost ships to further the idea of his curse, takes it to his hideout where hardly anyone would think to look, repaints it, and does whatever he does with it afterwards, all while everybody thinks he's dead, avoiding suspicion in the process. It's pretty airtight. But then he makes some mistakes. You see, on one fateful night, Cutler decides to restock his air supply in the graveyard of ships instead of his hidden base, where it'd be easier to switch them out. Don't tell me there's not enough storage space in that massive cavern of his. But you see, the reason he does this is so he can bump into the Scooby Gang as they have a nighttime beach party. Luckily, some glowy seaweed called Phosphorum pyrophoria rubbed off on him, giving him this ghostly glow that he then capitalizes on by trying to scare the kids off while having his wife pretend to be an amateur witch who brought her husband back from the grave as a vengeful ghost. So while the decision to stash his air tanks underwater in some ship wreckage wasn't all that smart, he did pivot decently enough. And then he randomly decides to go get those air tanks from the shipwreck while the gang are investigating. He tries to trap them before leaving a trail behind for the teen sleuths to follow to his secret hideout, where they proceed to trap and expose him. We were this close to an A+, Cutler. All he had to do was stash his scuba tanks away inside the base, and this would have been a really good criminal plot. Look, it's not as bad as, say, hiding a hostage within a museum exhibit, but it is reflective of a critical failure of planning that's going to deduct him some points. Captain Cutler's going to get a B. It still passes, but, you know, there's room for improvement. We're staying seaside with the guy only known as Phantom, because I guess Ghost was too basic and generic. Once again, I'm going to give you a chance to guess who the culprit is by giving you a list of suspects. Alright, you guys got your pen and papers ready? Because this is gonna be intensive, alright? There's nobody. There's no suspects in this episode. Guys, this is a whodunit. There needs to be some who's who could have done it. That's how whodunits work. What are we doing here? The man under the suspicious white sheet is the infamous magician Bluestone the Great. His plan is a simple one. He heard about some rumors back in 1612 notorious pirate captain Vasquez hid his treasure in a castle on Haunted Island named after himself, and the mad magician traveled there to search for it. For some reason, he brought all of his magic equipment with him, but luckily he gets to use it all when the Scooby Gang gets marooned on the island after they decided to go boating during some heavy fog. Using his magical wits and trickery and some actual real magic, I think, like flying carpets and spontaneously spawning dummy heads that look exactly like members of the gang, Bluestone rigs Vasquez's castle to seem haunted to scare them off. And he does it quite convincingly, even spooking the usually unflappable Velma and Fred.
There's a very logical explanation for all this.
Quick, tell me.
The place is haunted.
Thanks a lot.
It's also heavily implied that he just enjoys doing this kind of stuff. You have the iconic goofy laugh, the fact that he proudly shows off and explains how he did some of his tricks, his Wild West standoff with Scooby, and even his inclusion in some shenanigans and banter with Shaggy.
Which way did they go?
They went that way.
Oh, thanks, man.
It's alright.
It's this love of the game that does eventually do him in, as Scooby-Doo is able to use his John Wayne routine to rage bait Bluestone into a trap. But the question remains, is the magician a criminal mastermind? I mean, his goals are pretty small scale and simple, but his plans work for his purpose. Heck, they barely qualify as criminal. All he does is put on a white sheet and scare some kids. Could be close to a hate crime, I guess, but that's about it. Granted, the cop who detains him says that he's a fugitive from the law wanted in multiple states, so off to the slammer with him. Back to the plan itself, it works for what it is. Bluestone wants to scare some teens away so he can look for the one piece in peace, and uses his skills in deception and trickery to do so. It's sweet and simple, though technically not criminal, so to play it safe, we're gonna give him an A. We're sticking with the scare schemes with the minor 49er. Who out of these two do you think he is? That's right, the guy wearing the same exact clothes as the monster or ghost or immortal panhandler or whatever this guy's supposed to be. Hank is a caretaker at the Gold City Ranch, the only currently running business in the ghost town the ranch is named after. He had at some point discovered that there was a secret elevator hidden in the lobby of the local hotel leading down to the abandoned mines, which were boarded up once all the gold dried up. However, Hank found something far more valuable than gold down there: oil. He mapped out the locations of these liquid gold deposits and hid the information inside of a cigar store Indian so that his boss Big Ben wouldn't find it. In order to keep all the profits, Hank capitalized on a local legend revolving around a miner moaning deep in the mines as he looked for the gold and donned the laziest disguise in Scooby-Doo franchise history to scare everyone off. It's literally just a floppy hat, a fake beard, and some stilts. Anybody could pull this off. This would effectively bankrupt Ben's business, allowing Hank to buy it and all other property in Gold City for pennies on the dollar and hold sole ownership of all the oil in the mines. Unfortunately for him, Shaggy gets Mystery Incorporated lost in the Mojave Desert on their way to Indian Springs. He tries to scare them off as he's done for others in the past, but these kids are a little more stubborn, running him over with a fake train and exposing his schemes. They also call him this:
Goonie Miner!
Once again, the pure simplicity of simply scaring bystanders sells our suspect's schemes quite satisfactorily. Hank wants that liquid gold for himself, so he pretends to be this immortal moaning miner to keep others away. As an additional benefit, he lowers the value of the properties of the Gold City businesses, which would enable him to scoop them up cheaply and become the sole proprietor of the town. The Scooby-Doo wiki claims that Hank didn't do anything illegal, but that definitely counts as some sort of fraud or grand larceny or some sort of illegal business practice, right? Where's Harvey Birdman when you need him?
Your Honor, I have here in my hand Defense Exhibit... What were we up to? 3, 4?
This plan is a pretty solid one, with the only thing I could really call stupid is that Hank himself doesn't do a good job at covering up his identity, which is especially crucial as he lets a lot of witnesses get away, all of whom could likely identify him as the bearded weirdo chasing them around town. However, this is still Scooby-Doo and Monster Mask magic is a thing, so I can't really take away points for that. It's a dumb disguise, but in terms of the plan, it's really airtight, so he's gonna get an A+. The simple schemes continue on with the Indian witch doctor, aka Buck Masters. Mr. Masters is the proud owner of a show-bred dog named Big Red. In preparation for an upcoming dog show, he decides to kidnap the 3 dogs that pose a threat to Big Red's ascension to canine kingship. But first, he kidnaps his own dog to throw suspicion off of himself, while leveraging his perceived plight to warn the other owners in a bid to get intel on their dog's schedules. All of that works pretty well, though I personally think it's retarded to commit crimes to rig a dog show of all things, but hey, I guess that this industry is ridiculously serious about their work, especially seeing as how dog show crimes would be used again later in the franchise, multiple times. Now, going from here, things get a little wonky for old Buck Masters. He decides to hold all the dog-napped pups in an old abandoned Pueblo village in the desert. Hey, I get not wanting to keep stolen property near you. I just got done getting onto Wiggles for not doing the very thing, but it seems a little much to hide and also care for these dogs all the way out in the middle of nowhere. I guess that does ensure that no one would ever hear the dogs barking, or if they got out, they wouldn't really go too far. Even though literally no one would ever come close enough to discover this whole setup, Bucky Boy takes one more step to scare off any person willing to drive out to a cliffside American Indian ghost town. He capitalizes on racism, weaponizing apparently latent Wild West fears of Geronimo and Indian witch doctors to make sure nobody gets too close to his hideout. See, a gun would be too simple, but with generational racial fears, he truly becomes armed and dangerous. He also refuses to take off this witch doctor disguise even when it's just him, his henchman Mike, and the dogs. Maybe this indicates him being smart, making sure that his only other cohort in crime can't turn him in if anything goes wrong. Or maybe he just loves appropriating American Indian culture, who knows? Either way, it's lucky for him, as his final target, a Great Dane, is replaced by Scooby-Doo as a decoy, which means that our lovable canine protagonist could have identified him right off the bat. And so he smartly decides to get rid of Scoob the second he realizes that this isn't Bob Miller's Great Dane, but some random mutt who snuck in. That being said, I think most of the Indian stuff is pretty unnecessary and only really serves to draw more attention to a location that would have otherwise be left alone. It only really becomes useful if, say, someone decided to use a DIY crossbow to launch an arrow up into the village and climb in there. At that point, yeah, scaring him off with a witch doctor that might also be a ghost isn't a bad move. What is a bad move is how Masters uses these inexplicable secret doors and compartments and stuff to straight up sabotage himself. First, he uses this trapped bench to kidnap Daphne, not a bad start so far, but then he pushes Scooby down a secret chute in the pantry cupboard where the doggo stumbles upon Daphne tied up and the captured canines. So naturally, Scooby frees them all and then randomly grabs Fred and Velma from wherever they were to hunt down and capture Buck Masters. He literally brought about his own downfall. If he didn't push Scooby down that chute, or at least had Mike waiting down there to throw him in a cage, he could have actually gotten away with this whole scheme. But no, I guess not. Also, the grand finale of his plan is the triumphant return of Big Red just in time to win the dog show, which I think would raise a whole lot of suspicion being cast his way unless he pretended to pay a ransom or something. The setup for Buck's plan is fine. It's a little flawed, but it's still workable. However, he proceeds to make some unnecessary and really dumb decisions that actively tank everything he's trying to do. That inherently makes this not a good criminal mastermind plan. There's merits, but not a lot of them. We're gonna give him the D. We now move on to a scheme that is simple in concept, but weirdly extremely complex in execution. Stuart Weatherby lives with his brother and niece at their estate. Wanting to steal their fortune, he concocts a plan where he pretends to be the victim of what I'd presume is the already known curse of Elias Kingston, their dead neighbor. As his ghost, Stuart claims that the Weatherby's fortune actually belongs to Kingston, and if his family doesn't cough up the cash in a couple of days, they'll be made old, which he demonstrates on himself using some self-applied makeup. He also records himself calling out ghostly moans that supposedly beckon him next door. Now, in order to further scare his family into giving up the money, Stuart also plans to further age himself into a skeleton before taking over the role of the ghost of Elias Kingston, take the money, and disappear into a new life as a fortune teller. Way to shoot for the moon there, guy. Personally, I think I would have been satisfied living in a fancy mansion, but hey, you do you, Stu. Now, like many of these guys, a wrench gets thrown into his plans, but it doesn't necessarily come at the hands of the gang this time. In fact, it almost seems like it was part of the plan for the gang to spot Uncle Stuart walking into into the Kingston mansion so as to reveal his aging effect to everyone. And if that wasn't part of the plan, why would he choose to do this when his niece Sharon plans on having guests? Especially since it allows his brother to go get the police in town and leave said friends in charge of the house. But I suppose this becomes fortunate for him as Sharon spots his wig getting blown off by the wind on night 2, forcing him to kidnap his own niece to cover up his schemes. This leaves the Scooby Gang as the only ones who would be able to deliver the Weatherby fortune to him. Though that would also mean that the fortune is easily accessible for anyone to scoop up, so why would Stewart not just steal the money instead of doing this whole wacky plot? I get that this is Scooby-Doo and the bad guy has to dress up, but he could still do the ghost routine as a thief instead of a swindler. Anyway, Stewart then does some weird miscellaneous stuff like tell the gang to give him the money before just casually walking off with the gang watching him go, keeping a guard dog to guard the literal nothing in the Kingston mansion, keeping a book of crystallomacy, which isn't even a thing, in the Kingston mausoleum instead of in the house proper, and rigging a crystal ball to fly around for very little purpose, which also allows the gang to turn the tables on him by magically saving Sharon and turning a closed-circuit camera into a projector off-screen. Again, the initial idea of exploiting a curse to swindle your family out of money is not a bad one, but the more I think about it, the more I realize Uncle Stewart's plan is just full of superfluous nonsense, which may end up including the entire plan in and of itself if it's that easy to get the money. So, with all that being considered, Stewart's gonna have to get a D. Thankfully, we return to the bliss of simplicity with the Ape Man, and this has gotta be the simplest one yet. Carl is the stuntman on the set of The Ape Man of Forbidden Mountain, a movie that Daphne's uncle John Maxwell is making. However, he really wants to play the lead, but seeing as how the lead seems to be a woman, that request is obviously denied. Also, he is a stuntman. You are not there to play the lead actor unless this is a low-budget action flick. Despite these two very logical reasons for being stuck as the Ape Man, Carl decides to have a little temper tantrum, pretending to be the real Ape Man that the locals are scared of in order to sabotage and shut down the production, while pretending that he was knocked out and kidnapped in his trailer. The Scooby Gang decides to investigate, so he decides to try to scare them off to drive the final nail in the coffin of the movie. That's it, that's all there is to Carl's plan. There's no big scheme, there's no underground black market dealings or something. No, Carl just showed up to work one day and said, screw it, let's tank my career. To be frank, I don't really know how to judge this one since there wasn't really a plan here, just Carl irrationally lashing out at not getting his way. He's behaving like a child and nothing more, though I do admire the balls it takes for a stuntman to show up to work in costume, attack his coworker, and then gaslight everyone that he didn't do it. It'd be like if Boris Karloff randomly attacked Colin Clive on set, locked himself in his trailer, and upon being discovered said, "What? The Frankenstein monster must be real." Like, no dude, we saw you assault your coworker. What are you talking about? Now that I think about it, it's basically the hot dog car sketch.
That's clearly your car.
Wrong!
So yeah, I have no idea how to assess this one, frankly. Technically, it's airtight insofar as Carl had an objective and took the most reasonable course of action to achieve it, at least in the realm of Scooby-Doo, where he's contractually obligated to dress up as a monster. He probably should have chosen a monster different from the one he pretends to be on set, but other than that, I guess it's fine. It's just that having a roid rage on set also isn't this grand villain scheme, so I don't really want to give him too high of a grade on par with other criminal geniuses, or at least guys who had greater criminal aspirations. So with all that in consideration, I guess we'll just give him a C as the bare minimum a bad guy has to hit to be a competent plan, because frankly, I don't know what else to do with him. Fortunately, our next monster far surpasses that, and in a weird way showcases a better form of what Carl the Stuntman did. Sarah Jenkins and her brother, only ever known as Mr. Jenkins because I guess men are only allowed to have a single name in this show, lived on an island where they prepared to open Funland, a brand new Coney Island-like theme park. However, Mr. Jenkins was also obsessed with making the perfect robot, which came in the form of Charlie. This obsession then bled into Funland with the inventor making the entire park fully automated in service of his new robot. Sarah was not a fan, thinking that it wasn't proper to have only robots working at a place where kids came to have fun. It's not clear if this is out of safety concerns or if she just prioritized human connection over pure functionality. But either way, Sarah decides to sabotage Charlie in order to illustrate to her brother that clankers shouldn't be interacting with kids. None of that changed when the gang showed up, outside of some light gaslighting, and Charlie continued doing what he was meant to do with great effect. Much like Carl, Sarah sets out to sabotage a project she's a part of, but what makes this work better is that this is a proper scheme with a fixed end goal. She wants robots out of Funlands, so she makes them go on the fritz to convince Mr. Jenkins to get rid of them. And she actually succeeds in her schemes, despite being found out. Her only slip-up was arguably at the end of the episode, where Mr. Jenkins and the gang team up to capture Charlie with an electromagnet. Sarah personally cuts the machine's wire, causing Charlie to literally crash and allowing Scooby to sniff her out, though it is clarified that the electromagnet did the damage to the robot without her interference anyways. Other than that kind of wonky move, Sarah's goal was simple. Her plan was insulated so that nobody outside of her brother and some random kids collecting clams on the beach would even be aware of what she was doing, and she actually succeeded in achieving her goals. All that's holding her back from an A+ is the aforementioned slip-up and the fact that this technically wasn't even criminal. Again, we're trying to look for criminal masterminds here. What Sarah effectively did was just take things a little too far, trying to convince her brother that she's right in her thinking.
Just like a woman.
Still, she's gonna get an A, and yes, that may just be biased because Charlie the Robot is easily top 10, maybe even top 5 Scooby-Doo monsters of all time. And then we're back to actual proper criminal schemes with the unnamed Puppet Master. Pietro runs a puppetry business that he actually uses as a cover for a counterfeiting business. He hides his printing press in a secret room guarded by a harp case, and once he prints some fresh new fake $20 bills, which back in the day was a lot of money, or so I'm told, Pietro distributes the counterfeit cash in violin cases. That all works well. But then we get to the actual plot of the episode. One night, Pietro hits a bump in the road which sends a violin case careening out an open window in his car. We're not off to a promising start there. If you must drive around with your windows rolled down while committing monetary crimes, at least secure your product so it doesn't randomly fly out of your car thanks to a small failure in city infrastructure. But hey, tune physics and such, so I guess we can excuse it. The violin case lands in front of Shaggy, who discovers the crisp bills and phones the gang about it, leaving Scooby to guard the violin case. Pietro weaponizes our favorite Great Dane's crippling attraction to poodles to distract Scooby long enough to take back his funny money. And now he's gotten away scot-free to live happily ever after. Except for the fact that he leaves behind a puppet control with his company's logo on it, prompting the Scooby Gang to track him down. It should also be noted that they figured out that he's running a counterfeit business with the clues of a puppet dog and a violin case full of fresh money instead of smuggling, thievery, ransom payoff, and like 15 other options, which Pietro also somehow predicts. He poses as a simple doorman and leaves out a legitimate $20 bill for the gang to find, which then implies that he also left his puppet control behind on purpose to lure the gang back to his shop to try to convince them that he isn't running a counterfeit operation. But that neglects the fact that if he didn't do any of this in the first place, the gang would have been completely lost as to where to start looking for his illicit business. Pietro has basically handed them his own downfall on a silver platter. That's already enough to fail this man, but you know what, let's keep going. The gang sees right through this ruse and returns to the puppet shop later, but you see, Pietro foresaw this and left his door unlocked for them to come inside. He also sets up a puppet version of himself to trick the gang into thinking that nobody is active inside the building. As they investigate, he makes a couple murder attempts before showing himself in some Phantom of the Opera type disguise to Mystery Inc. in order to lead them to the basement, where he stashed a bunch of empty violin cases. It's implied that this was to convince them that their investigation is really just a wild goose chase. But A, this is the very room where they discover the secret harp case entrance, so good job there, and B, he immediately lures them back upstairs onto the stage with some organ music before trying to spook them with puppets, so that whole venture was kind of pointless anyway. When Scooby then catches the poodle puppet and destroys her for catfishing him, the gang finds a $20 bill engraving tool for his printing press. Why the hell is Pietro hiding components for his machine inside random puppets? What happens if someone buys that stupid blue ball poodle or just messes around with it in the shop? Dude, you'd expose yourself as a criminal faster than Hassan Piker exposes himself as, well, just about anything these days.
We think the Houthis, Ansar Allah, is doing what Luffy would do. You should tell him that.
Anyway, Pietro locks the gang in his store so he can steal back the engraving tool, which is a good move, and once the gang discovers his printing press, he chases them into a tunnel, inadvertently locking them inside before teleporting upstairs to stomp on the trapdoor to forever keep the gang stuck in their eternal tomb. No, wait, he stepped off and let them out. Why did you do that, Pietro? You had them beat! I know Fred wrangled the others to counter his weight, but he could easily throw some extra weight on top of the trapdoor to make that a little harder. Instead, he tries his puppet thing again, because that worked so well last time. And Scooby spots him, chases him down, getting him trapped for the police in the morning. Way to go, Pietro. At every turn, you did the exact opposite of what a criminal should have done to get away with their crimes, trying to frame it as an intentional move to some grander plan that doesn't work. Just think, if Pietro didn't leave his puppet control behind, he would have gotten away with it. It's like he wanted to be caught. Yeah, so dude's getting a big fat F. Next up, we get yet another revenge on an employer scheme, though this one is a little better. Harry the Hypnotist once worked for the very aptly named Mr. Barnstorm at his circus. However, he was caught stealing money, getting fired and arrested. Sometime later, he gets out of prison and decides to get revenge on the man who held him accountable for his own illegal actions. Darn you, Mr. Barnstorm, for punishing me for the crimes I committed against you. I will have my revenge. To this end, he dresses up as the Ghost Clown, a folk legend of sorts amongst the superstitious carny lot who jinxes traveling circuses with various accidents. As the spectral jester, Harry the Hypnotist would sabotage Barnstorm's circus by doing things like cutting trapeze wires and hypnotizing the lions into becoming pussycats, driving more and more performers away, leaving Barnstorm's business on the verge of collapse. As opposed to Carl's temper tantrum, Harry opts for a more methodical revenge that takes advantage of the beliefs of the people he's tormenting. Plus, he already lost his job and is a certified crook anyway, so he's got nothing left to lose, unlike Carl, who still had the perfectly respectable job of a stuntman. Enter Mystery Incorporated. They arrive at the circus to ask about these claims of a jinx from some former circus performers. After doubting the claims of this ghost clown, they prepare to leave, except Harry decides it'd be a good idea to hypnotize Scooby on their way out. Now, a line of dialogue later indicates that he may have thought the gang were here to inquire for jobs, though if he had actually listened to the conversation, he'd have known that this wasn't the case, but I guess I'll let that slide. It's just kind of funny that if Harry the Hypnotist had done nothing, he'd have gotten away with his evil plan. Instead, now he has to contend with some snoopy teenagers wandering around the circus. So Harry attempts to kill some of them with hypnotist tricks that fail largely due to toon physics, but hey, props to the guy for actually attempting murder and continuing to do so, unlike Pietro, who just kind of gave up and did a puppet show. He also manages to circumvent one of the Fred traps by making an inflatable version of himself. Granted, it is ultimately a pointless thing to do besides silly hijinks, but it's also not necessarily detrimental to Harry's plans outside of leaving a balloon clown behind to prove that the ghost clown isn't actually real. But to be fair, the gang didn't think that there was actually a ghost clown in the first place, so no harm, no foul, I guess. Harry's big goof is in the finale, where he once again tries to hypnotize Scooby and Shaggy, but the duo pull out mirrors, which causes him to inadvertently brain rot himself into becoming a chimp. Why did he not just stop talking? He just needed to shut up and this wouldn't have worked. Granted, it's also kind of set up that once the gold coin comes out, you just immediately hyperfixate on it, which allows Harry to do his little invocation that in real life would have been stopped with a swift punch to the jaw. Again, I guess I'll let this slide somewhat. Harry's harebrained scheme is mostly thought out well enough, simply sabotaging circus acts while also using his skills of hypnotism to put people in lethal situations in order to ruin a circus that ruined his life, ignoring the fact that he did that to himself. He makes a couple of key slip-ups that fundamentally destroy his plans, but they can somewhat be justified with the information the episode provides. It'll dock him some points, but it's not necessarily detrimental to his whole plan, so that earns him a B. Thankfully, we are blessed by a simple scare scheme by Big Bob Oakley, aka the actor, aka the gypsy, aka Dracula, aka Frankenstein's monster, and aka the Wolfman. I promise, this is simple. Big Bob is an infamous criminal wanted in 7 different states for various illegal activities, gaining the moniker the actor thanks to his tendencies to disguise himself in various garbs to achieve his goals. While on the run, he learned about the Franken family jewels hidden within the Franken castle, which has been transported to the US from Transylvania brick by brick. I think it's implied that he learned all this from a letter from 1668 by Mr. Franken, who claims that he had managed to hide his fortune upon death, being buried alongside it like the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Bob breaks into the Franken castle and scares off the caretaker in order to look for the jewels, but then he spots the Scooby Gang arriving for a visit. He poses as a gypsy fortune teller in order to warn them to stay away from the castle. That warning fails, so he tries again at the castle itself as Dracula, but unfortunately for him, Velma ain't having it.
You stop that.
This forces Bobby Boy to teleport around the castle and do costume changes to try to scare them off until he stumbles his way into the fortune, attempting to escape before getting caught by Scooby-Doo. The scare scheme is an easy way to get a passing grade from me, as the only thing you have to do is run around pretending to be a monster, or in Bob's case, 4 monsters, in order to achieve your goal. To that end, functionally, Bob fulfills his plan. However, he falters in 2 aspects. 1, once he gets the tapestry that has the Franken family jewels sewn in it, he should have disappeared for good rather than returning to the gypsy wagon to do another reading with the gang. Though I guess he wanted to gloat a bit. Plus, he's an actor, he's never going to turn down an opportunity to perform. 2, for somebody whose only job is to scare some teenagers, wow does he do a bad job at it. Look, obviously this is a cartoon comedy that has a formula of teen sleuths not being scared off by monsters in order to solve mysteries. Even Scooby and Shaggy will sometimes engage in shenanigans with the monster in order to get away from them. The thing is though, usually the monsters still manage to hold some air of fear around them, keeping the gang on their toes and in near constant terror. However, Bob gets backtalk from Velma right off the bat, which to my memory has never happened before or since, and then he gets his butt handed to him by Shaggy and Scooby of all people multiple times throughout the episode, even getting trapped by them on many occurrences, and at certain points without them even knowing he was there. Even when Shaggy and Scooby aren't that terrified of the monster, the person under the mask still tries to commit to the bit and pose a threat to them. I think of Carl the Ape Man, who when confronted by Scooby on the bridge, still attempts to knock him off of it, and then later he pushes the bit until it seems like Scooby has gone rabid, forcing him to back off. Here, Bob has almost no effect on these guys. Scooby pretends to be a werewolf to back him into a corner for Shaggy to trap him with a chandelier. He attempts to jump the gang as they rescue Daphne from a dungeon, only for Scooby to tie him up and toss him inside, with Bob weakly protesting as it happens. Shaggy and Scooby then trap him one more time in the crypt, not to mention that Shaggy inadvertently flashbangs him in the lab. It honestly felt like at times he was the victim. I won't knock off a whole lot of points for this, and at the end of the day, all of this is arbitrary anyways, but it just feels like Bob was particularly more ineffective than the monsters prior based on how well he embodies his own, which is kind of ironic for a guy known as the actor. I'll still go positive on him and give him a B. Also, how did he do that lightning thing? That never gets explained, does it? I guess the writers realized that they had missed a universal monster in the last episode and made this episode to make up for it. Dr. Najib is a Middle Eastern guy who had helped excavate the mummified body of Anka, the most feared and richest man in ancient Egypt 3,000 years ago, for the purposes of shipping it off to the Department of Archaeology at Nondescript University in Nondescript Town, USA. Now, the rest of this is incredibly vague, which does make my job difficult. All we get is that Dr. Najib knows about this hippo statue, which in reality is the hiding place of Anka's most valuable possession, a beetle made out of diamonds. In order to access this, one would need a coin with one of the 3 symbols on the hippo's belly. It's never made clear whether these Egyptian items were part of the shipment alongside the mummy of Anka or if they were already at the university, which would necessitate Najib to come here to get the coveted diamond. Either way, he's here now and Dr. Najib waits for people to leave the university so he can break in and steal the coin. However, the people who left were just the Scooby gang going on a sandwich run with the intent on returning, while the man only known as the Professor stayed behind to get some work done before they returned to help him out with something in the exhibit. He witnesses Najib's break-in attempt, and upon surprising him in the middle of it, Najib springs a different plan on the fly. Since the Professor didn't have the coin, our dastardly doctor determines that the adolescent detectives and their dog have endowed themselves with the plot device. Before they return, Najib works to bring Anka's curse to life, a curse that specifies that if anyone takes his body out of his tomb, the ancient Egyptian would come back from the grave and turn those responsible to stone, hiding the real mummy and using shape molds and quick-drying cement to pretend that the kidnapped professor and himself have suffered the wrath of Anka, which seems impossible to pull off in such a short amount of time and without killing someone in the process. Najib pretends to be the revived pharaoh to scare the gang into giving him the coin. What proceeds from there is yet another scare scheme, though this time the monster is trying to get something from the gang rather than trying to run them off. Really, the only screw-up Najib makes from here out is kidnapping Scooby to put him under the mummy's curse, and then placing the statue right outside the shed Scooby is being held completely unrestrained. That one move basically completely disproves the curse that he was working so hard to sell, while also just being pointless and dumb. That's about it. Najib wants the coin, fakes a curse to get it, while also trying to figure out who has said coin, chases the gang around some, and then gets run over by a lawnmower before getting dunked by Scooby to be exposed. So much of his early schemes and planning is kept vague, making it hard for me to give him a confident grade, but that one move with Stone Scooby is dumb enough to stop me from giving him something too high. Let's just call it even and give him a C. We get yet another but better scare scheme with our next duo of criminals. Zeb Perkins and Zeke hijack an armored car full of money and crash it into the swamps before laying low in Swamp's End for some years. It's not clear if they're original residents of Swamp's End or if they integrated themselves into the community while they waited for the coast to clear. But it really doesn't matter all that much, as once they finally go back out to get their loot, they forget exactly where the armored car was. So every night they go out on the water using a boat pole with a metal tip to poke around for the crashed automobile. I can only assume that the car is still airtight because after years underwater that money would be completely useless otherwise. To give themselves the time and space to search, Zeb and Zeke make up a story about a witch arriving and summoning a zombie to run amok in the muck, scaring off all the residents of Swamp's End, making it a ghost town. 6 months later, the Scooby Gang shows up after getting lost on their way home from a fishing trip, so Zeb and Zeke really have to double down on the witchy act, using voodoo dolls, smoke pellets, trapdoors, and disguised balloons in an effort to spook the kids. Heck, they even kidnap Daphne to really sell the act. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, and their greed gets the best of them, leading to a trap that they really should have seen coming. Zeb and Zeke's plan was quite simple, but circumstances forced them to adapt their plan time and time again. Yet even in that, they made the effort to keep their plans as straightforward and to the point as possible. It's by no means some grand evil plan, but it works as a competent criminal scheme in which the various steps make sense. My only real complaints is possibly ruining the money for leaving it underwater for so long, and the balloon witch, which was honestly kind of superfluous and used in a way that quite blatantly ruins the witch and zombie facade, specifically when it's left in the exit tunnel of the crashed riverboat. Other than that, this is a pretty good plan. These rednecks are gonna get an A from me. Speaking of red, we're talking about the ghost of Redbeard next. C.L. Magnus is a shipping magnate on the verge of going out of business. In order to quickly capture the capital he needs to keep control of his company, Magnus decides to start hijacking his own freighters and sell the cargo while also claiming the insurance money. Of course, he does this under the cover of being a pirate, and not just any pirate, but a ghost pirate. The ghost pirate disguise also allows an explanation as to why other shipping lines are being spared, since this particular ghost was executed by Magnus's ancestors and has a personal vendetta against him. In order to achieve the desired pirate effect, Magnus buys an old ship and hires some henchmen to play swashbuckler with what little money he had, dropping dry ice into the ocean to create a ghostly fog that would allow him to appear and disappear a little easier. That must be a lot of dry ice. He also rigs a ghost sword, also known as the Gay Blade, up with strings to attack and scare people. The pirate crew sets up shop at Skull Island, hiding the cargo in a bay behind a secret voice-activated door, which has the password
Yum, 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 and a liverwurst a la mode.
On one hand, that's an incredibly stupid password, but on the other, nobody besides the man who invented the liverwurst a la mode a couple of episodes ago would ever guess that to be the password. So in a way, it's kind of ingenious. I guess it's sort of like if I made the password to my YouTube channel Rug-a-Tug and a Gimblesmith : Yeah, it sounds dumb, but nobody in a million years would ever think of such a silly phrase as the password to anything important. And don't you dare try to hack me. I already changed the password yesterday, so you're not getting in anyways. But yeah, C.L. Magnus seems to have spent a lot of money on this endeavor to get the cash he needs to save his company. Now I see why he was going out of business in the first place. Another weird thing that he does is that when he catches Mystery Inc. investigating on board his ghost ship, instead of trying to trap them or, Magnus decides to force them to join his crew, first Shaggy and Scooby as his chefs, and then later the rest as, well, we don't find out thanks to Fred's ingenuity providing a way of escape. Now, part of this could just be the guy having a bit of fun before killing the gang. He seemed to be having the time of his life when he forced Shaggy and Scooby to eat the ghost stew they made. But it is a dumb move to offer people out to expose you some level of autonomy within your base of operations. The rest of his plan, though, is a classic if over-elaborate insurance scam that works quite well outside of the likely thousands of dollars spent that put Magnus even further behind where he needed to be. I'm just hung up on why he was willing to even offer the gang a chance to join him. Just throw the meddling kids overboard and be done with it. C.L. Magnus gets a B. We turn from the high seas to the final frontier to look at the Space Kook, a personal favorite of mine. Henry Bascombe is a farmer in rural America living near an abandoned and derelict Air Force base. One day, the US military decides to reopen it, but they'll need more land to house their jets, which gives old Henry an idea for a sneaky scheme. Pretending to be an alien, actually a ghost alien because of course, he scares off his neighbors to buy up their land cheap, likely to resell it to the Air Force at inflated prices. Not too bad if I say so myself. Now, there could be a problem in that you're only able to scare away most of your neighbors with a phony phantom from the final frontier. Then what's to stop the Air Force from also getting spooked and leaving their base abandoned for the foreseeable future? Then Henry would just be stuck with multiple acres of land that he would have to tend to alone. I guess he could still resell it to those not afraid of an alien ghost that would mysteriously disappear after the massive land purchase, but seeing as how the local sheriff isn't spooked by a space kook, I guess it's safe to assume the United States military wouldn't be too squeamish either. On a side note, it now occurs to me that a good amount of these episodes would have been solved a little easier if one of the characters called the cops like the farmer man did here. Imagine if Interpol started investigating the Redbeard hijackings. That situation would have gone much differently. Back to Henry, he does go a little overboard in his scare scheme. It makes sense to walk around as an alien ghost to spook the locals, coating his boots in phosphorus to leave behind definitive proof of his existence. It also makes sense that he'd use a projector to place a flying ghost ship in the sky to further frighten the farmers. But why take the time to rig up the actual Air Force base with spooky stuff like the laughing speaker systems, ghost jeeps, and dummy space kooks hiding in hangars? Do the farmers come around this area that frequently? Again, it seems like this would have a higher chance at scaring off the Air Force when they show up rather than the farmers who are busy raising chickens and shooting reporters. It just feels a little unnecessary to me. Despite that, I think Henry has a good little scam going on here. He's taking a couple of risks scaring off the people he's trying to make money off of, but overall it's a good plan. I'm tempted to give him an A, but that also may be biased speaking, so to play it safe, I'm gonna give him a B, but like a high B. We get two fan favorite ghosts back to back with the Phantom Shadow, who is actually two different people. Cosgood Creeps and his partner Mr. Crawls, really on the nose names there, are lawyers who specifically work for eccentric Southern billionaire and Civil War relic collector Colonel Beauregard Sanders. Another very on the nose name there. Colonel Sanders dies one day and declares his nephew Norval, his cousins Simple, Maldehyde, and Slicker, and Scooby-Doo as his heirs. However, in order to gain their share of the $1 million he's leaving behind, they each have to stay the entire night in his haunted mansion. However, as the estate attorneys for Colonel Sanders, Creeps and Crawls wanted to keep control of the fortune for themselves, so they set out to bring the hauntings to life, though the floating bone at the end of the episode may indicate that they didn't even have to do anything anyways. Through some unknown method, they cast spectral images of the Phantom Shadow on the walls to scare the relatives into fleeing the mansion, and every time some ran, they staged it to look like a ghostly abduction, even putting dummy lookalikes in coffins to complete the spook. However, their scheme doesn't work on the Scooby crew, forcing the duo to paint themselves green and make the Phantom Shadows a little more tangible. Like many scare schemes before them, the criminal lawyers chase the gang around until they get caught in a goofy trap and get exposed for their slimy ways, this time getting eaten by a flying washing machine. Now, all of that works pretty well, effectively sabotaging a simple challenge to make themselves the de facto winner. All they have to do to that end is scare the participants enough to make them run away from the mansion. It's sweet, simple, cut, and dry. There's only one problem though. The $1 million they broke the law to get ended up being worthless Confederate cash. And this is before these things made for valuable collectibles. They literally got arrested for trying to steal money that is worth about as much as a box of grapes, and maybe not even that. And remember, these guys were Colonel Sanders' lawyers. They had to have the knowledge of what the deceased was leaving behind. The only excuse I'll give them is that the guy was so eccentric that he didn't tell them, but did they not check to make sure that the briefcase was actually full of $1 million? It's a circle I can't quite square there. These guys pulled off an A, maybe even an A+ scheme, all for nothing. These guys are absolute clowns, and as such, I'm taking their score down from an A to a C. For clown. Season 1 of Scooby-Doo Where Are You ends with probably the most dangerous monsters so far. I'm not talking about dropping a sandbag in their general area or hypnotizing one of them in an effort to get them to fall from a high wire, although that lion cage stomach is pretty lethal. No, the Snow Ghost puts Velma in a classic mustache-twirling villain trap, chaining her up to a log about to split in half by a buzzsaw. He chucks a very heavy barrel on top of the gang, tries to blow them up with dynamite, and even attempts to personally throw Scooby off of a cliff. That is more than than any other monster has attempted before this, which in my mind gives him extra points. But hey, I'm getting ahead of myself there. Mr. Greenway and Mr. Leech are the masterminds behind a jewelry thief and smuggling ring out of Wolf's End in Northern America. Leech drops off the stolen goods in a briefcase at Greenway's lodge. Greenway then puts the jewels into hollowed out logs and sends them down the river and over the border to unknown partners. He gets inspired by a local Tibetan hermit story about accidentally killing the Yeti and being haunted by his specter, and uses the snow ghost as a way to scare off any inquiring minds. Also, I'm pretty sure this is the first confirmed real monster in the franchise. To add to the snow ghost effect, Greenway uses transparent plastic skis to look like he's floating. I don't think that really explains this, but sure, alright. Once again, we have a solid scare scheme going on that this time involves actual attempts to kill members of the gang to cover up the crimes. The only problem I have with this setup is how unreliable it seems to me to send valuable jewels unsupervised down the river, but it seems to be a common enough scheme to be worthwhile, I suppose. However, Greenway and Leech's plan starts to fall apart when Mystery Inc. shows up. First, they could not act more suspicious, constantly giggling in really creepy ways, and they don't even have the Joker card to lean on. Second, Greenway decides to spook them with the snow ghost even though they had no plans to investigate this legend, and then proceeds to lead them directly to the sawmill where all the criminal activity is happening. Now, once there, I think Greenway does a pretty good job selling the scare job, almost killing Scooby and Velma, pretending to turn Shaggy into a ghost, constantly attacking them, etc. That is all great, but he wouldn't have had to do any of it in the first place if he had just left them alone and maybe behaved like a normal human being instead of cackling like some golden age supervillain. That alone is enough to knock this back to a C. It's another case of if the villain had done nothing, he would have won, but because he chooses to do something, he shoots himself in the foot and loses. Also, fun fact, Leech and Greenway are parodies of Peter Lorre and Sidney Greenstreet respectively, specifically their roles as villains in the Maltese Falcon, the latter's debut film, which is pretty neat. Scooby-Doo Where Are You Season 2 starts off with a bang, seeing some personnel changes like Heather North becoming the voice of Daphne and Joe Ruby and Ken Spears getting promoted to story editors to make room for some more writers. This led to the introduction of a lot of firsts for the franchise, from the musical chase sequences to a villain scheme that actually tries to set up clues that point to a red herring. I was legitimately impressed at how well thought out this scheme was. That's not to denigrate the past criminals I've talked about, plenty of them thrived with simple scare schemes, but this provides something really juicy to bite into. Dr. Jekyll, the great-grandson of the fictional doctor of the same name, is a nutritional doctor of sorts who desperately tries to come up with some new vitamin. However, when all of his experiments prove to be failures, he turned to burglary to make a living. He dressed up as the ghost of Hyde, using suction cups to scale buildings and break into the second floor, stealing the valuables there and climbing down. One night, a watchman spots him, forcing the good doctor to hide inside the mystery machine to evade the authorities. The Scooby crew takes off down the road, not aware of the ghost thief in their back seat, so Jekyll spooks them to a stop and returns home. However, he didn't expect the gang to follow him, which forces the doctor to initiate a frame job of his maid Helga. You see, Helga, at one point in time, was a famous acrobat known for her human fly act, a display of bodily dexterity where one would scale the side of a tall building with nothing but their hands. This makes her a perfect suspect for the stunts Hyde has pulled off. And so Jekyll spins up a tale that he had tested a vitamin formula, passed out, and was woken up later by Helga with mud on his shoes and bling in his pocket, playing the victim of a malicious frame job himself. However, Hyde smartly wears shoes with dried mud on them to spur the gang's suspicion away from him and towards Helga. He proceeds to place clues all over his home to make it look like Helga has been drugging him, going out as Hyde, and then returning to gaslight her boss that he's been turning into the ghost of his great-grandfather's alternative personality. Yeah, that last part makes like no sense. It's like Mark Spector's descendant thinking that he keeps turning into the ghost of Jake Lockley. That's not how schizophrenia works. Still, it's Scooby-Doo, and I guess every monster has to somehow be a ghost too no matter what, so I'll let it slide. Another smart thing Jekyll does is that he allows himself to be spotted in the study before using a secret passage to attack Scooby and Shaggy in the library, attempting to make it look like Helga is getting spooked by the gang's investigation. He expertly threads this frame job against his housemate and even has the gang convinced of his innocence. Unfortunately, he didn't anticipate that the teenage sleuths also have an affinity for monster trapping as well as simple detective work. An additional element to consider is that that this may have been part of Jekyll's plan from the very beginning. I may be headcanoning this a bit, but consider these clues. First, why specifically make himself the ghost of Hyde in the first place instead of some other monster or ghost, unless he was going to spin the whole ghost of my great-granddad schizo persona act to begin with? He then booby-traps his back door, which again doesn't make too much sense unless it's there to alert him of any snoopers on his property, allowing him to be the first to know about them as well as interact with them to spin this story up. Also, why hire Helga as his housemaid? It's shown that she sucks a lot at simple house cleaning, leading me to believe that he intentionally hired Helga to be the fall girl for him just in case anybody got too close to discovering his thievery. That is a lot of intelligent preparation for something that just might happen, and it serves as a nice way to shield himself from a possible negative outcome. The only thing I'll fault Jekyll for is hiding the suction cups in a fruit bowl in the hallway. I guess it's not an awful hiding place, as it looks like the doctor doesn't receive frequent visitors to eat that food, and only an investigator with an empty stomach would even go near it, but I think that a critical clue that runs contrary to your frame job would be hidden a bit better. The reason this clue is critical is that a skilled acrobat like Helga wouldn't need suction cups to climb up a building, betraying a more amateur trapeze artist being behind the robberies. This forces Jekyll to kidnap Shaggy, who found this clue, and try to get rid of him by turning him into a frog? I don't know what his goal was with that, as Scooby inexplicably finds them and rescues Shaggy in a chase sequence, so I guess I'll just chalk it up to toon logic. Yeah, the hiding spot wasn't that great, but I don't think it detracts from how brilliant this scheme was, especially for a goofy Scooby-Doo villain. So, you know what, screw it, I'm gonna give him an A+, and he's gonna be the standard that all Scooby-Doo villains are gonna have to meet in the future. Unfortunately, our next trio of baddies don't quite get there. A. Fong is an oriental art dealer in what is vaguely San Francisco who runs a smuggling ring on the side. Every month, he'd receive a golden mask with a recorded tape inside detailing the dates, times, and location of their shipments. Fong would then relay this information to his clients via carrier pigeons flying out of the temple on the hills. In order to keep people away from his home base, he and his henchmen would dress up as the ghost of ancient Chinese warlord Zentuo and his emissaries and scare visitors. This airtight system gets a wrench thrown into it thanks to the diligent work of the US Postal Service, who 1 month delivers the mask to a curio shop by mistake where Daphne Blake decides to buy it. Fong sends his scare pair to collect the mask, leading to a chase across the city to claim it. So far, so good. However, there's two mistakes made here. First, the Scooby crew go to Fong for an explanation on the importance of this mask, and he does nothing to try to keep it with him. He's literally holding it in his hands and makes no effort to try to hold on to it. Or heck, since he only needs the recorded file inside, he could have discreetly taken the tape out, probably under the guise of an inspection, and then give the mask back, so there's no further issue. But no, he just returns the MacGuffin and tells them that ghosts are after it. That's all he does. Second, when the scare pair finally get the mask, they needlessly kidnap Daphne as well and take her back to headquarters, which the rest of the gang figure out thanks to one of the goons dropping his laundry ticket. Good job there, guys. This kidnapping then prompts the gang to give chase when if the scare pair just took the mask, there would be less incentive for pursuit. Now, once we get to the temple on the hill, Fong and his boys shape up a bit, setting a successful trap for Fred and Velma and attempting to kill Shaggy and Scooby with fireworks. They only get caught at that point because Fong didn't recognize that he was standing on a toy train with fireworks strapped to them and just stood there waiting for the trap to go off. He could have stepped off, but that goes along more with the rule of monsters being accommodating to gang shenanigans more than a failure of planning. For the most part, Fong's plan is just a simple recovery of an item that he needs to continue his actually good smuggling setup. But the two slip-ups he and his henchmen make are incredibly consequential to the failure of his entire operation. And because of that, I can't give A. Fong and his boys any higher than a C. Next, we have perhaps the most iconic monster in Scooby-Doo, at the very least from this season, in the Creeper. Depending on where you're looking, this is the next episode to watch, but according to the airing order, it's not. I'm just gonna go off the order I watched this stuff on HBO Max. This makes some things complicated because technically this is the first instance of the phrase meddling kids being uttered, but in airing order, it's actually the next episode we're gonna talk about. I'm just gonna go with the Creeper being the first because he's just a cooler monster. Heck, he's so iconic that the very first computer virus in history is named after him. In reality, the Creeper is bank president Mr. Carswell, who has been stealing money from his bank safe while locking up. He'd return later that night as the Creeper to to make it look like the bank had been robbed, then percolating the story of a phantom walking through walls to swipe the cash without being seen, which in turn obscures suspicions from landing on him. That's not too bad of a scheme. However, his security guard decides to secretly install a concealed infrared camera which snaps a picture of Carswell snatching loot from the bank vault. What happens next is a bit muddy, but using what information we do get, the best I can say is that because the sheriff was out of town for the time being, the security guard called Carswell to report that he had pictures of the thief. He brings the photo negatives to the Carswell estate, but en route he stumbles upon a fallen tree in the road, which is actually a trap from Carswell himself, who, as the creeper, jumped his employee, looted his car, stole the negatives, and destroyed them. With his secret concealed, he returned home. However, Mystery Inc. finds the unconscious bank guard in the middle of the road and brings him to Carswell's house. He feigns ignorance, but something is revealed that sits with him for a bit. Velma reveals that the guard gave them a single piece of paper that says nothing on it. But the guard had said, "The flame will reveal the creeper." After the gang leave, Carswell, either through talking to the bank guard or through his own deduction, realizes that this sheet of paper is actually a developed photo of the president robbing his own bank. This is a better way to handle this sort of thing than what was done with Fong in the last episode, as Carswell is explicitly not aware the gang has the MacGuffin until after he's able to easily grab it. So he becomes the creeper once more to chase the gang down and get the paper. Fun fact, he's not actually saying creeper here like he's a Pokemon, but rather he's demanding for the paper. I only learned this last year thanks to subtitles. The rest of the episode is one grand chase where Carswell attempts to get the paper back. He even pulls a smart move after losing the gang at one point by hiding in the mystery machine, their only way of leaving the area. That is a simple way to communicate that your bad guy has some problem-solving skills and critical thinking. I know that the wiki says that this episode was poorly executed, and on a side note, bless the Scooby-Doo wiki for having sections dedicated to pedantic nitpicking. It's the only fan wiki I've ever been on that has paragraphs of people talking crap about the shows they love. It unironically has made me think more critically about these goofy cartoons than so many other things I watch as I try to argue against these anons. It's great, I love it. What's also great is Carswell's plan. Outside of hiring a security guard who went behind his back to install secret security measures, maybe in response to Carswell refusing to hire more than a single guard to guard a bank that is frequently robbed, it's a nice little scheme he's got going on here, albeit one he can't afford to do indefinitely. I'm pretty sure the bank would slowly lose customers over time thanks to waning trust in the security of said bank. His actual goal for the episode is a simple quest to get a MacGuffin, and it's the best executed variety of that so far, since there's no failed opportunity to get the MacGuffin earlier or doing superfluous and silly things like spontaneous cement sculptures. I am happy to say that this earns the iconic creeper an A. Now we go from the country to the coastline, where we find Professor Wayne, a scientist working at an aquarium called Oceanland. His partner, Professor Ingstrom, has developed a revolutionary piece of technology, a marine life communicator. Personally, I find that type of technology terrifying. Who knows what kind of sex crimes that dolphin is divulging to Ingstrom. Unlike me, though, the science community at large finds this thing incredibly valuable, so instead of coming up with his own revolutionary technology, Wayne decides that he wants to steal it and claim it for himself. He's provided a way to achieve that when a 2-million-year-old caveman is lost at sea during its transit to Oceanland, for some reason. Why the most blatant evidence for the existence of the Neanderthal is being transported to an aquarium, I have no idea. But I guess it makes sense, since these are the same people who thought it was a good idea to strap a block of ice on the deck of a boat during a storm instead of locking it up in the freezer or something. All I'm saying is that somebody needs to get fired for this. Wayne uses this complete bungling to enact his own plan, freezing a dummy caveman in a block of ice and dropping it into a current taking it to Oceanland. However, it gets intercepted by Shaggy, getting the mystery teens wrapped up into his whole scheme. They drop the caveman off and Wayne proceeds with the plan. He turns on a heater to make it look like the prehistoric caveman came to life, broke out, wrecked the place, and made him disappear. His true target, though, is Ingstrom, who he's able to kidnap fairly easily thanks to the Scooby Gang returning to Oceanland with the incredibly thin excuse of Shaggy leaving his fishing rod behind and spooking the visionary professor into a shack, where Wayne is waiting as the caveman. After that, he conspires to eventually resurface, claiming to have escaped the caveman, take control of the marine life communicator and sell the rights for a fortune. The problem is, he decides to keep playing Caveman. To be fair to Wayne though, Velma, Shaggy, and Scooby discover his ice machine on a derelict fishing boat, so he's forced to take actions to cover up his scam, even trying to kill them with the filling the room with ice blocks trick. Once they escape his death trap, I guess it's only reasonable for Wayne to keep grugging it up in order to stop the gang from bringing information that would ruin his plan to light. Heck, now that I think about it, the initial attack was also necessary to scare the gang away from the shed where he presumably had Angstrom tied up. We never actually get to see what happened to the professor after he ran in there, but getting kidnapped is the only logical thing that would have transpired. So really, Wayne's master plan is actually pretty good to my surprise. The only mistake he made was leaving out a map that allowed Velma to find his fishing boat, but at least he managed to pivot well after that. Maybe it's a bit too much to expect people to just believe he escaped the caveman, and I suppose his whole scheme would fall apart if the real caveman was ever found, but given that it's lost at sea, that's a near impossibility. Yeah, to my surprise, one of the most unmemorable monsters in the show actually has one of the best plans, so yeah, the caveman gets an A. Huh. Now, unlike the caveman, I freaking love the Headless Spector. The simple decision of removing a head from a dapper southern aristocrat is a really striking design choice. And boy do I love how he basically turns his old mansion into a haunted house you'd visit during Halloween. It's just a series of cheap scares that he's clearly enjoying himself with. However, he's not technically the villain of this episode. And this isn't like a Charlie the Robot situation where Sarah Jenkins is technically the antagonist but isn't a bad person, rendering the episode absent a villain. There is a proper villain in this episode. It just isn't the Headless Spector. You see, Penrod Stillwell is the thrice great-grandson of Jefferson Stillwell, who hid a massive fortune somewhere on the property of his mansion, a treasure that now rightly belongs to his descendant. However, this story seems to have gotten out to the public, as Mr. Stillwell also has to contend with thieves trying to take the treasure for themselves. So Penrod invented the legend of the Headless Spector, the ghost of Jefferson Stillwell wandering around the halls of his decrepit mansion. He also rigs up the house with all sorts of tricks and chicanery to sell the haunting. All he tries to do is spook people away so he can look for the treasure, which is hidden in a stone column at the front of the house, with some of the clues literally pointing to the location getting shuffled around to make the search harder. He's not actually out to do anything illegal or hurt anyone, except for that one instance. I definitely think he intended to kill Scooby, Shaggy, and Velma there. Penrod Stillwell isn't actually the real villain here, so who is? Well, that'd be his neighbor, Asa Shanks, who wants the treasure for himself, so he throws on a bedsheet and starts chomping away at stuff around the house in hopes of finding it. There's no method to his madness, he's just swinging away while everyone else does their shenanigans. Heck, he barely even tries with his ghost costume. It's clearly just a dude with a bedsheet over his head. The balloon ghost in the well was more convincing. Heck, the Phantom was more convincing. And he was basically just the same concept. Maybe it's just a consequence of the lack of information from the episode, but I don't know what bro is trying to accomplish chopping wood in the attic with this weak-ass disguise. Asa just wanted the treasure and didn't stop to actually form a plan on how to find it past Axe and Charlie Brown ghost costume. That's all he did. So obviously he gets an F. But hey, as a consolation, I'm gonna put Penrod on here and give him an A because, well, if Sarah Jenkins can get an A, he can too. Next up, we get a second witch doctor, who is usually referred to as Mono Tiki Tia, but that's actually the name of the god he allegedly serves. In reality, though, he's tour guide and journalist John Sims. However, his real job is as an oyster poacher. Operating out of an abandoned Hawaiian village that is considered to be haunted by the locals, Sims dons a witch doctor costume to scare them away, allowing him to dive for the oysters at the bottom of the bay and bring them through an underwater tunnel in a secret entrance to the village where he shucks the valuable pearls out of them. And just in case anybody got too close to the village, he rigs up some additional scares, including a crashed plane with a laughing skeleton in it and a moving statue of Mono Tiki Tia himself. He has to employ these backup plans when he foolishly chooses to be the tour guide of Mystery Incorporated, faking his kidnapping in order to more fully control the scare scheme. And as a scare scheme, Sims's is probably one of the more straightforward you can get, spending most of the episode just chasing the gang around or having his henchmen and the statue do it for him. The only big slip up he makes is allowing Daphne and Fred free reign of the building in which most of the criminal activity takes place. He'll happily scare the crap out of Shaggy and Scooby, who aren't really a great threat of exposing his activities anyways, or check in on the only booby trap he has in that building. But letting the two people in the best position to discover his operation free roam while prioritizing the goofs goofing around is probably not the best way to go about things. Also, his fake plane crash is so poorly constructed that Velma was instantly able to figure out it's fake. What a loser. I'm gonna give him a B. Next up, we have yet another scare scheme to cover up a criminal conspiracy. This time, it's an unnamed sheep rustler who receives rustled ruminants in barrels equipped with breathing tubes that are shipped down the river. In an old abandoned mill he works out of, he shears the sheep and then ships them off to the black market. To ward off any interlopers from stumbling upon this operation, the rustler dresses up as a werewolf, howling at the moon from time to time, as well as setting up an open grave to make the werewolf more scary as a ghost, because again, it's early Scooby-Doo. Every monster has to be a ghost somehow. That's not even to mention that he'd technically be a zombie if he physically rose from the grave, but the show insists he's a ghost, so he's a ghost. There's not really much to talk about past that. His whole goal is to scare the gang away after they follow his footsteps to the mill, and he does his best to achieve that. Sure, he's a little more clumsy than the average monster at the beginning for the sake of an Abbott and Costello bit, but he manages to pull off some solid moves in his attempts to scare the gang. When Fred, Daphne, and Velma discover his secret room containing a map of critical locations of his operation, he prioritized scaring them away rather than targeting Shaggy and Scooby, who usually get targeted first. When the group splits up at the railway, the sheep rustler makes sure to lock up one half of the gang in a room so he can attack the other half without worrying about them becoming a problem. It's some nice tactical planning for a monster. He manages to pull this stuff off while also trying to attend to his job of collecting smuggled sheep, which makes some of this maneuvering a bit more impressive. And I say all of this as someone who doesn't actually care about this monster all that much. In fact, I like the Wolfman from A Gaggle of Galloping Ghosts more, but credit where credit is due. This guy's pretty good at his job. This random sheep rustler's gonna get an A, continuing this streak of really good plans from season 2 of Where Are You? Unfortunately, we are rounding off Scooby-Doo Where Are You with a break in the trend. The Wax Phantom is a pretty basic Scooby-Doo monster that really pales in comparison to the iconic ones that came before it. His plan also pales in comparison to some of the great schemes we've already talked about. Roger Stevens is the manager for a TV station that airs the Johnny Sands dance game show. However, the station is in dire financial straits, which likely prompted Stevens to embezzle what money was left and disappear. But how to get away with it? Well, the unknown TV station used to air a show that starred an eccentric wax figure maker named Grisby until they canceled it and fired the man. Grisby vowed revenge, promising to bring one of his wax figures at the local wax museum to life and destroy them all. This gave Stevens his out. It's implied that he started sending threatening letters to the station, signing them as the Wax Phantom, one of Grisby's statues. During the Johnny Sands dance game show, he finally makes his move, faking his own kidnapping and stealing all the money out of the station's safe. After that, he plans to take a plane to South America and disappear, leaving Grisby to take the fall for his crime. This is a pretty good plan, especially considering that Grisby himself is perfectly happy to accept the blame, as in his mind, it validates his black magic rituals. He legitimately believes that he caused the Wax Phantom to come to life, so he makes for the perfect fall guy. There's just one incredibly big mistake Stevens makes. He doesn't just leave after he does this. Even if his plane flight wasn't for another few hours or even days for some reason, then he should just find a safe place to hide out, but instead he stashes the stolen loot in a secret compartment that was inexplicably built into the Wax Museum of all places, and then prowls around the building as the Wax Phantom for no reason. I mean, sure, Fred and Daphne show up to investigate since they were participants in the dance game show and learned about Grisby's curse, which forces Stevens to try to scare them off or capture them using a trapdoor that was also built into the Wax Museum for some reason. Look, I can buy this stuff in an old castle or a storied museum or an ancient burial ground, but for some reason a publicly available novelty business is where I draw the line when it comes to secret compartments, moving walls, and trapdoors, I guess. Anyway, I get that Stevens has to take care of the gang now that they're at the Wax Museum, but the problem is he shouldn't have been there in the first place. Was he there to return the Wax Phantom costume to sell the idea of the curse, or did his wife kick him out for stealing from his own employer? I don't know, it's never explained, and I think it really should have been, because Stevens really should have been long gone by now. There is no reason for him to be there except to get caught by the gang. If he had just left to go join Hitler, Tupac, and Elvis in Argentina right after stealing the money, this would have been an A+ scheme. But the pure fact that he stuck around, specifically in the Wax Museum of all places, just ruined his grand genius scheme. You blew it, Mr. TV Man. You blew it. I was originally gonna give him a C because the actual core plan in and of itself is pretty good. But the more I think about how he could have easily avoided getting arrested if he had just followed through with it, it pisses me off, so screw it. I'm giving Mr. TV Man, Mr. Stevens, Mr. Wax Phantom, whatever you want to call him, I'm giving that man a D. But hey, despite how it ended, Where Are You ended up with a pretty even spread of villains, with some surprising evil geniuses popping up throughout, as well as some blithering retards. I actually didn't expect to give out some A grades, heck even A+ grades, but I'm pleasantly surprised to see some of these guys did have well-written schemes to back up some solid monsters.
Boy, talk about a starstruck dog.
We now move on to the second Scooby-Doo show for this video, the new Scooby-Doo movies, known largely for two major shakeups to the classic formula. First, every episode brings in a celebrity guest star, both real and fictional, and second, the episode runtime is double that of Where Are You? Yet they still insist on having the same amount of mystery, sometimes even less so, which leads to some really poor pacing and an over-reliance on pointless gags. But hey, maybe the villain plans are good. I hope. We start off with one of my least favorite Scooby-Doo episodes, at least of the ones that actually include a mystery in them. There was a stretch of the Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo show that ditched mysteries altogether, and I loathe most of those episodes way more than this one. This is barely a step above those. There's a bunch of really awkward jokes, a messy story, and really poor timing.
They found a tape recorder inside the dinosaur.
And Mr. Crunch destroyed the tape.
But that's not what we're here to talk about. Amos Crunch is the talent manager for the Three Stooges as they attempt to open up an amusement park in the desert called Ghost Town. While exploring the mines in which a roller coaster was meant to run through, he discovered a large deposit of uranium. He wanted to keep this discovery a secret, but since the only legal buyers in the US he could sell to was the United States government, who would make his deposit public to other people trying to make a buck, Crunch decided to instead find buyers south of the border to keep his little secret. However, he first had to sabotage Ghost Town, scaring away any potential employees and visitors. To achieve this, he ropes in the park's caretaker Rhino, and together they begin doing shenanigans. It's implied that Rhino would let out all the animals every night to increase safety concerns, while Crunch would rig up some spooks and scares to run people off. These spooks and scares would also be used to mask the dynamite blast digging out the uranium. His primary scare device was Tyrone the T-Rex, made out of plastic or plaster depending on the scene, that was meant to be a statue for the children's playground. However, Tyrone is actually a complicated robot machine that Crunch rigs up with an audio tape. Every so often, Tyrone would suddenly start moving and roaring to cover up the dynamite. Then Crunch and Rhino load the uranium onto a bat plane, which in and of itself is a useful scare device, and fly to Mexico for the drop-off. A problem arises when the Scooby Gang arrives and quickly discover Tyrone's secrets, forcing Crunch to pivot. And pivot he does pretty well. He first traps Velma, who seems weirdly suspicious of him right off the bat. Then he and Rhino disguise themselves as a gunslinger and American Indian statue. It gets a little confusing as to who is which throughout the episode, so let's just say that they both do their part to scare the remaining members of the gang, while also setting up look-alike dummies in a building to make it look like they're innocent. Both of their disguises are then used to cover up further dynamite blasts, with the American Indian being projected from a hidden projector doing war cries to conjure thunder, and the gunslinger being replaced with an android and going on a shooting spree. Crunch also manages to capture Fred and Daphne during all of this and then trap them, Velma, and the Three Stooges in a cave in order to ensure the security of their schemes. However, Shaggy and Scooby manage to free their friends with Tyrone, and our criminal duo does something that we have yet to see. They realize that the gig is up, gather what they can, and attempt to flee. As a wise man once said, you have to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to run. They knew what time it was. In terms of flaws with their plan, there's a couple. They left the door to the room where their dummies were unlocked for anybody to stumble in and expose their lie. Gunshots and war cries don't really sound like dynamite, but I guess it has the intended effect on the gang. And then they didn't use Tyrone to dig out the uranium like Shaggy and Scooby did. That's really it. As much as I hate to admit it, especially because I really hate this episode, Amos Crunch's plan is not that bad. In fact, it may be the best part of the episode. He even almost got away with it, but failed thanks to cartoon physics. As much as I really hate this episode, I'm gonna have to reluctantly give Amos Crunch an A. I mean, it's a good plan, plus he's sticking it to the US government. All the man wanted to do was to sell uranium without any complications, any laws getting in the way. You know how it is. We now turn to one of the better episodes of the new Scooby-Doo movies, in which the gang teams up with Batman and Robin to take down some counterfeiters. The mastermind behind this racket is Mrs. Baker, a seemingly sweet old lady who in reality is a crazed criminal. Now, a lot of her operation is kept incredibly vague and never really explained, so I'm gonna do my best with what we have. She operates out of her own home, which is made up to look abandoned. She flies in freshly printed counterfeit cash smuggled in through Punch Clown toys. She then hires notorious supervillains Joker and Penguin to distribute fraudulent tinder, which they choose to do through the Gotham amusement park concession stands. That all works fairly well to get the money into circulation, but there's some additional elements of her scheme that are never really explained. Mrs. Baker has rigged her house to flip upside down and into a cavern that leads to a toy storage room that is all functionally useless to me. I don't know if this toy storage room is a warehouse for another business or toy store or something else, and I don't know why Mrs. Baker would need access to it. It could function as a drop-off for her punch clowns where someone would pick it up and deliver it to Joker and Penguin, or it could be where she steals the punch clowns and stuff them with funny money. None of this is explained, and I really don't know how to fit it into the criminal dealings, which are otherwise pretty solid. Mrs. Baker proves herself to be a master gaslighter, as upon being caught red-handed committing a crime, she manages to convince not just our favorite teen sleuths, but also the world's greatest detective that she's just an innocent old lady who is completely unaware of why fake money is in a crate in her house. She then lures everyone to the junkyard nearby, where she nearly kills a few of them while also managing to overpower Fred and escape. That old lady must be on Trin or something. She then makes the dumb move of accidentally stealing the Batmobile and the house flip and drops it off in front of the Batman and Robin exhibit in the amusement park, which works as a solid pivot since that's the only place the Batmobile won't stand out like a sore thumb. The problem is that this is right across the street from where her henchmen Joker and Penguin are stationed to distribute her cash, and the Batmobile has a tracking device in it. Maybe she didn't anticipate this, but I think that should be a consideration when dealing with a tech-based superhero. That one move basically cripples her operation since Joker and Penguin are captured thanks to Scooby's gluttony for bones and spill that there is someone higher up in the food chain. Then there's the whole Flippy House segment in which she engages in some toon shenanigans that I can't really blame her for. What I can blame her for is printing really bad funny money. Anyone would be able to discern that it's fake because even the most ignorant American would be able to tell that Abraham Lincoln in a turtleneck doesn't look right. I give Mrs. Baker my respect for her master gaslighting routine that all women would kill to pull off, and what little we do know about her counterfeit scheme isn't too bad. However, her fake money sucks, the flipping house stuff seems completely superfluous to everything she's doing without good explanation to justify it. As such, I don't feel comfortable giving Mrs. Baker anything higher than a C. Too much of her plan just goes unexplained. We now turn from dynamic duos to frightful families, seeing Mystery Inc. team up with the Addams Family, in their first animated appearance no less, to take down a big vulture. The monsters in this show are incredibly lame if you haven't been able to tell yet. The vulture is actually a helicopter being piloted by a local couple who want to scare the creepy clan out of the neighborhood and protect the children from their influence. To this end, they pretended to be housekeepers to familiarize themselves with the house's layout, as well as planting magnetic cubes on random items, which would allow them to control these items with their vulture copter. To further scare the Addams family, they also kidnap Wednesday with a floating chair and move her to a hidden terrace before airdropping threats warning the family to leave for good. That is their entire plan, and somehow this gets stretched out into a full 40 minutes. Now, there are two major problems with this. One, they decide to enact their grand scheme right when Gomez and Morticia go on vacation in the Okefenokee swamp and are thus completely unaware of anything happening to scare them away. And two, more importantly, they are trying to scare the Addams family. Half of these spooks and scares the couple tried to pull off in this episode I legitimately confused for more Addams Family shenanigans. And I've seen this episode before. That goes to show how useless their scheme is. They are trying to scare a family that owns an iron-eating Venus flytrap, a living dinosaur skeleton, and a kraken as pets. What's floating armor and a magic carpet gonna do? If this misguided couple really wanted to scare the Addams family off, they'd flashbang them with gay rays or something. And I mean the original definition of the word. The Addams family are scared of wholesome happiness. Leave a cutesy kitten at their front door and they'll be mortified. But a big old vulture is child's play for a family that listens to wolf howls for fun. This scheme would have worked perfectly fine on literally anybody else. But because this fake housekeeping couple completely misunderstood their victims, this plan is a complete dud. I'll give them credit for some level of ingenuity with pretending to be housekeepers and everything, but I can't give them any higher than a D. The creative monster trend in this show continues with the ingenious Scarecrow. This one is more of a Wizard of Oz variety too, rather than the more fitting DC Comics one. In reality, he is banker Simon Shaky, who was personally assigned Maud Frickard as a client. Maud is the widow of Grandpa Frickard, who had developed a special formula for chicken feed that caused chickens to spontaneously grow to upwards of 6 feet and then buried it somewhere on his property. His wife wants to find this secret feed to grow chickens for her startup chicken stand business, Grandma Frickard's Fried Fricassees. However, Simon Shaky also wants to find this feed and start his own chicken stand. To that end, he denies Maud's bank loan request and starts looking for the chicken feed on the property while disguised as the farm's scarecrow. Once he gets discovered, he spends the rest of the episode running away and hiding from the Scooby Crew, Maud Frickard, and the mildly famous comedian Jonathan Winters. He only tries to scare them once, so he's not really that effective as a proper monster. Also, the only reason he gets discovered in a scarecrow costume in the first place is because he decided to move for no reason, alerting Fred to the fact that he is actually a dude. That is all there is to Shaky's schemes. It's not a bad idea to cripple Maud's business startup to buy himself some time to search the property for magic chicken feed, which only works for like 10 minutes by the way. It's even a pretty solid idea to dress up like a common sight on the farm in order to do so. It's just that Shaky exposes himself and then doesn't even try to be a monster. In fact, he barely even counts. And for that reason, he's getting a D. Finally, we get a proper monster in the show with the ghost of Captain Moody. The problem is that these guys don't show up until there's like 10 minutes left of the episode. Most of the runtime is just Don Knotts messing with the gang doing a one-man routine to confuse them. That all means this is going to be super short. Retired sailor Captain Moody is going to have a dinner with his 2 nieces and 2 nephews. However, fearing he may be in danger, he phones Detective Homer Pipsqueak, who's definitely not Don Knotts, the night before dinner, but the call gets cut off. This is because Moody's nephews have shown up to kidnap their uncle, throw him in the mine on the property, and somehow claim his inheritance. It'd be easier if Moody was dead and if their cousins forfeited their bits of the inheritance, but it's the thought that counts, I guess. I don't know, maybe they were keeping Moody to convince him to write their nieces out of the will. Anyway, they just chill in the mines while definitely not Don Knotts does his shenanigans with the gang, thinking that they're the nephews and nieces here to steal Moody's inheritance. Once the misunderstanding is cleared up, the nephews finally decide to do something, disguising themselves as the ghost of their not yet dead uncle to scare the group away from the mines. They tried this one time and utterly fail. That's it, that's all there is. It's a simple inheritance theft ploy that is also a little muddled because I don't know how they plan to claim all the inheritance. And then of course there's the fact that they're incredibly passive the entire time Don Knotts and Mystery Incorporated are in the Moody Manor. They don't do enough to really call what they do a plan, so I don't really know where to put them. You know what, let's just play it safe and give them a C. For safe. This next episode really confuses me, largely because I'm not really sure who the bad guys are and who aren't. You know what, it may just be easier to explain. The official monsters of the episode are a pair of masked men called the Phantoms on the wiki. In reality, they are Alberto and a security guard, both of whom work at a mystic content house called the Magic Mansion. They want the famous diamond collection owned by comedian Phyllis Diller. Now, this is a lady who habitually dresses herself and her dog in expensive diamonds, but for some reason these guys specifically want the harder to obtain diamonds hidden in the wall safe behind the portrait of Diller's first husband that can only be opened at midnight somehow. In order to achieve this, one of these two break into Diller's mansion to look for the safe, but upon getting caught in the process, the guy flees into the cemetery on the property where, instead of fleeing from the pursuing teen detectives, he slips into a gargoyle costume to scare them. Not even necessarily to scare them away, just scare them. After that, a magician from Magic Mansion invites Phyllis Diller over for a seance by Madame Zokar, who is also secretly the wife of Diller's butler Lucas. Zokar holds the seance where the ghost of Diller's first husband tricks his still living beloved into revealing the location of the wall-safe diamond cache. Alberto then shuts off the lights and has his security guard companion lock down the Magic Mansion to stop Diller and the gang from returning to the Diller Manor and save the diamonds. Ignoring the fact a magic show was able to occur during this, the gang manages to sneak out, so Alberto and the security guard chop down a tree to force Mystery Incorporated onto a detour that leaves them adrift on the river. That bit is good. Then Alberto returns to the manor, kidnaps Diller, and waits for midnight. As he waits, the gang manages to pull some nonsense to get back to the manor, forcing the Phantoms to try to hunt them down and stop them from foiling their schemes. Unfortunately, they didn't consider that the cops would be called and stop them despite the Scooby Crew's presence. Tough break. This is where things get confusing. If Alberto was completely operating on his own, it's incredibly convenient for him that Madame Zokar would summon Diller for a seance right after his failed break-in attempt, which would work as a massive detriment to his abilities as a criminal mastermind. Basically, having what he needs fall into his lap and then desperately trying to capitalize on it. However, it is heavily implied at a couple of different instances that Zokar, her husband Lucas, and this random magician are also involved in this scheme, working together to fake the seance, which is never explained how, by the way, exposing the location of Phyllis Diller's diamonds and then conglomerating together at the manor to split up the take. Heck, Zokar and the magician also break in that very night. However, their presences are never explained, nor are they arrested, at best getting hand-waved away in a throwaway bit of dialogue, which officially makes them innocent. But they can't be innocent because they actively contributed to perpetuating the criminal scheme. They became such blatant red herrings that the actual criminal plot doesn't work unless they are also culpable. In that, I could give this an A, since 3 out of 5 of the criminal collaborators actually got away in participating in illegal activities, with most of their actions making sense to achieve that goal, but canonically, only Alberto and the guard are the ne'er-do-wells, making their scheme kind of a stitched-together mess. My brain hurts, and for that, I'm giving them a D. It's like the show realized just how underwhelming and mediocre its monsters have been so far and made up for it by throwing in as many as they could in the next episode. Zalia Fairchild was once a big-time silent film actor, but his career tanked once talkies became the hip cinematic thing. He disappeared from the public eye, secretly living on the backlot of Mammoth Studios to be among the sets where he felt most at home. However, decades later, Mammoth plans to sell their lot to the super-duper market, and the land would be demolished for a parking lot. After shooting one last film, a remake of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde starring Sandy Duncan, the set would be turned over to the market. Ironically enough, Mammoth and its backlot is based on MGM and its backlot, which would also be demolished only a few years after this episode came out. That's some Simpsons level of predicting. Zalia sets out to protect his home from fully imitating life in the future, sabotaging the Jekyll and Hyde shoot, extending it by weeks to delay the demolition more and more. When the Scooby Gang shows up, he attempts to scare them off by dressing up as a variety of monsters and non-monsters alike. He starts off as a ghost, but then proceeds to play the role of a freaky chic, a mummy, a lion, a pirate, a dragon, the Wolfman, King Kong off-screen in a presumably deleted scene, a grizzly bear, and an American Indian. Most of this involves Fairchild teleporting around the backlot and spooking the gang, and to his credit, he wears them out to the point of exhaustion, even successfully trapping them in the western town set. Then, once the movie finally gets to its final scene, Fairchild attempts one last ploy, disguising himself as Mr. Hyde and kidnapping Sandy to hold her hostage until the sale is cancelled. The only problem is that he doesn't kidnap Sandy Duncan. He kidnaps her stunt double, Daphne Blake. This allows the Scooby crew to trick and trap him, revealing his schemes and giving him a job at the studio. That's right, Zalia Fairchild actually got away with his crimes. I don't care what the Scooby Wiki says, he committed blatant crimes here, whether that be property damage, one instance of attempted murder, and kidnapping. He did all of that and got rewarded with a steady job as well as Mammoth Studios staying open. His plan was a simple scare scheme that worked so well it actually exhausted the gang and fully succeeded in accomplishing his goals despite his crimes. Yes, he stupidly mistook Daphne for Sandy Duncan when if he was paying attention to the shoot, he would have known that Sandy would be coming off the set instead of coming on. But that's the only thing I can really hold against him. His crimes were a little more altruistic and sympathetic than other villains from the franchise, but dang it if he's not the most successful criminal in Scooby-Doo so far, and that alone's gotta count for something. Dude's gonna get himself an A. The new Scooby-Doo movies is finally on a bit of a roll now because we continue to get proper monsters for a good duration of the episode's runtime. This time we have demon sharks, also known as Pescado Diabolico, which the episode claims means fish of the devil when it actually means diabolical fish. But hey, it was the Indians that named them. They're not really known for speaking Spanish. But none of that really matters because it was all made up by our villain anyways. Milo Meekley is an elderly man who, along with his crew of criminals, stumbled upon a sunken Spanish galleon off the shore of Condemned Inn Hideaway Hotel patched to the brim with old golden doubloons. He wants to claim the booty for himself, but sneaky Uncle Sam would claim a whole half of the profits from selling the gold. Naturally, he doesn't want to share that with the government, so he decides to fish the doubloons out himself, transporting the hundreds to thousands of pounds of them by kelp treasure to a secret cavern where they are smelted down and painted to look like garbage can lids. This then allows Milo and his henchmen to smuggle the gold out to parts unknown. While operations are going on, Mr. Meeks poses as the hotel manager just in case somebody decides to stay at a condemned hotel for fun. Heck, Heck, he even goes as far as to hire a housekeeper. Meanwhile, his henchmen, whom he communicates with via hearing aid, dress up as demon sharks to scare off anyone who decides to stay at the condemned hotel. I guess it's a good thing he made these precautions, because it turns out the Hideaway Hotel receives some visitors in the form of Mystery Inc. and Sonny Bono and Cher. So that means he has some good foreplanning on top of his solid scheme to make sure the US government doesn't take money that he put in effort to find and make. You know, as somebody who just dealt with some BS from the IRS only a month ago, I don't blame him. Meek's big mistake is that he decided to hire a housemaid to work at the hotel. This is because the housekeeper ends up being a cross-dressing Fed, but even if she wasn't, this adds unnecessary complications, as now there's a civilian on the island that you have to work around to make sure you don't expose your operations. Why not just have one of your minions play the housekeeper, or just not have one at all? If people are dumb enough to stay at a hotel condemned for being a landslide site, I don't think having no housekeeper is going to raise suspicions. Because of this one dumb move, Meekly screws up so much of his operation, which is going to earn him a B. Okay, I'm starting to see a trend here forming as we get yet another episode with a cacophony of creatures that the gang encounters, except this time it makes a little less sense than, say, a gaggle of goons popping up on different film sets. Here we have a skeleton man heading up a cattle rustling operation in the western town of Juneberry, using ghosts of giants, some three-eyed guy, a brontosaurus, and most terrifyingly of all, a woman. But of course all this is fake, as the skeleton man is really local ranger Gene Halltree, who occasionally drenches the town of Juneberry in a thick fog through unexplained means in order to cover up his cattle thievery and smuggling. To make sure no one would come out during this time, he also plays ghostly moans from a speaker system in nearby caves which echo throughout the town. For anyone who actually dares venture outside, Halltree and his gang also wear skeleton disguises, which continues the growing trend of the Scooby crew not being fooled by skeleton costumes. Now, once the gang alongside Don Knotts, who's definitely not Barney Fife in this episode, get on the case, Halltree has to ward them away from discovering his schemes. His first attempt is a simple threatening note left in the middle of the night. That obviously doesn't work, so he rigs up a series of projections of superfluous ghosts to scare the gang away from a secret base in the mountains, which is accessible via a hidden door in the cemetery. The problem with that is, those projections barely do anything and then disappear after a bit, making it clear that they are a very little threat to intruders. Plus, it's just confusing for people to encounter both a random brontosaurus and a pair of headless horsemen in some caves. What, did he go on a shopping spree at Spirit Halloween? You gotta have consistent theming if you're gonna pull off a good Scooby scare. Them's the rules that I just made up. I think the initial plot by Halltree is a pretty solid one to rustle cattle under people's noses, but man does he respond poorly to the gang getting involved. Though I'll give him credit for attempting to strand and kill the gang in the caves. I'll give him a B, and if we were doing technicalities, like a B-. We finally simplify things with the ghost of Bigfoot, where the monster is, well, the ghost of Bigfoot. We finally get one monster who is a proper monster that shows up early on in the episode. It took 10 of them to get here, but we're finally here. In reality, the ghost of Bigfoot is Jonathan Crabtree, who is a wheelchair-bound old man staying at the Mechanic Lodge in Vermont. While he's there, he's been running a car theft ring where he facilitates the transport of stolen cars to an abandoned sawmill, where he repaints them and replaces their license plates with ones from trashed automobiles from a nearby junkyard. However, Mechanic Lodge is a very popular spot for skiing, meaning that there'd be quite the influx of visitors during the winter who could discover his operations. So Crabtree capitalizes on the legend of Bigfoot, a big surly Sasquatch who froze to death at some point in the past and returns as a ghost every snowfall. He sets up a projector in the junkyard that depicts the ghost of Bigfoot running through the snow at night to spook guests. For those who need a little more persuasion, he gets involved personally, ditching his crippled act and donning a pair of stilts and Bigfoot costume to chase guests around through hidden passages in the hotel in order to get them to leave the next morning. That in and of itself is not too bad of a plan. The problem is, Crabtree kinda sucks at pretending to be the ghost of Bigfoot. He pulls off some solid scares for Mystery Incorporated and their guest stars, dead comedians Laurel and Hardy, on their first night at the lodge. But then he proceeds to just run away from them every chance he gets. There's one line that mentions he's in a hurry, so he has no time for the gang anymore, but that just further emphasizes how bad he is at this. He spent too much time trying to scare these kids and their famous friends that he ran up on an automotive counterfeiting deadline, which forced him to forsake the believability of the Ghost of Bigfoot story to get it done. If Johnny Boy hadn't overextended himself and thus compromised his whole operation, I'd have given him an A for a nice scare scheme. But he did overextend himself and did compromise his whole operation. That does earn him an A for effort, but a C for incompetence. What we have next is basically the Space Kook scheme with a different coat of paint. We have crop duster airport manager Mr. Siegfried, who learns that the county is looking to buy the airport land as well as the surrounding farmlands to build a new jet strip, and so he decides to initiate a plot to run people off the land, buy it cheap, and resell it to the county for a profit. Like I said, it's the Space Kook scheme with a different coat of paint. Except this time around, our culprit does something a little more complicated. Siegfried dresses up as the ghost of the Red Baron because he thought it was plausible that a German World War I fighter pilot who was shot down in France by Australian gunners would be in mid-America terrorizing crop dusters. Regardless, he torments these poor blue-collar workers into quitting their jobs, planning to run the airport out of business. As he does this, he smuggles in weed killer disguised as fertilizer from his local farm base, which causes the local farmers' crops to die. Once there are no more pilots left to hire, he'd then take up the crop dusting to finish the job, effectively devaluing all the land to buy it up. Besides the theming, that is all good stuff. Then the gang shows up with the Three Stooges and he pulls some silly shenanigans. He does some solid things like airdropping in death threats and locking the gang up inside his sonically locked garage to keep them out of the way as he fertilizes the crops. But then he does some silly stuff. I can roll with him using a hook and cable to fly around and scare the gang, that works. But why use springs to hop around like a ghastly rabbit? Was the Red Baron known for bouncing around like a little girl? I'm no World War I history expert, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say no. And then he tries to scare them with a little RC plane, which doesn't work at all on them. In fact, Shaggy and Scooby are easily able to take control of it and somehow ground him as he attempts to gas the corn. I don't know why he grounded himself instead of flying off and escaping, and if he had done that, he would have gotten away with the scheme, if at least only for the night. Siegfried's scheme, while being a bit of a reskin of the Space Kook, is still fairly solid, but he does some silly superfluous things while also getting spooked by his own RC plane, not even a ghost or anything, which then allows him to get got. Not that bright of a guy after all, huh? So he's gonna get a C. Next up, we have the Ghost of Redbeard. Wait, no, that can't be right. I already covered him. Well, hold on, let me check real quick. No, that's right. I guess we're doing the Ghost of Redbeard again. They can't already be running out of ideas so soon. No wonder Scrappy got brought in to spruce things up. Anyway, this Ghost of Redbeard is actually a crooked oil man who is tapping offshore wells, transporting the stolen liquid gold via some weird mechanical pirate ship and loading them onto tanker trucks, which would then bring them to awaiting buyers. To keep people away from his operations, he and his crew dress up as the fabled Ghost of Redbeard, who is a literal whitewashed version of a totally different Ghost of Redbeard. That plan is fine. You already know a butt is coming, and it has something to do with a certain group of teenagers and their dog, and the Harlem Globetrotters. You see, both Mystery Inc. and the talented basketball team both got lost in the Florida swamp and stayed the night at a rundown inn despite the protest of some swamp rat, who in reality is a cop trying to track down Redbeard without putting any civilians in trouble. Redbeard notices this while out and about and decides to try to capture the group for some reason. And they fail miserably, resorting to this silly spirit-projecting skull to quell them and get away. With the police copters circling, the pirate also decides it's time to fold his hand and disappear. However, when he returns to his ship with some accidental stowaways, he wastes time with about 15 minutes of silly chases until the Redbeard crew gets trapped and arrested. I'd like to once again stress that I allow goofiness in chase scenes as long as the monster is the predominant chaser and the gang is still scared. Even though these guys are particularly bumbling morons, I'm not gonna hold it against him that much. What I will hold against him is the fact that he didn't need to go into the inn at all. This has nothing to do with his operations, despite the various trapdoors which indicate otherwise, and it only exposes his presence to not just the teen sleuths, but the actual authorities. If he had minded his business, the gang would have left without bothering him, and the cops would still be unaware of where his hideout was, allowing him to keep his ploy up for a little longer, amass a greater wealth, and disappear a much richer man. The first thing he does in this episode completely ruins his well-thought-out scheme. It doesn't really help that he never really recovers from that screw-up as he and his gang fumble around trying to kidnap teenagers. I was gonna be generous and give him a C, but honestly his unoriginality is gonna earn him a D. The unoriginality continues into the next episode where the gang visits a castle transported brick by brick to America and encounters a gaggle of galloping ghosts. Except this time, the Earl of said castle is actually presently living alongside his nephew Davy Jones. The one from the Monkeys and not the one from the Locker. But we're here to talk about monsters, in which we have two culprits. The mastermind is the Duke of Strathmore, cousin of Earl Cedric. He wants to take ownership of the castle and demolish it to sell the bricks as novelty items. Kind of dumb, but I can roll with it. However, he can't take over the castle unless Cedric is not financially capable of taking care of it anymore. So the Duke decides to dress up as the ghostly haunted horseman who allegedly came over to America with the castle and now scares off its visitors, creating a money drain since I guess the good Earl solely relied on tourist dollars to fund his lavish lifestyle. That one's on him. The Duke gallops through the halls using secret panels and passages to make it look like he's phasing through walls, further enforcing the ghost bit, and that he does pretty well. The Duke also recruits local yokel Cyrus Wheatley to help him with the scare scheme. First, the farmer puts on a hayseed demeanor for visitors looking for Hagglethorne Hall, effectively playing the creepy old man archetype. If that doesn't work, he then puts on a frog costume to become the Moat Monster, which he does to a much less successful degree than his cohort. Seriously, he's a very clumsy guy. I mean, he trips over the same rock 2 times in a row. What a goober. At least he has some sense to make an expert getaway once he's exposed. The Duke, however, has a much more crippling instance of clumsiness, as the gang doesn't even have to do anything to trap him. He does it all himself. What a goober. The Duke of Strathmore has a pretty solid scare scheme going on, though I don't think selling castle bricks is as profitable as he thinks it is. But it's also a good way to circumvent the usual question of why the ghost suddenly disappears once he gets what he wants. The fact that he captures himself, though, is a bit of a detriment. He and Wheatley are going to be a package deal, and together they're both getting a B. And now we return to your regularly scheduled new Scooby-Doo Movies program of crappy monsters that don't show up until super late into the episode. This time we have a pair of bank robbers named Ben Bing and the Phantom. They spent a year digging a tunnel from the abandoned Grand Old Country Hall to the underbelly of the Second National Bank, stealing $2 million out from under the guards' noses. Since the police have shut the city down, the pair of burglars hide the money in the tunnel behind a secret panel triggered by playing FEBAG on the xylophone and hide out. However, the county hall is scheduled to have a grand reopening concert with Jerry Reed as the headliner, and Jerry moves his performance up by a week, which concurs with the robbery, catching Ben and Phantom off guard. They kidnap Jerry and lock him away, but then Jerry's good friends Mystery Inc. come looking for him. Naturally, instead of kidnapping them as well, they start up a scare scheme. First, Phantom attempts to run them off dressed as a maid named Bertha trying to clean up, but that doesn't work, so he calls in Ben, who moonlights as Jerry's manager and tells them to go look at the pizza parlor. Again, that doesn't work, forcing Ben and Phantom to move up their robbery timetable and double down on the scares by turning the lights on and off. That is literally all they do until like the 30-minute mark. The burglars steal Jerry's guitar for some reason, and they hide the xylophone from the gang instead of using it to get their money, dumping it in the car outside and driving somewhere else. I'm sure there's another safe house they can hide out in, or heck, maybe they could actually try to scare the gang instead of just stealing instruments and flicking light switches. It's not until the very end of the episode do they dress up as some of the mannequins in the lobby to try to scare the gang off. But by then it's too late because Fred has a trap prepared. We have another case of passive antagonists, and I can't really do anything with that. Their robbery plan was fine, but then their idea of scaring people away is flicking lights on and off. Like, bro, that doesn't even scare SpongeBob anymore. At least that fake housekeeping couple flew around in that big vulture machine. That's something at least. This is incredibly lame, man. When I wrote the script for this video, I decided to be generous and give them a D because their robbery plan was fine. It worked. But honestly, at this point in the recording, I'm tired, I'm flustered, I'm frustrated. I have no sense of generosity in my heart. These guys are getting an F. We get our first returning criminals, officially at least, in the Joker and Penguin, who return for another dastardly crime that must be stopped by Mystery Incorporated and the dynamic duo. This time they kidnap a popular Gotham scientist with verbal dyslexia named Professor Flaky, taking him to their hidden base in a forest cave. They discover that their hostage has created a sighing flute, a flying suit, and prepare to steal it for future felonious finaglings. However, the gang and Capes Crusaders get involved, so they have some fun with the kiddos using various monster disguises and crafty contraptions while fleeing the costume crime fighters. Their scare attempts are mostly successful, but eventually they depart for some burglary. Fortunately, Flaky, who for some reason was left unattended and unbound, had lied to them about the location of his flying suit, allowing the gang to beat the criminal cohorts to the real location at the Gotham Rubber Company, where Joker and Penguin have a markedly rougher go of it, getting floored by a broom tire trick, barraged by beach balls, and eventually trapping themselves with very little action from their pursuers. The Joker and Penguin's turn in the spotlight as big bads led to mixed results. Their initial silly scare schemes are pretty solid, even knowing when to bail when battling Batman, but they left their hostage alone to freely move around their base and unveil their plans, which then laid the foundation for their demise. Then Penguin, at Joker's command, ends up popping a parade balloon that does them in. They somehow shot themselves in the foot twice. Come on, you guys, you two are supposed to be bona fide baddies who beguile Batman, yet you bumble your own baleful blueprints. I'm disappointed and my day is ruined. It is with great sorrow in my heart that I must give the Joker and Penguin a D. We round off the first season of the new Scooby-Doo movies with a frankly pretty underwhelming scheme. We travel to Boston, Massachusetts, where a guy named Morgan, who is said to literally contribute nothing to the community, discovers a sunken ship filled with gold in a nearby cove, likely lost pay for the Revolutionary soldiers during the American War for Independence. Wanting to make sure nobody else discovers and collects the booty, Morgan forces a pair of boat rental guys, Winslow and Selby, to scare everybody away and keep visitors out using a ghost of Paul Revere, a red coat, and a Minuteman alongside a remote-controlled balloon made up to look like the Loch Ness Monster. I guess since this is Boston, it would be the Boss Ness Monster.
Oh my gosh! Look! Look at that! That doesn't look like any wild goose I ever saw.
They managed to scare everybody out of the Boston-adjacent community, with only Nathaniel Rogers remaining, who receives help from his great-nephew Shaggy, the rest of Mystery Inc., and the Harlem Globetrotters. In response, Morgan and his unwitting goons try to scare them away from Boston so they can, I guess, fish the gold out of the water. We never actually see them try to retrieve the bounty, nor do they say that that's their goal. If they had actually tried to retrieve the lost loot, they may have discovered that their prized MacGuffin is actually fake. See, this sunken ship is actually an abandoned film set that was shot on location years ago. I have no idea how, since it's only been up until relatively recently that we've been able to shoot underwater, but props to all that effort in production design, I guess. Now, besides chasing worthless loot that every other local other than them knew was worthless, Morgan's big scheme has a big problem. It seems like he overextended to me. If all he wants is the sunken treasure, why in the world would he venture into town to scare away townsfolk, even breaking into their homes? Just stick to the lake to keep people away from there. Going into town seems needless. There's one line that insinuates that Winslow and Selby may be trying to buy property around town, but that never really gets expounded upon to be included in the scheme. That pair also stupidly keeps their business rental place open, even though their entire goal is to keep people away from the lake, which makes them deny incoming business, garnering complaints and forcing them to then accept incoming business. That allows people to go out on the lake and then maybe stumble upon their fake fortune. Granted, Morgan calls them out on this, and those two are not exactly shown to be eager participants in this scheme, so maybe this is their attempt to sabotage their boss. However, Morgan should have never let them keep their business open in the first place. Oh, and the theming is just off here. Why is a red coat and a Minuteman teaming up with each other and the freaking Loch Ness Monster to scare people away from a lake? If you want to sell a scare, you need plausible theming for your monsters. Nessie should show up in Scotland. The Universal Monster should pop up in a classic spooky castle. The ghost of Bigfoot should show up in the American forest. Headless Horseman should not be gallivanting around with brontosauruses. This is just how things work to make your monster more convincing. If I see a shark monster in the forest, I'm still gonna run, but afterwards I'd think that makes no sense. Frankly, I'm going to start taking points off for bad theming. This is starting to become a trend and I don't like it. All that being said, Morgan is dumb, taking a decent enough scheme barring the fake treasure and muddling it too much for it to work. We're unfortunately leaving Season 1 on a downer note by giving Morgan a D. Let's hope it picks up in Season 2. Season 2 starts off in a much better position, giving Mystery Inc. and the thrice-returning Globetrotters the complete haunted house treatment. Our team of ball-playing tricksters are set to play against the Ocean City Scorpions, but as they attempt to find a place to train, they encounter their super sleuth chums, who give them a last-minute invitation to Picnic Island for some rest and relaxation before the big game. However, the Scorpions faculty have been spying on their opponents and whip up a ridiculously complicated plan in the matter of mere minutes. A near-perfect plan to keep the Globetrotters up all night so they'd be too exhausted to play in tomorrow's game. To accomplish this, the owner, coach, and trainer of the Scorpions trick our protagonists into hopping in an old boat that is rigged to automatically take them to Haunted Island instead of Picnic Island. They then rig the only building there with luminous paint, cardboard statues, wires, and sheets to make the entire thing haunted to torment the team of basketball players and their teen friends. And then to disguise themselves, the cheating troublemakers somehow manage to make themselves invisible, save for their hands and feet, until they randomly stop being invisible so they can be captured and unmasked. And again, they came up with this plan in the matter of minutes, which makes the following pretty impressive. I found very little issue with the way they orchestrated their plans. They sell this haunted house routine so well that even when no one is around, these faux phantoms still pretend like they're waking up from their diurnal sleep. These spooks actually feel like normal ghosts going about their business instead of making vague laughs and telling the gang to go away, which was honestly kind of refreshing. The only fumble that I could find was that the abominable athletic authority figures left their luminous handprints behind in the library, which led to the only escape from the room and ultimately their hideout. But even then, that's such a marginal mistake that a multitude of otherwise competent criminals make that I can't even hold it against them too much. Plus, these guys actually succeeded in not only getting away with abduction without arrest, but achieving their goal of exhausting the Globetrotters into throwing the game. The only reason the Harlemites ended up winning in the end was thanks to some well-placed ice cubes that definitely broke some basketball laws somewhere. I can't believe I'm about to do this, but the faculty of the Ocean City Scorpions is gonna get an A+. Unfortunately, our next duo of criminals aren't gonna fare too well. Jack Canna is yet another counterfeiter faced by the Scooby Gang. This time around, our funny money honey buys his way into partial ownership of an old rundown showboat called the Dixie Queen, which has just been inherited by Johnny Briggs. Disguising himself as Captain Canopy, Canna uses the dock ship as a cover for his operations. He'd print the money in a nearby hidden cavern, transport the phony cash via barge to the Queen, where he'd secretly distribute it. However, his first mate Johnny wants to renovate the boat and set back out on the river. In order to get rid of him, Canna and his partner would disguise themselves as a pair of ghosts, with Jack pretending to be the infamous river pirate Captain Scavenger and his partner dressing up like the ghost of the fictional antagonist from Huckleberry Finn, Injun Joe. What is that, 2 times now that we've encountered the ghost of a fictional character? Why does Scooby-Doo think that's a convincing ghost to face? And that's not even the worst of it. Canna himself decides to set up a benefit concert to raise funds for the riverboat renovations, hiring famed teen band Josie and the Pussycats. Then, when they get scared away by the ghosts, he, as Canopy, convinces them to stay, despite Briggs wanting them to leave for their own safety. Heck, he even welcomes more teenagers onto his spooky boat in the form of Mystery Inc. It's not until Johnny finally starts to catch on to said counterfeiting that Canna finally just kidnaps the guy and frames him for robbery and tries to convince the kids to leave as Canopy, before that fails and more kidnapping happens. Jack's scare scheme to cover up his counterfeiting is fine. He and his partner successfully managed to outmaneuver the kids after failing to sabotage their renovation project. Even framing Johnny may help throw suspicion away from him, as a US Treasury agent has been sniffing around. That all works. But first, why in the world would he go out of his way to arrange a concert and hire a band while also working overtime to get them to stay when his whole goal is to scare people away? Just kidnap Johnny before you have to do any of that and save yourself the headache and extra work and eventual downfall. Second, why be opposed to the Dixie Queen setting sail, or whatever the equivalent for a steamboat is? Moving up and down the river while also holding special events may be a good way to circulate your counterfeit cash over a wider area. Just go along with it for a bit and then frame Johnny later. By all accounts, I don't really know what Canna was trying to achieve with all this silliness. Why do counterfeiters in the Scooby-Doo-niverse love crippling their own operations to such a drastic degree? Yeah, so, he's gonna get a D. The gang now takes their first adventure outside of the US to face their first ever actual real monster. This comes in the form of Jadal, a jinn who has been imprisoned for 10,000 years by the master of all genies, Hyde. He's eventually freed by Abdullah, the Grand Vizier of Persian Prince Aban. The young prince is set to inherit the throne from his beloved late father, but first he must rule from the palace for a year without leaving before officially becoming king. Abdullah doesn't want that to happen, instead desiring his own ascension to the throne to become a forceful ruler with an iron fist compared to his brother's tenure as a loving king. To achieve this, he freed Jadal to haunt the halls of the palace to scare the prince away and forfeit his rule. However, Master Hyde learns about this and sends his emissary Genie, named Genie, and her group of friends consisting of some interesting voice actors to help Aben. The group includes incompetent apprentice Babu, who is voiced by Joe Besser, the only actual member of the Three Stooges to appear in this entire show. That's right, the others are complete frauds. Then there's Henry, voiced by Bob Hastings, the future voice of Commissioner Gordon in Batman the Animated Series. Finally, and most notably to me, there's her master, Corey, voiced by none other than Twitter rambler Mark Hamill, kicking off a long relationship with the franchise. His performance as Corey is actually his first starring and voice acting role, coming only a few years before he was even cast as Luke Skywalker. That's right, Star Wars fans, we had him first. No, I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing anymore.
You can go force yourself.
But that's a massive digression on my part. Genie just happened to meet the Scooby Gang and they get whisked off to Iran to help the poor prince out. Jadal kidnaps Genie and tries to use that to scare everyone away, but then they all just get stuck in traps which conveniently allow them to free their Genie friend, leading to the Jinn losing a duel and the villains being locked in a magic bottle. But you know what? Abdullah's plan wasn't actually too bad. The hauntings actually scared away the prince's staff, and then kidnapping Genie actually caused Abin to genuinely consider running away. It's not Abdullah's fault that he was facing tenacious teenagers. His only slip-up is a poorly placed trap and immediately folding under zero pressure when Jadal is captured. The least he could have done was try to play dumb instead of being dumb. Other than that, this is a pretty simple scare scheme, which is strange since we're talking about an actual evil Jinn. But here we are. Abdullah and his freaky Genie are gonna get a B. Next up, we're going back to school, Velma's old high school to be exact. It thrives on donations from benefactors like millionaire sportsman Jay Teller. However, he made his sizable contribution to the school, including a brand new stadium, on the condition that Principal Mr. Griffith would be able to create a sports program to turn out a championship sports team. That unfortunately didn't happen, and Griffith's twin brother caught wind of this. Teaming up with shady gambler Jesse Finster, he kidnapped his kin in order to take over the school and finish the job of running the sports program into the ground so the school would lose funding. The reason why is that he has backers interested in turning the school into a casino. To ensure that the sports program fails, twin Griffith and Finster dress up like the ghost of infamous athlete Fireball McFan, who was disqualified from the Olympics by Griffith himself for cheating, hiding projectors all over the property to make it look like the Phantom is appearing everywhere. And on top of that, the criminal duo hired out construction equipment from Teller's company and rigs them with remote controls to keep people away, which also works to frame the sportsman if anyone sniffs around too much. All of this almost works as a scheme within the story. The school is on its last legs when the gang first arrives, with the only coach they've been able to acquire is slapstick actor Tim Conway, and even he was willing to quit. And when twin Griffith and Finster trap the gang, they fall into a cavern with the Teller construction equipment, casting suspicion onto the sportsman, which even Velma gets convinced with. Of course, the remote to control that equipment is left in that room as well, allowing the gang to escape and continue training for the All Sports Benefits show, which is the last chance the school has to stay open. That's probably not the best move to make, but at least they succeeded in making Teller look guilty, I guess. Then there's also the fact that these guys simply aren't athletic enough to mimic the legendary Fireball McFan, which, paired with a hefty amount of cartoon physics, ultimately gets them captured and exposed. Still, it's a solid scare scheme that almost succeeds, complete with a convincing fall guy even. So you know what? I'm gonna give these phony Fireball McFans a B. Following that up, we weirdly get the second washed-up silent film actor antagonist who doesn't actually get arrested in the end and actually succeeds in his schemes in the new Scooby-Doo movies. This one is a pastiche of Lon Chaney named Lorne Chumley. His career has effectively ended, but he makes an attempt at a comeback with a little indie horror film shot on location at his fittingly spooky home. However, thanks to his multitude of debts, the bank puts his house up for sale, and after a thorough extermination, Lorne will be kicked out. He and his Eric von Stroheim parody butler Otto uses Chumley's acting skills as the man with a million faces to make his home look like it's actually haunted, full of a bunch of monsters and ghosts to scare off any exterminator who dares do their job here. Specifically, he's managed to spook 14 bug hunters away from his home, buying him nearly enough time to finish his big comeback film, where it's literally just him and his butler director in the basement. However, he meets his match when Get Smart lead actor Don Adams' company gets hired to exterminate the house. That's also because he hired the Scooby Gang to be his assistants. To Lorne's credit, he does a good job scaring the teens and their celebrity boss while also stealing their extermination equipment. But unfortunately, half of the group manages to be cynical enough to stick around, forcing Lorne to basically abandon this plan to desperately finish his movie. And he technically manages to finish it, largely thanks to the help of having more than 2 people on a film set. Like most scare schemes we've covered so far, Lorne's is a very simple one that mostly works. He never has a moment where he necessarily gives up the game and compromises the illusion of a real haunting. It's just that he either failed to have a backup plan if met with a skeptic, or he simply ran out of time, forcing him to prioritize the ultimate goal of his plan. Either way, it does indicate that he's not quite the criminal genius he needed to be, but as per his aims, he does a good job ultimately focusing on them. I don't know. You know what, let's give him a B. I'm very excited to talk about this next monster because it is truly the most innovative of the franchise, easily clearing everyone that came before it. To build up to it, the Scooby crew are heading to the Oceanside Auto Rally to watch Scooby rip off crew Speed Buggy and his friends race. Both teams of mystery solvers stop in Winona, Mississippi for the night, where they encounter the great monster that is the Wind. I'm not kidding, the monster is the Wind. Alright, to be fair, it's actually 4, maybe 5 guys wearing hoods led by local bank president PJ Peabody running around and operating this tiny wind machine to create massive monsoons at midnight every night to run citizens of Winona out of town to buy up their land cheap before turning the whole city into a tourist trap. That's right, we have yet another real estate scam, except this time it's wind scaring people. I get that if you had to face a hurricane every 24 hours, you'd probably want to move too, but to treat this like some spooky occurrence is kinda silly, even for Scooby-Doo standards. What's more, PJ and his windmakers barely do anything more than make air go whoosh. Sure, they managed to trap the gang a couple of times, though they immediately escaped thereafter with very little effort. To defend PJ briefly, there's no way he would have been able to predict that these teenagers would be running around with a sentient dune buggy that can drill through solid rock in the matter of seconds. Outside of that, though, here is a list of everything PJ attempts to do to scare our super sleuths off, even though their van has gotten in a wreck and couldn't even leave if they wanted to. He throws papers at the kids, runs into a local business and watches a mannequin bump into Shaggy, blows wind in his safe, fails to get rid of a map of the Winona area, and makes shadow puppets before finally actually attempting to take these kids seriously as a threat to their operation so that we can finally have a chase sequence for the climax. I'll be fair and give credit for using inconspicuous natural disasters to run people out of town instead of a more mysteriously intriguing monster, but man, it felt like these nitwits were barely trying. Even saying it out loud feels like I'm being too generous and giving them a D, but I will give them credit on that last point. But seriously, the Wind? Really? The Wind? What's wrong with you? Get an actual monster next time. It's time to talk about a sweeter monster than the past few. Not in behavior, but in material making the monsters up. Of course, we're talking about the Green Globs, who can also be retroactively called the Cotton Candy Globs.
Cotton candy glob.
In reality, these two are candy factory foremen Mr. Crink and his boss, infamous gold swindler Sterling Smith. Smith has stolen $2 million worth of gold bricks from Citibank and is now hiding out in the Sugar Plum Candy Company factory, which was recently bought by musician Cass Elliot, who started making chocolate bars with her name on them. Smith smuggles in an Acme metal grinding machine along with his gold bars, starting to mince the treasure into dust. He and Crink then mix the gold dust into candy bars and pack them into boxes bound for Rio de Janeiro, where the two crooks are going to escape to and live a life of luxury while also trying to extract $2 million worth of gold dust out of melty, sticky chocolate. Ain't no way you're getting anything out of this in less than literal weeks. That's to say, this isn't the greatest smuggling vehicle to use, but I guess it's the only one Smith has. The night that Crink and Smith start shipping out the gold, the latter dresses up as night watchman Mr. Franklin, who I guess everyone forgot wasn't working that night, to walk around the factory floor freely. The two also dump cotton candy on themselves to scare off the rest of the employees as the Green Globs. All except for Cass Elliot, who they just kidnap and lock in the basement, but she manages to call for help from Mystery Inc., who the Globs proceed to scare and capture and just straight up ignore for the rest of the episode. I sympathize with these guys in that they're trying to get all the gold dust into chocolate bars and those chocolate bars into the truck so they can leave by the end of the night while also dealing with some snoopy teens and a singer who likes to remind us of her weight issues. I really do. And to their credit, they do the best they can, even managing to capture the gang 3 times in traps that took a lot of effort to escape, even more than a lot of the usual traps in this show, which is impressive. However, there are times when the Globs spot the gang and have an opportunity to attack them, and then they just walk off. They don't even try. Plus, Smith as Franklin puts on this little routine of constantly trying to fight or get kidnapped by the Globs, and I'm not really sure why. It's not really a good attempt at scaring the group, and even just keeps reminding them that there's someone else out there they need to help. Don't get me wrong, it's pretty entertaining, and I found it to be a funny recurring gag. I just don't see the point of doing that. All in all, though, Sterling did a good enough job, so he'll get a B. The new Scooby-Doo Movies ends on a note of sorts. We find the gang heading to an abandoned carnival owned by Dick Van Dyke. That carnival's strongman wants to become the world's first strongman to ever own a carnival. In order to fulfill this dream of his, he decides to dress up as various ghostly body parts somehow put together by wires and springs, as well as a ghostly strongman because you're at the best when you're yourself, I guess, in order to scare off customers and employees, thus driving down the value of the carnival so he can buy it dirt cheap. We've already seen this type of plan so many times now, and this one is not much different for the most part. The strongman is close to succeeding in his goals at the beginning of the episode, with Dick even offering to sell his carnival to random strangers for real cheap, which then begs the question as to why the strongman hasn't already bought the carnival yet. But that doesn't matter since the Scooby Gang shows up for some fun times, forcing the strongman to try to scare them off once again. This gives us an episode full of the strongman tormenting the gang, primarily targeting Shaggy and Scooby, even attempting to kill them at one point. Wow, it's been a while since that's happened. The big slip up he has is that he got caught lacking, leaving the carousel motor room door unlocked while he takes a random break from terrorizing children and a goofy comedian to work out. Hey, I understand you gotta get them gains no matter what else you got going on. And that's 1,000. That's 1,001. He then folds under zero pressure, admitting his entire scheme and kind of ruining the premise of the carnival being haunted in the first place. However, I won't hold that against him as much as I would others, well, because he could still snap each of them in half with his bare hands. But then he fumbles that attempt, knocking himself out with a pony. But you know what, he tried, so we're gonna end things off on a B. Overall, the new Scooby-Doo movies actually delivered on some solid villain plans to my surprise, despite how utterly underwhelming the monsters are. Of course, there are also a lot of stinkers as the list is very mid-heavy, but it's nice to find some diamonds in the rough. We now turn to the final show I'm going over in this video and the last of what I consider the classic era of Scooby-Doo. The Scooby-Doo Show. However, this show has the most confusing labeling of the entire franchise, so much so that most review sites have it on them 2 or 3 times, with even some of these pages just randomly disappearing and reappearing at any given moment. This is because our crime-fighting canine got moved from CBS to ABC, with his first show there initially airing alongside Dyno-Mutt Dog Wonder to create the Scooby-Doo Dyno-Mutt Hour, not actually airing as the Scooby-Doo Show until a few years later, with the second season being aired as part of the Laugh Olympics hour-long programming block, and the third being aired alongside Laugh Olympics and Captain Caveman as a part of a 90-minute programming block, and the latter being branded as both the third season of the Scooby-Doo Show and Scooby-Doo Where Are You? Like I said, it is very confusing. The reason I even bring this up is that as part of this hour-long programming block, the Scooby Gang had a few crossovers, specifically having a couple of appearances on the Adam West Batman pastiche show Dyno-Mutt Dog Wonder, making the villains they faced there Scooby-Doo villains, which qualifies them for this video. This means we're taking a brief detour from monsters to supervillains. And as of writing this, I haven't actually seen the show yet, so this should be pretty fun. And as of editing, I am way sorry for making this video even longer. Our first of 3 gives us our second encounter with a version of Mr. Hyde. While also being referred to as a ghost at one point, this Hyde is not in fact a phantom, but a 2-bit criminal named Willie the Weasel who seeks to enter the big leagues with a new chemical formula that turns him and his dog Stitch into these horrendous monsters. First, he tests out his powers by quite smoothly robbing a jeweler of his gold coins before using an antidote to make himself look normal, ensuring an easy getaway. However, his real plan comes later. Now that Blue Falcon and Dyno-Mutt, along with Mystery Inc., are aware of his criminal activities, Willie subverts his typical robbery plan by showing up to a showing of the crown jewels where the crime fighters are waiting to catch him, and gasses the security guards, turning them into hides and having them steal the loot instead. This is his first show of force in a grander scheme, turning innocent civilians into hideous hides, effectively holding all of Big City hostage so that he can be made mayor. Heck, he's even smart enough to follow BF to Orville Research Institute and gas Professor Orville, preventing him from synthesizing an antidote for hidification. Once he becomes mayor, he plans on sneaking into neighboring cities as Willie before repeating his whole Hyde rampage, presumably gaining more and more power and wealth. To ensure his success, he also gasses Blue Falcon and Dyno-Mutt to be his minions. Unfortunately for him, though, he doesn't realize that Blue Falcon is a pastiche of Adam West Batman who is able to whip out the silliest Deus Ex Machina gadgets to win the day, this time being a face fume filter. Willie does the smart thing and tries to flee the city, but he inevitably gets caught. The only time he actually slips up is when he almost gets caught by BF in the Research Institute thanks to a locked door. He didn't have a plan to encounter a locked door. I mean, it's not a significant slip up in the scheme of things, but it does a lot of damage to the perception of him being a master planner. You didn't have an escape route planned there, Willie, especially when considering you'd be face to face with the Blue Falcon? A locked door almost ended your criminal career, Willie. Again, it's not enough to tank his grade, but man is that unfortunate for him. You know, for being a third-rate crook, Willie the Weasel actually pulls off a first-rate campy supervillain scheme, and for that he's gonna get an A. The next team-up between Scooby-Doo and the Dog Wonder happens in the episode immediately after this, seeing Blue Falcon and Mystery Inc. team up to take down the supervillain Lowbrow, an incredibly stupid caveman criminal who wants to be the king of crime. How does he plan to do this? Well, by going to college to get more smarter, of course. Obviously, Lowbrow has been specifically engineered to be the opposite of a criminal mastermind, breaking into the big city library to steal picture books for ideas for his next big heist. He's clearly not the brightest bulb on the Christmas tree, yet he manages to not just avoid being the actual dumbest criminal the gang has faced in this era, but impressively pull off a couple of clever moves to help him dodge getting an F. He manages to escape Blue Falcon not once, but twice. Now, one of those instances comes from Dyno-Mutt's own silliness getting his allies captured, though Lowbrow is also able to concoct a decent little trap in response to that sees a tight net yanking away a little peg holding back a boulder from crushing everyone if they move too much. The other escape, though, comes purely from his own cleverness, which is surprising for such a dumb villain. Dyno-Mutt attempts to use his patented super nose snooper to sniff down the caveman criminal, but Lowbrow smartly uses a trail of pepper to not just sabotage the snooper, but actually stop the superheroes in their tracks with a super sneeze. Yes, his plan is incredibly retarded, but Lowbrow, the grugged out ooga booga brained caveman, surprisingly manages to avoid the bottom of the barrel. I mean, he's obviously still gonna get a D, but you know what? It's the most impressive D you're gonna see here today. The final supervillain Mystery Inc. faces alongside the disastrous duo is Swamp Rat and his hillbilly henchman Mudmouth. This country bumpkin starts trapping 18-wheelers in the Bogmire Swamp just outside of big cities, scrounging up their goods until he gets enough industrial-sized water pumps to enact his big plan. He's gonna hook these pumps to Big City's sewer system and flood the streets with swamp water, forcing evacuations and allowing him and Mudmouth to loot every valuable in the city. That's basically it, and the scheme works well conceptually. People already loot businesses fairly easily during natural disasters, so artificially creating one to distract almost any authorities that would catch you to fuel a massive crime spree is pretty clever. This is all assuming, though, that the trucker companies don't catch on to the fact that Swamp Rat is on their frequencies and redirect every single truck from slipping into a swamp trap. After like 5 occurrences, I'd think there'd be some sort of memo or change of operation getting sent out, but I guess not. Now, when Swamp Rat encounters BF, Dyno-Mutt, and the Scooby Gang, he does fairly well. He first catches Dyno-Mutt attempting to snap photos of his plans, and then uses his distress beacon to lure the others into a trap. He then decides to put them all into like this Bond villain death trap thing that's pretty much guaranteed to fail, and leaves without making sure the group dies.
Aren't you even gonna watch them? They could get away.
No. I'm going to leave them alone and not actually witness them dying. I'm just going to assume it all went to plan. What?
Thankfully, he recovers when Blue Falcon catches up with him again, using a hostage to distract the champion of justice so he can get away. Now, of course, he's inevitably captured, but that's largely thanks to a clever ambush plan from Blue Falcon and not these rednecks' incompetence. So besides the ridiculous swamp trap that relied on trained beavers not getting eaten by hungry alligators, Swamp Rat manages to pull off a solid scheme. Good job on being the stereotypes, dude. You're getting a B. Wow, I'm actually impressed by the villains Dyno-Mutt put up against Mystery Inc., even the ones specifically designed to be incompetent. Well, this was a nice little detour to a Hanna-Barbera show that typically gets overlooked during this era, but now it's back to proper Scooby-Doo programs.
See, Scooby? That's how you look on TV.
Our first mystery in the Scooby-Doo show sees the gang facing their scariest endeavor yet, getting a job. Red Sparks and Jim Rivets are construction workers for the Acme Construction Company, but on the off hours they are professional safe burglars. Using a special light-gathering lens from Optical Lens Company to spy on their neighbors' homes from a penthouse that I think they share together, they learn the various safe combinations before breaking in and stealing the loot inside later. They then hide their ill-gotten gains in a potted plant. This works as a pretty solid and simple operation, that is until their employer picks up a job to build a high-rise that would block their perfect view. Lucky for the pair of construction criminals, the high-rise is building on the site of an alleged haunted house where a man named Ebenezer Crabbe lived, gaining suspicions of witchcraft thanks to his ability to never age in 50 years. He then vanished, leaving the property to be sold for the high-rise project and the house to be moved somewhere else. This gives Sparks and Rivets the perfect way to delay the construction project long enough to finish burglarizing the neighborhood. The former dresses as the specter of that geezer Ebenezer, spooking his co-workers away from the site, while the latter hides out in the old crab house as Eb's 4x great-granddaughter Nettie to perpetuate the ghost stories to anyone curious enough to sniff around. That's frankly some crazy foresight and planning on Rivet's part. The pair does a solid job reacting to the gang snooping around too. Sparks first scares the guys as they work on this gold mine of OSHA violations. Rivets for his part does a good job selling the idea that he's just a normal witch hanging out and waiting for her great-great-great-great-great-granddad, though I don't know why he left a receipt for the telescopic lens lying around this old abandoned house. But Sparks manages to pivot that around really well, following the gang to the optical lens company and even succeeding in stealing the light-gathering telescopic lens they acquired to turn into the police as evidence. Heck, he even manages to turn both a slapstick gag and a trap back around on the gang. The only reason he and his cohort were even caught was thanks to the sheer gooftitude of Shaggy and Scooby. If not for their unpredictable incompetence, Sparks and Rivets honestly may not have only gotten away with everything, but even fully disposed of the gang. Well, hey, the Scooby-Doo show's starting off really well with an A+. We now go south of the border to check out the first of many trips Mystery Inc. takes to Mexico. Here, Professor Stonehack and his wife Alina have discovered a hidden treasure trove of Aztec gold and jewels inside the pyramid of King Catazuma. Instead of being good archaeologists and studying the site and writing out a report, they decide to steal it all for themselves. To disguise their activities and scare off any inquiring minds, they pretend that they accidentally broke a seal and incurred the wrath of the king's ghost, using a fog machine and projector to usher in Catazuma appearances and scare off the locals. To give a more imminent threat on the ground, Alina dresses as some sort of stone creature to physically chase off possible witnesses. Then they start loading up all the treasure on a barge made up to look like a ghostly transport for the ancient Aztec gods and hide it in a hidden bridge storage room, smuggling out the smaller valuables and souvenir masks while planning to come back later for the bigger loot. When the Scooby Gang shows up in the local fiesta town Cinco in the midst of this, the Stone Hacks respond accordingly. Catazuma makes his appearance, even faking a kidnapping of the professor, and Alina chases them all over the place. They then do a good enough job guarding the pyramid, even trapping the gang inside the Aztec storeroom they just robbed. To their credit, the gang manages to escape using ancient writings on the wall to open a secret door. There's no way this couple could have predicted that Velma could read ancient Aztec. In terms of problems with their plan, I'm gonna get a little nitpicky with it. Why leave a giant singular footprint everywhere Catazuma shows up? He's a ghost. He shouldn't be leaving footprints. And why only one of them? That's just such a strange choice. That's not to mention how the Stone Hacks dig out that shape so quickly. Why wire up a random room in the pyramids with electricity? That seems like a lot of work for seemingly no reason. And souvenir masks seem like a pretty risky way to smuggle rare gems into America, as I think someone could discern precious gemstones from the cheap plastic that gets put on there. But in the grand scheme of things, these are all relatively small issues in what is otherwise a solid plan. The Stone Hacks are gonna get an A. Next up, the gang visits the Florida swamp called the Hokey-Fanoki, not to be confused with the real-life swamp and the one that Morticia and Gomez visited in the new Scooby-Doo movies called the Okey-Fanoki swamp. The Hokey-Fanoki is home to the Skillet's Showboat, the originators of the Fanoki Fizz and Funky Fritters. It's a small business run by Ma and Pa Skillet, who live on the boat with their dog Scooby-Dum, cousin of Scooby-Doo. Business is going well enough that it gained the interest of soda superpower Coca-Cola Company, who sought to buy the fabled Fanoki Fizz formula. However, the president of Coca-Cola made a fatal mistake before he was able to close the deal. He fired his secretary. No, I'm being serious. You see, this secretary, Alice Dovely, decided to use her insider knowledge of this impending sale to get her revenge on her former employer. Using a mechanical alligator suit left behind on the set of a Beauregard film production shoot, she became the ghost of the Gator Ghoul. I have no idea what a Gator Ghoul is exactly, but I guess he died at some point. Dovely gets hired to work for the Skillets as a secretary, while on her off hours she scares off showboat customers and soda factory employees with a mechanical roar and spotlight eyes, eventually running the company into bankruptcy and ruining the deal guaranteed to make Coca-Cola a fortune. But this is only the first part of her plan. While the Skillets start to fall behind on bank payments, Dovely loans them money under the guise of charity, but in reality it would give her ownership of the famed Finoki Fizz and Funky Fritters, whose formula she'd fork over to her former firm for a fortune. Dovely would get her revenge while also becoming filthy rich. The Scooby-Doo show so far has managed to deliver on such well-done complex schemes, and Dovely's is no exception. All she has to do when the Scooby Gang shows up to help the hapless couple in Scooby-Dum is scare them away. And she does a good enough job in doing so. Now, she doesn't really do anything to try to trap the teens, and there are stints of this investigation where she doesn't really do anything to prevent them from discovering clues in her hideout at the old film set that would expose her, creating an issue of passivity on her part. If she had done anything to impede the gang's investigation past her admittedly convincing act as this ghoulish gator, she'd probably fare better in the grading. All she needed was like 1 or 2 major chase sequences and she would have gotten an A, but as it stands right now, just like a B, but like, you know, B+. Aw man, we got a favorite of mine now with the 10,000 volt ghost from the wintry wilds of Winterhaven. In reality, he's Chief Electrician Mr. Voltner, geez, creative name there, working on the orders of Winterhaven Mayor Dudley. These two men have engaged in a now classic Scooby-Doo real estate scheme. Mayor Dudley learns that a freeway was set to be built, running through parcels 27 to 45 in his humble ski resort town, and realized that this land would be worth a fortune. He enacts a plan to drive down the value of these parcels in order to buy them up cheap and resell them tenfold to the Federal Transportation Department. Now, this plan to achieve this is a bit complicated. During a winter storm, one of the high-tension wires on a pylon snapped, and when Voltner is forced to go up during the blustering blizzard by his boss, Mr. Collins, Dudley has the electrician fake his death. Then, using a battery pack and a scuba suit for insulation, Voltner returns to town pretending that he had come back as a ghost, seeking revenge for his death. This is actually a cover for his real goal, sabotaging the electric generators at the power plant to make living in Winterhaven impossible, running citizens out of town and local establishments out of business. Then, Dudley buys the abandoned land cheap to sell it off for a fortune. To ensure nobody returns, Voltner hides out in the local pet shop, using a secret tunnel to the power plant to constantly cripple Collins' attempt to cure the no-current conundrum. And then when Mystery Inc. shows up, Voltner does a pretty good job scaring them around, and is tasked with destroying the incriminating records of Dudley purchasing the parcels of land. I can't even blame the mayor for not hiding those records, as they are fairly innocuous to anybody who happens upon them, which in a ghost town such as Winterhaven would not be a whole lot of people. The only reason these documents are incriminating to the gang is because they found the report of the freeway construction hidden behind a mirror in Voltner's old home, which also makes sense because Voltner would have no need of that letter after faking his death and moving out. Maybe he should have destroyed it instead of tucking it away, but who's going to be searching the home of a dead man when his ghost is making it impossible to survive the winter? Likewise, I also don't blame Voltner for the birdseed that he accidentally tracked into the power plant. This is the sort of careless happenstance that doesn't reflect poor planning or failed plan execution. It is believably careless without compromising the competence of our criminals. This duo's only true slip-up in this whole scheme is that Voltner gave too much information to a parrot who turned out to be a stool pigeon. I mean, the feathered felon flipped so freely. No pressure was needed and he folded. You gotta be prudent with the company you keep. I mean, even your pets will squawk on you. And then Voltner locks Velma, Shaggy, and Scooby in the secret tunnel, but makes zero effort to prevent them from leaving on the other side. That's it. 2 relatively minor mistakes that don't take much away from what is one of the better, if not the best, real estate scams we've seen so far. I'm very tempted to give them an A+, but for right now, I'm gonna give them an A, which is still really good. Finally, we have arrived at a Halloween episode in a Scooby-Doo show, firmly justifying this as a Halloween video. The Scooby crew goes head-to-head with the Headless Horseman for the holidays. He's actually Elwood Crane, the thrice great-grandson of the famous Ichabod of literature. You see, Elwood is the successful owner of Apex International Shoes, or rather he was. The company filed for bankruptcy, and the floundering owner was desperate to grab some cash and disappear. He takes advantage of the legend surrounding the property Crane Manor sits on. Back in the American Revolution, a Hessian soldier lost track of his head thanks to the intervention of a colonial cannon. Being buried without it, rumors spread that he now comes back from the grave to search for a new one, even allegedly being behind the disappearance of old Ichabod. Elwood strikes during a Halloween party. First, he chops down a tree to fall into the power and phone lines, cutting off the lights and the manor itself from the outside world. Then he makes a big show about wanting a head, and allows his various witnesses to run away to spread stories of his appearance. To really sell the Horseman's presence, he actually attempts to take the empty heads of Shaggy, Scooby, and Scooby-Dum before making a ploy at swiping his Aunt Gertrude's priceless necklace, which is what he's really after in all of this. He then uses this as an excuse to get the necklace for himself, claiming the necklace is cursed and taking it away to put it in the bank vault. His real destination, however, is the airport. He fakes a car wreck and shows off the Horseman's new head before heading to his escape. Unfortunately for him, a heavy fog had settled that night, forcing him to wait until it lifts, buying Mystery Inc. enough time to gather some clues and discern his big plan. This unfortunate atmospheric delay is what brings Elwood's entire scheme to a crashing halt. Maybe it could be argued that he should have waited until there was better weather to flee the country, but then he'd also not have the witnesses he needs to blame his sudden disappearance on the fictional Phantom, as 2 or 3 people predispositioned to believe the curse would not be as plausible an alibi. I guess between the choices of a stronger alibi via more witnesses and a longer wait at the airport, Elwood made the right decision. Now, the big risk with this scheme is that he actually decides to show himself as the Headless Horseman post stealing his own head. On one hand, it does visualize his ultimate fate, being killed by the Horseman who takes his head with him to the grave. But on the other hand, it does make it a little easier to ID him as the ultimate culprit. Now, once he's out of the country with a new identity, that does cease to be a major issue, but it's still a rocky decision to make. I don't think it's a huge detriment to what is ultimately a really well thought out scheme, but I will shave a few points off to give Elwood a simple A. Next, we see a lot of retreads of old Scooby-Doo content. You got yet another castle that has been brought brick by brick from England, another Black Knight, and most egregiously of all, another Salrat gag.
Mike, thanks. It's all right.
However, our main monster is the ghost of Merlin, who is actually Zarko the Magician. He really wants the $1 million worth of jewels owned by Shaggy's uncle Shagworthy. Every night, right after he finishes his paltry magic show, Zarko and a henchman go to Shagworthy's castle, which is actually the famous Camelot castle, dress up as the ghost of Merlin and his evil Black Knight servant to prowl around looking for the jewels, which are hidden in the fridge of all places, because of course it's a Shaggy relative. To really sell the curse of Camelot, Zarko uses his magician trickery to rig all sorts of hauntings throughout the place and connect it all to an electronic organ in the tower. Eventually, the magician has to capture Shagworthy himself to operate more freely within it. The gang shows up during their search, forcing Zarko to turn his trickery on the teens. First, he pretends to be a caretaker who is taken away to be punished for letting them on the grounds. Then, he hypnotizes a couple of the sleuths to take care of the others, which buys him time to look for the loot unbothered. The problem with that scheme is that he chooses to hypnotize Shaggy and Scooby, so obviously things don't work out too well for him. Other than that, it's the standard chase and trapdoor stuff you're used to at this point. Their big screw-up comes at the end of the episode, though. The gang's trap fumbles, but thankfully Zarko and his henchmen are incredibly accommodating to their blunders, trapping themselves for the grand unmasking. Yeah, that's not great, is it? Zarko's plan is pretty basic, effectively just rummaging around a big old castle for valuables while using a ghost and magic tricks to scare people off. Wait, a magician searching for a treasure in a castle while dressed as a ghost? Wow, this episode retreads a lot. Well, Bluestone got an A, but he also didn't just trap himself for the gang. So to be fair, we'll bump Zarko down to a B. We now arrive at the often overlooked but generally acknowledged as one of the spookiest monsters of the franchise. But does his plan hold up to that reputation? The man we only know as Officer Oldfield is actually the mastermind of a multi-million-dollar gold robbery in Montreal, Canada. For the time being, he decides to store all the stolen gold bullion at the shady sanitarium. He disguises the loot as incoming patients in an urgent ambulance, hiding them in the morgue. While the ill-gotten goods are at the madhouse, they are melted down in a solar furnace into bars, which are then taken to a hidden cavern between the Canadian-American border to be tucked away in bread wrapping and smuggled across the border. Oldfield disguises himself as the ghost of the recently dead mad doctor who ran the place, the fittingly named Dr. Coffin, a guy mostly known for his brainwave experiments on dogs. Somehow the fake peacekeeper is able to recreate these experiments to control the dearly departed doctor's duo of dogs to attack people at random and perpetuate the phony phantom fiction. It's a pretty complicated setup this guy's got going on. Heck, it's such a tight-knit operation that Oldfield just has to do what he's already been doing when Mystery Inc. accidentally stumbles onto sanatorium grounds after blatantly ignoring his directions to the highway. Though that also kind of plays to his detriment as well. Because he sticks with the same old plan, he doesn't think to come up with anything different when that doesn't work. And it causes him and his thugs to become a little careless, allowing Fred, Daphne, and Velma to waltz into the unguarded morgue to discover the gold bullion and accidentally taking Shaggy and Scooby to their secret prize packaging plant between borders because they didn't bother to check if they were taking gold. Plus, they didn't notice that the carts they were taking to the border didn't have the wigs that they should have had. This carelessness and a failure to adjust a floundering plan does damage Oldfield's credibility as a master planner. Yes, it's good to have an excellent plan, but part of being a great genius criminal is the ability to change plans smoothly. If the original plan is working, that's fine, but once that plan starts to falter, you need to be able to pivot well too, like some of the other Scooby-Doo monsters have been able to. Oldfield just doesn't try. He just goes about his business like everything is a-okay. A good plan is only as effective as your ability to cover up the holes that pop up in it. And again, he didn't assign guards to guard the gold in an operating sanitarium full of Snoopy kids. I love Dr. Coffin as a monster, but as a master planner, he's only just good. And as such, I'm gonna have to give him a B. I'm surprised it took this long, but the Scooby-Doo franchise finally gets its second robotic monster. This one is known as the No-Face Zombie, and he's far less silly and whimsical than Charlie. His creation came about when Mr. Dilly, co-owner of the Dilly Dally Dolly Company, read an article in his favorite magazine. It detailed a golden galleon that was plagued by a curse from its original owner, causing it to bestow bad luck on all those who possess it while his zombie roams the earth searching to reclaim it. Despite all that talk of curses, the Sultan of Swahili, a name somehow less creative than the Mexican town of Cinco, has offered a $1 million reward for the coin. With the promise of such profit, Dilly uses his expertise in designing electronic dolls to build the No-Face Zombie, which is programmed to steal the gold galleon from the local coin shop and return it to him at the doll factory. However, the No-Face Zombie strikes right as the Scooby crew is next door at a deli enjoying a hero sandwich. They follow the zombie back to base, which forces Dilly to get involved personally, kidnapping his co-owner Mr. Dally and the Night Watchman and dressing up as a random-ass gorilla to take care of the gang. He originally sets out to scare the kids off, but once Velma discovers that he ripped out the magazine article, he tries to keep them in the doll factory to stop the teen sleuths from going out and getting another copy of the magazine, which would explain his whole scheme. This whole ordeal causes his zombie to dilly-dally around too much, allowing for a cat-and-mouse chase through the toy company, which buys time for the police to arrive. And to Dilly's credit, he commits to the gorilla bit and successfully swipes the coin for himself before trying to make a clean getaway. It just didn't occur to him that Shaggy and Scooby's panicked fear would actually lead to them being competent. Certain crimes do require a certain degree of separation to ensure that you go under the radar as a suspect. Sending a robot disguised as a monster to steal a MacGuffin is probably a smarter move than dressing up as a monster yourself, given that you have the capabilities to make that happen. Dilly gets a lot of credit for that. He also gets credit for getting involved himself once the situation got a lot more complicated, even almost getting away with the coin in the end. However, I think it's too risky of a move to have your undead automaton meet you at the place of business where you're set to arrive with your business partner. Not to mention the fact that there's already an ordinary watchman on duty. It would have been smarter to have the zombie meet him at a more isolated place where there'd be less witnesses, or leave the coin hidden somewhere where he picks it up later so that no one would spot a shambling burglar in direct contact with a toy manufacturer. The whole meetup arrangement threatens to bring the entire scheme to a collapse, which it technically does since some snooping super sleuths trailed your zombie toy to your own factory. If they followed it to a random tree in the park or something, this case would have been a little harder to solve. Still, Dilly made a valiant effort. I still can't get over that he became a random primate of all things. I'm grading this Ape and his automaton an average C. Scooby-Doo now returns to its favorite type of villain, the Witch Doctor. I don't know why they pop up so frequently in these early shows, but there's a lot of them, and every time it's going to be a weaker episode of mystery solving. This one is no exception. Mystery Incorporated's friend Alex Super is the lead singer of his own band, later retconned to be the Alex Super Experience. When they cut the tape for their new single, a cover of an ancient voodoo chant called Mamba Wamba, everyone just knew it was going to be such a massive hit worth millions. I don't know why people thought that, because the song freaking sucks.
Mamba, yeah, yeah, yeah. Zumba, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Regardless, the band's manager Roger, the token woman of the group Lila, and an unknown henchman decide to pull a scheme to keep all the profits of the song. During the first performance of the future hit, Roger pretends to be the voodoo priest Mamba Wamba, appearing to fulfill a threat he sent prior to the show. He quote-unquote kidnaps Lila, whisking her off to turn her into a zombie follower. Then, back at the Mason Dupree Manor, Roger and Lila start kidnapping members of the band to take to a fake voodoo ceremony where they are coerced into signing a parchment promising to never play Mamba Wamba again. But in reality, they are signing away the rights to the song, giving this witchy trio all the profits made from it. Now, I could talk about the presence of the Scooby crew among the band, but I don't really need to do that this time around. Part of it is simply that it's the standard fair scare scheme, but the larger part is that this entire plan is completely and utterly moronic. I do my best to have some leniency for certain aspects of schemes because this is a children's comedy cartoon, meaning that elements of these stories aren't necessarily going to be that realistic or plausible. But at least I can buy most of these villain plans and their setups. The real estate schemes make sense to me as the culprit can sell the land off and run away with the money before anyone is the wiser, and the burglars are home free if they manage to get away with their monetary MacGuffins. However, I cannot let this scheme slide. It is utterly asinine to think that this would work. If the Mamba Wamba bit actually played out as planned, the bozos would still fail. That's because they aren't trying to steal money or gold or real estate. They are trying to steal intellectual property under duress. That means eventually Alex and the band would learn that this whole voodoo hoodoo is a bunch of poodoo, leaving them with a very good legal case against their former friends. You know, being threatened into signing away the song rights and all. Like, what's the plan going forward from here? Is Lila gonna get cured and rejoin the band, or is she just destined to pretend to be a zombie forever so she doesn't get sued? This entire plan is faulty from conception and there's no way to salvage it. Next time, just settle for partial ownership and make sure the contract gives you merchandise rights. Then you got your life made without having to commit stupid crimes. And mind you, this is all for a lazy garbage song.
Doing the mamba, doing the samba.
It goes without saying that they're getting an F. It's very sad that a stupid caveman whose only characterization is that he's a moron is better at being a criminal than you. Let that sink in. We now turn from what's implied to be the Big Easy to the American Northwest, where a demon crawls around the Seattle underground. I'm frankly surprised that the 1970s Hanna-Barbera allowed demons to even be on this show. Of course, it's not a real demon, so that probably helped. It's actually Sam Crenshaw, the owner and operator of the Crenshaw Construction Company, and convenient first witness of the Hellspawn. Despite running a very successful construction business, Sammy has decided that it would be more lucrative to rob the abandoned Seattle underground. To do this, he turned to the legends from the 1860s, when an earthquake allegedly tore a hole in the ground, allowing demons to crawl out of the earth. They tormented Seattle for years until some guy drove them back with a talisman and trapped them with an iron seal. In the present, Crenshaw has his men break the seal while out on a job, allowing him to gallivant around as a demon and scare people away from the various entrances to the Seattle underground. If anybody actually ventures down there, he's rigged some stone demon statues from the Monster Museum on the still operational cable car system to make it look like a squad of demons are flying around. To add to the effect, he robbed the condemned drugstore and used chemicals there to create a smoke effect and leave behind sizzling claw marks. Crenshaw's exit strategy involves taking on another identity, that of sailor Albert Tross, who works as the boarder of the Hotel Crow's Nest. The basement there gives him easy access to the underground and provides an easy exit from his former life. Once the land down under is cleared out, he makes it look like the demons have kidnapped him and prepares to live life as a blue-collar worker. However, the Scooby Gang decides to investigate and finds a matchbook in his office, connecting him to the Crow's Nest, which forces Crenshaw to make Albert Tross disappear as well. He then goes full throttle on the Steam and Demon scheme and chasing the gang around the Forbidden Fallen City. Heck, he even manages to escape the trap the gang set for him and sell the idea that Albert Tross escaped the demon. That is until Scooby accidentally punches a hole in his booty, discovering the stolen loot and foiling his plans. This is a unique case where the setup plan is kind of rocky, while the actual reactions to the presence of Mystery Incorporated are actually really good. Crenshaw pulls off some good maneuvering and almost gets away with the scheme despite the gang's interference. I just think it's not the smartest career move to abandon a seemingly successful construction company that likely rakes in hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for him for a small treasure chest of doubloons while living out life in a shabby seaside motel. I guess he also stole his company's funds to pad his pockets, but I still think the point stands. Also, was his future boss in on this too? They never really explained that. Anyway, I guess Sam Crenshaw will get a B. We now get our second cattle rustling scheme, this time taking place in good old Texas, near the abandoned cliff dwellings of Hidden Valley, the legendary origin of the ranch. Not only does it provide the most popular dressing for your salad so you can pretend like you're eating healthy, but it also provides a legend of a spooky ghost bull that guards the burial grounds. It's this legend that cattle rancher Sam Farron takes advantage of in order to steal his neighbor's livestock, including Daphne's uncle Matt Blake. Farron dresses up as a cow to infiltrate his bovid victim's herd, driving them away from the pasture and into the Hidden Valley burial grounds, where they're loaded up on a truck and taken to Farron's ranch, where the 00 is branded over the Lazy S. Once the cattle come up missing, people can just blame the legend of the ghost bull Temuka. To sell this legend, Matt's cook Lenny flies around a helicopter made up to look like the ghost bull while also scaring people away from the burial grounds disguised as yet another witch doctor, or I guess this time he's called the Medicine Man Ghost. Like the last cattle rustling operation, this is pretty solid if not a little overcomplicated as a means to swipe some bovines. But also like the last cattle rustling operation, these guys don't respond well to the presence of Mystery Inc. Most of this just comes from the attempts to scare them off. Temuka is a pretty effective tool for that, but Lenny decides it's better to pretend to be the Medicine Man, in which he's hardly effective. Usually the monster of the week has some sort of successful scare, even having a moment of successfully capturing the gang. Lenny doesn't even get that far. It's just a series of him trying to find the gang and then having a childish temper tantrum when he fails. Not because the gang's fast thinking or even silly cartoon physics, but because of his ineptitude. Then he gets stuck in one of the weakest traps of the franchise before the sheriff arrests him off screen. There's also the case of the rustlers kidnapping Matt Blake for seemingly no reason, maybe to stop him from going to the police, and then letting him escape through unknown means, also off screen. These guys aren't quite the bumblers we've seen before. Heck, Sam's foreman is actually pretty competent in not just scaring the gang away, but also capturing them, all while not even being in costume. But they make too many slip-ups in the execution of their admittedly solid wrestling plan to make it tenable long term.
I'm giving this pack of villainous varmints a C.
What we have next is the basic setup from Scooby's Night with the Frozen Fright, but with the demon shark from The Secret of Shark Island, and a far more complex and convoluted plan. You see, Mr. Wells, the assistant manager at the aquarium Aqua World, is sent to India to drudge up a frozen shark man from the depths of the warmest ocean on Earth, and send it back to be put on display at the aquarium. What is it with these fish zoos being given important evolutionary discoveries? Regardless, while he's in India, Wells reads about the Maharaja of Ringtour loaning out his $2 million worth of personal pearls to the county museum. Seeing it as an opportunity for easy profit, he arranges for the Shark Man to be put on the same flight to the States, and using his own hobby of cabinet work with a specialty for hidden compartments, he sneaks into the customs office vault, swiping the pearls and returning to work. Wells buys a bunch of oysters from Sam's fish market, hiding the pearls inside of them, and throws them into the aquarium tanks with the real oysters. He then tries to arrange for these oysters to be transported to the Aqualand in Florida, bypassing the police roadblocks, allowing him to freely travel with the pearls to wherever he wants to take them. But his boss, Mr. Dreyfus, refuses to approve the transfer, forcing Wells to pretend that the Shark Man has somehow come to life as a sort of demon shark ghost thing to scare Dreyfus into quitting his job so he can take it and approve the transfer himself. In order to add confusion to anybody insane enough to actually investigate all this, he also introduces a Hindu spellbook to his co-worker Mr. Beaker as an explanation for the demon shark shenanigans, while also casting some form of suspicion on him as a culprit. Holy crap, that was unnecessarily complicated. And yet, I guess it kind of makes sense? Most of the complications come from his reactions to other people complicating his simple scheme, which was to sneak into the customs office in a secret cabinet and steal the pearls. Police roadblocks forced Wells to come up with the silly oyster plan, and then Dreyfus, understandably not approving the random transfer of oysters to Florida for no good reason, forced him to dress up as the demon shark. The problem is, he did nothing to actually get rid of the original demon shark, which completely debunks his whole ploy. Compare this to the Caveman, where Professor Wayne made sure that the Neanderthal actually vanished to make it look like it actually came to life. Here, we can just look in Beaker's lab and determine that the demon shark is, in fact, not alive. Heck, Beaker himself does this to justify his own skepticism. And even if that wasn't enough, Wells breaks his own illusion by suddenly begging Scooby-Doo to give him the pearly oysters as the demon shark. Not only is that not something something some prehistoric predator would do, but it also alerts the gang that the oysters are significant to his plan. If he had simply scared the gang off and came back later for the oysters, he'd have been able to get away with this super convoluted plan. We have yet another monster who shoots himself in the foot unnecessarily. While the plan is overly complex and ridiculous, it largely works fine enough. But Wells fails to uphold the realism of the demon shark attacks by not getting rid of the real shark and then begging like a dog to an actual dog. As I said before, it's important to keep the illusion of the supernatural, which Wells doesn't do, netting him a C. The next episode sticks with the nautical nicking theme, but with a markedly simpler plan. Oceanographer Professor Poisson is hired by the Maritime Museum to salvage the wrecked ship Diablo Doro of its gold and put it on display. He hires the Scooby crew to help him with this because, as the episode loves to remind you, they are experienced scuba divers. However, the ship crew he hires to get him to the Diablo Doro have other motives. Captain Carp and his mates McFinn and McGill, apt names for all of them there, want to steal the gold for themselves. So Carp creates the legend of Doro's late Captain Pescado scaring off intruders with his motley monster crew before abandoning ship. The terrible trio return later disguised as the seaborn Spector and his spooky squad to tie up Poisson, who tries to get a warning to the gang. The rest of the episode sees Carp and crew locking the Scooby squad in various rooms of the Sea Prowler to buy themselves enough time to pillage the Diablo Doro of its precious gold and return to port. It's as simple as that. Plus, locking doors is a lot more efficient than engaging in chase sequences that only waste their time. There's two problems though. First, if Carp was going to kidnap Poisson and tie him up, why not do the same to the gang, either that night or if the oceanographer fighting back took up too much time, then later as they split up to look for clues. Sure, locking them in rooms works, but because they're not tied up, they're free to find fairly facile fairways for flight. That is, easy ways of escape. This show's affinity for alliteration is appearing to affect me. But back to the point, their other mistake is allowing Velma to signal out an SOS to the Coast Guard. I won't necessarily malign the monster for sleeping on the job, but he definitely knew it was a matter of time before the authorities arrived to arrest his allies. Yet they in no way attempt to speed up their stealing or prematurely depart for port with what profits they could pillage in a more limited time period. With that being said, these guys were fairly effective in their scheme of stealing, so these sea specters shall settle with a B. Thankfully, the simplicity continues with one of the most poorly named ghosts with one of the dumbest backstories in the show. But first we must start with the man under the mask. Buck Bender was once a coach of the prestigious football team the Falcons. However, he was fired by owner Mr. Prentice for undisclosed reasons. Vowing revenge, he has now come back years later to tank the team that punted him. To achieve this, he first disguises himself as the scoreboard operator, giving him full access to some of the mechanical workings of the field along with the secret passages in the stadium. Then Buck pilots the robotic team mascot to nab star player Flash Granger, and he then kidnaps his replacement Crunch Connors with a trapdoor in the field, which somehow nobody else stumbled upon. To top it off, Bucky Boy takes advantage of the curse of the Rambling Ghost, a former Falcon player who is literally named Rambling Ghost and placed a curse upon the team after being booed off the field. You know, I get that. I do the same thing too. If you dislike this video, I place a curse on you that I, Spidgey, will one day return from the grave and share media takes with you that you don't like. Ooh! Ooh! Anyway, Rambling Ghost serves as a nice scapegoat while the Falcons suffer a loss at the Wonder Bowl, giving Buck his revenge. Except for the fact that Mystery Inc. gets involved. To Buck's credit, he manages to deal with them well enough. He manages to steal back a key clue that would incriminate him, though he did leave it lying around to be found in the first place. He tricks the gang with the story about how he was conked out by Rambling Ghost, and he traps 3/5 of the gang in an impossible to escape pit. Well, with the exception of cartoon physics, that is. However, Buck's big blunder is that he couldn't differentiate a dog from a black person.
And what a great idea to have Shaggy and Scooby play disguised in the uniforms of Flash Granger and Crunch Connors.
What did Scooby-Doo mean by this? But seriously, I get that this is simply costume magic that Scooby is able to use to pose as Crunch Connors in order to lure out the Rambling Ghost. I just really wanted to find something to poke at in Buck's plans because his whole scheme is just really lame. I'm reluctantly giving him a B. Next up, we have the reused monster in the Scooby-Doo show that annoys me the most. Episode 15 takes one of the most iconic monsters in the old show in the Phantom Shadows and reappropriates them into silly ice cream themed ghosts, aptly named the Technicolor Phantoms. The Neapolitan Phantoms was right there and they didn't use it. Now these sweet sugary specters are actually a trio of hijackers led by Sammy the Shrimp. They managed to steal a Blinks armored truck with $2 million inside and hid out in the Happy Humor Ice Cream Company's factory. Here, they plan to repaint the armored car as an ice cream truck to sneak past police roadblocks. However, they need to get rid of the factory workers to buy them time for the paint job. Sammy and company borrow some Acme costumes to become the Technicolor Phantoms, scaring off the ice cream employees and any interlopers. And just in case anybody discovers their temporary living space, Sammy poses as a night watchman. Once again, we have a good setup for a crime, but things get complicated once Mystery Inc. crashes into their schemes. Sammy screws up almost immediately. As the watchman, he takes the gang to the landline so they can call a tow truck to come fix the mystery machine, which Shaggy accidentally crashed. The natural thing to do is let the teens telephone the transportation tinkerers and wait for help to come to take them away. Sammy literally has to do nothing and his plan will proceed to succeed. Instead, he delivers a threatening message and tries to scare them away, alerting the amateur detectives to the fact that something illegal might very well be happening here. And this isn't a case of dramatic irony where he unknowingly sabotages his plans. The Scooby Gang straight up tell him what happens and what they plan on doing, and yet he still tries to scare them off despite knowing they have no way to leave anyway. He basically screws himself over for no good reason. Now, to his credit, after this big blunder, Sammy is able to pull off the haunting fairly convincingly, even able to get the gang locked in the freezer where they would surely die if his henchmen didn't mistake Shaggy for a fellow Phantom. Though to Strawberry's credit, he seems to just be having a blast with all this regardless. And then Shaggy easily takes care of them with a forklift. Hey, but then they almost capture them all again before being bested by some bovine booby juice. Yeah, Sammy the Shrimp might be the cleverest hijacker in the country, but man, is he not the spookiest Spector in the haunted house. In fact, the way he haunts ruins what was initially a good scheme, so he's gonna get a D. Rounding off the Scooby-Doo Dyno-Mutt Hour, which later got repackaged into the first season of the Scooby-Doo show, we see yet another mystery revolving around colonial ghosts. Except this time, they aren't teaming up with Nessie. Washington, D.C. city engineer Mr. Willett stumbled upon plans for an abandoned storm drain that runs underneath the Smithsonian Institute, connecting it to the U.S. Mint. So he concocts a plan to filch the fresh dough before it even has a chance to come to market. He recruits night watchman Mr. Clive and miscellaneous help to replace the wax statues of the American Revolution's greatest traitors: Benedict Arnold, William Demond, and John Andre. Though the latter was technically not a traitor since he worked for the British the entire war, but semantics. They do this in order to stay in the Smithsonian past closing time. Then Willett rigs Eli Whitney's cotton gin with a belt that stretches into the storm drain and connects to a drill that they use to break into the US Mint. In order to prevent people from stumbling upon this noisy nicking, they cover up the racket by rigging the locomotive above the gin to blare its sirens every time they drill baby drill while they scare off visitors as the ghost of the great American traitors. Once the gang shows up, they pretty much do the standard scaring song and dance, chasing them around, making ghostly grunts and hamming it up for the comedy. All of that is perfectly serviceable. But the problem is their plan was doomed to fail from the start. You see, they planned to steal freshly printed $100 bills straight out of the US Mint. That means that they haven't gotten the treasurer's signature, treasury seal, or serial numbers printed on them, rendering Willett's stolen salary to be merely the cost of the paper the money was printed on. Effectively worthless, especially for the prison sentence these guys are about to serve. They could have just gone to Target and shoplifted a composition notebook. I'm not saying that the printing process of the US Mint is common knowledge that these morons missed, but when you're breaking into a federal building in Washington, D.C., maybe verify that the loot lifted is actually lucrative. If these guys had actually succeeded in their stealing, they would be wanted as federal criminals for the sake of $50 worth of paper, meaning that their plan was fundamentally flawed. These felonious founding fraudsters are finding themselves with an F. Season 2 starts off with a more forgotten episode, seeing Mystery Inc. take a fishing trip somewhere in the American northern Midwest or southern Canada somewhere. Here, a pair of geologists discover a vein of rich uranium on a lakeshore and cook up a scheme with local Viking museum curator Mr. Hansen to scare off people with a local Viking legend about a haunted burial ground. Then the geologists fake their disappearances to start mining the radioactive riches using the environment's natural steam vents to power the equipment they bring in via ghost ship. At some point, Velma's Uncle John was able to figure this whole scheme out, so the trio of nefarious Nords kidnap him. However, this mystery is left behind for his niece and her nosy friends to solve. And how do the Vikings attempt to stop them? Well, they follow the kids around for a bit, and Mr. Hansen has them take a seat to warn them about the Viking curse. When those warnings go unheeded, we have the standard scare fares, some chases, some spooks, and some shenanigans. You know the drill at this point. These guys don't do anything particularly clever, nor do they blatantly bungle anything. There's one instance of Scooby almost getting murdered, and I guess they somehow trap Fred and the girls, but that's about it. They do the bare minimum to protect a very basic scheme. So for the standard fare of a basic scare, we're gonna give them a B. Next, we head to Skull Island. No relation to the Big Monkey's home. No, this Skull Island is home to a hotel that is set to be placed under the ownership of Daphne's friend Lisa upon her 18th birthday. However, her uncle Leon, who has been managing the hotel for the past 18 years, doesn't want to give up the business to anybody, much less the girl he raised as his own daughter. To make sure he keeps control of the caravansary, he makes up a story about how Lisa's grandfather was actually an infamous vampire who now seeks to turn her into one of his blood-sucking kin. While pretending to be Gramps the Vamp, that is his actual name, Leon places a hypnotic suggestion on his niece that when triggered by his wristwatch's alarm, causes her to feign vampirism. Upon being discovered sleeping in a coffin at the hotel, one of many there for an upcoming Undertaker convention, Lisa will naturally be sent to the loony bin, forcing her to sign over permanent ownership to her uncle. Fortunately, Mystery Inc. steps in to help their friend. This is when Leon makes a couple of mistakes in his plan. I won't count it against him that he failed to know that Daphne and Lisa swapped rooms, thus delaying his timeline, but I will count it against him that he catches Scooby, Shaggy, and Scooby-Dum spying on him hiding Lisa away, and then he proceeds to do nothing to hide her somewhere else. If he had, he could have likely succeeded in his plans. The second thing I'd like to bring up is that we see his wristwatch go off automatically at select times. This is not a good thing for Leon, as the watch triggers the vampire transformation. And if Lisa hadn't lingered in the room for just a few more minutes in this particular scene, he would have inadvertently exposed himself thanks to a work break ending. It doesn't really make for a fantastic plan if you can so easily foil yourself by accident. If not for that, Leon would have gotten an A, but because a key element of his plan can just as effortlessly break it as make it, he's gonna get a B. Now we take to the sky to take a look at the Pterodactyl Ghost. For those who have only seen the live-action movies, you may be surprised to find that this guy is not actually mad scientist Jonathan Jacobo, but actually catering business owner Johnny. See, James Gunn was plucking obscure characters from pre-established franchises and completely misadapting them long before he started doing it for Marvel and DC. Granted, Johnny is not that great of a character, and this whole scheme became outdated the second the internet came to be. So I guess I can't get as mad as him as the Marvel and DC fanboys are. You see, Johnny's catering business is actually a cover for his deeper, dastardly plot. He pirates music. Yeah, see, I can do that with a click of a mouse while I record this video and no one will do anything about it. Heck, many will even encourage such behavior nowadays. I mean, how do you think I got the footage for this video? Yet back in the 70s, this was a massive criminal racket. Johnny and his crew record broadcasts of Elvish John's new hit singles onto CDs in his cave base in the Big Canyon, and he hang glides to a warehouse across the river with the records. Then the catering man hops in his catering van to deliver the robbed records to the record stores. His operations worked well for a while until people took an interest in these spontaneous sky sailing sojourns. This is when Johnny's business partner and manager of local dude ranch, Mr. Bohannon, our second take on a Sydney Greenstreet villain being obviously suspicious, decides to make up a legend about a humanoid pterodactyl ghost haunting the canyons. Johnny then dresses up as said humanoid pterodactyl ghost to scare people away from their operations. It's hard to take this scheme seriously as a zoomer who sails the high seas himself from time to time, particularly when it comes to making these videos, but I have to admit, it's not a bad scheme. I mean, it'd definitely be easier to just drive the records to the warehouse instead of a more conspicuous giant pterodactyl costume, especially during a hang gliding contest of all things, but they justify this decision by saying it saves time. Sure, we'll go with that, I guess. When the gang shows up for this tournament, Bohannon does his job well enough by spooking them with pterodon tales, and Johnny manages to whip up some cave drawings to further sell the ludicrous legend. Now, there is a moment where Johnny dognaps Scooby-Doo, but then he immediately reveals where the cowardly canine 9 is contained instead of capturing the other clue hunters, content to calmly creep them out. You know, they'd be out of your hair, or rather scales, more definitively if you just kidnapped them. The rest of Johnny's jaunt as the Jurassic Phantasm consists of chases and scares. There are certainly decisions that could have been made to smooth the Sonic High Seas stealing, but the ploy is functional enough, I guess. It looks like Season 2's starting a trend here because the Pterodactyl Ghost is getting yet another B. However, this next episode decides to break that B-grade streak, though not for a good reason. The Phantom of Milo Booth is a bit of a fan-favorite ghost, but his plan is kind of nonsense. Jim Moss is the studio chief of the production company heading up the remake of the silent film classic Phantom of Dixie, starring Scooby-Dee, cousin of both Scooby-Doo and Scooby-Dum. However, Jim plans to get rich off of Dee's career by replacing her with an imposter who will only listen to him, allowing him to rake in the dough from her illustrious life in the showbiz. You know, assuming this fleabag can actually act. Judging by his performance as Scooby-Dee, I'm unconvinced. To achieve this, Mr. Moss starts out with a half-decent plan. He dresses up as the ghost of the late Milo Booth, star of the original Phantom of Dixie, to spook the production. This sets up a future scapegoat for Dee's sudden change in behavior. Then he makes his move on the dainty Dixie doggy's train trip back to Hollywood. His first attempt to kidnap Dee fails, but he does something smart to get that opportunity. As Jim, he personally splits the gang up to search for the ghost, leaving less people to guard Dee while the others find alleged evidence of Milo Booth's return from retirement. He then manages to pull this ploy off again by indulging in Fred's trap, placing Shaggy as Dee's personal guard, which enables him to kidnap the Southern Belle. Fred then randomly abandons his trap plan and takes everyone back to the private train car so Jim can decouple them in Boothville. This is where Jim's plan kind of falls apart. He makes sure the gang spots him running into the cemetery where he's prepared the Booth mausoleum to look like the perished performer has returned to Earth for a comeback career. Then Dee's cousins discover that she's a duplicate because she doesn't kiss her cousins like she used to, naturally as cousins do, forcing Jim to lock everyone in the mausoleum. Then he randomly goes into Boothville to try to steal an old newsreel of the real Milo Booth, because it can be used to disprove his haunting scheme? I mean, if that's the case, he'd have to steal literally every copy of every newsreel and movie Milo Booth has ever appeared in. Taking one reel from a small town film festival does nothing to hide the fact that you don't look like the real Milo Booth. And that's not even to mention that Jim is specifically dressed up as Milo Booth's role as the Phantom of Dixie, not the actual Milo Booth. Sure, that's a made-up movie monster, but that hasn't stopped Scooby-Doo from making one a ghost before. So none of this entire thing matters anyway. I guess Jim realized this and left the reel alone, leaving behind footprints for the gang to track, save Dee, and capture him in a Ferris wheel. None of what he does in Boothville is necessary to his end goal, and it explicitly destroys every aspect of his plan. If he had just dognapped Dee on the train and then did nothing for the rest of the trip, then nobody would ever learn that she was replaced, or at least much later when it'd be harder to prove him the culprit. The episode says that the whole Boothville stunt was to convince people that Milo had actually come back as a ghost, though if his body was missing and mud is strewn about, he'd be a zombie or a revenant, not a ghost. But that's besides the point, I guess. People have already seen you as a ghost. They watched you climb out of a coffin. You didn't have to strand everybody in the dead actor's namesake to sell the verisimilitude of your zombie thespian. If you really wanted to set up the mausoleum for shits and giggles, then do it before or after the train trip. I highly doubt anybody's going to prioritize taking a trip out to Boothville to verify that Milo Booth has in fact returned from the grave after personally witnessing him attack Scooby-Dee. None of this was necessary, and it screwed your plan up, you moron. I really want to give him an F, but Jim's gonna get a D just because his maneuvering on the train is legitimately clever. And then he sniffed glue or something and became about as operational as an eggplant. It freaking pisses me off, all that stuff in Boothville. Like, it legitimately made me angry while I was writing this. Thankfully, the Scooby-Doo show recovers with the Phantom Racer. Ken Rogers is a racer participating in the Grand Prix time trials who actually plans to steal the cars participating alongside him, then repaint them and sell them overseas. To achieve this, he sets up shop in a local junkyard where he salvages the engine of a jet plane and installs it in a race car rigged up like a lumber carrier equipped with magic or something to speedily catch other drivers and kidnap them. Rogers then becomes the Phantom Racer, bringing a legend around a driver falling off a cliff and haunting the track to life. Once he takes the cars back to his junkyard base, Kenny then hypnotizes his captives to forget about everything that happened to them and then sends them back out to the public. He also manages to handle the Scooby crew fairly well. Disguised as the junkyard watchman, Rogers directs the gang to the Antique Car Museum, where he ambushes them and nearly succeeds in killing off Scooby and Shaggy. Unfortunately for him, they're saved, and with his time trial coming up, he's forced to just warn them about the Phantom Racer's curse and leave. When Fred attempts to kidnap the speedy Spector, Kenny is able to not just outmaneuver it, but also kidnap Shaggy, whom he decides to brick up in a wall. The implications of Shaggy being left there until he starves to death is kind of terrifying. This guy might actually be psychopathic. Ken Rogers' only bit of poor planning really comes in the fact that he has nobody guarding the junkyard when he's not there to play night guard himself, which allows the gang to stumble upon his secret operations. Outside of that, this is a pretty good, if not mechanically improbable, criminal operation. Kenny crosses the finish line with the first A of the season. Well, if I had a nickel for every time Mystery Inc. encountered a witch and a zombie trying to find loot from an old robbery job involving a guy named Zeke, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird how often the Scooby-Doo show likes to reappropriate things from Where Are You, right? Although, to be fair, the zombie thing wasn't intentional. Zeke Harkins just looks like that naturally, and Daphne just calls him a member of The Walking Dead. That's rough, bud. Male pattern baldness likes to hit some people harder than others. Zeke is, in reality, a bank robber who buried $500,000 of loot in the Ozarks before getting arrested. He left directions to the ill-gotten gains written on the underside of a floorboard in an old cabin, and then he left directions to find those directions in an old spellbook he once owned, because I guess he just has severe memory issues. His ex-girlfriend Aggie Wilkins discovers the spellbook, prompting Zeke to break out of prison, starting a race to the robbed riches. Unfortunately for both of them, the old cabin was recently bought by the Hatfield family, so Aggie devises a plan to run them off. She dresses up as the ghost of a long-dead witch claiming Clan McCoy, trying to re-inflame the old Hatfield and McCoy feud to scare the hillbillies away. When they don't run off, she pretends to turn them into frogs, though in reality she was just locking them up in the old sawmill, all by herself. Somehow. I don't know why she didn't just kidnap them off the rip, but hey, she eventually got the job done. However, our wily witch woefully whiffs when warring with the gang, largely in that she doesn't really do anything to try to stop them. I mean, she does capture Velma, Shaggy, and Scooby later on, but that's about it. For Zeke's part, he just digs. Bro's just playing Minecraft while his ex is running around kidnapping hillbillies. Story of my life. So once again, we see a monster with a solid plan that suffers from piddling perpetrators. If any of the past paramours had plotted less passivity, at least Aggie would have passed with an A, but because they barely battle the gang, they're both going to be blessed with a B. Next, the gang are blessed with a pleasure cruise, wherein a swindling scheme is stirring. Professor Von Clamp has set out to build the world's first ever time machine, but time has run short for him. If he doesn't prove to potential investors that the machine works by midnight the first night of the cruise, his backer Simon Grady will not only be taking his money back, but claim ownership over the bucket of bolts. The catch is, these two have a different plan in mind. They fake a Fritz that summons a fiend from the future, who is actually Grady in costume to kidnap Von Clamp. Then they somehow wire a laser beam gun into the closed-circuit security cameras, shoot it through these projection discs, and cast holograms of the monster all over the ship. This con is contrived to convince the cautious cash lenders that the chronological commuter is in fact a corporeal creature and not some counterfeit creation. Von Clamp is held hostage in the crew's quarters where he would be easily found. This enables him to reactivate the time machine to capture the monster again. Curiously, this is only after the investors present their interest in furthering the project in cash. This is because in the monster's attempt to escape, Grady can grab the greenbacks before being sent back to the future. You're welcome, Robert Zemeckis. Scooby-Doo did it first. Scooby-Doo does everything first. Then Von Clamp can pretend that the machine had broken down, allowing the two swindlers to run off with the money. The problem is, they don't do that, which gives Velma, who has seen right through this transparent facade, an opportunity to turn the tables with a false fiend from the future of her own, which in turn exposes this whole scheme. That's not even to mention that Von Clamp, for no reason by the way, decides to randomly invite the gang to his demonstration, which of course leads to his swindle getting subverted. Now, he couldn't have foreseen that some teenagers and their dog would upend his whole plan, but again, he had no reason to invite them anyway. So I think my point still stands. If he had not invited the Scooby crew to witness his song and dance, or if he and Grady immediately abandoned ship the moment they got the money, this would have been a pretty good scam. Also, this duo should not have fallen for Velma's counter scam. scam, or at the very least knew that their money was safe. Either the monster is real and just has another briefcase for some reason, or it's fake and someone is trying to trick them with their own trick. They're kinda dumb for thinking their fraudulent finances were in jeopardy. These guys made way too many random decisions that ended up collapsing in on them, so they're gonna get a C. The Season 2 finale keeps us seaside for an absurdly complicated criminal scheme. Captain Clements discovers a sunken submarine in the sea outside of his cliffside cabin, which is somehow intact enough for him to use it as a criminal cosmetology lab. If a fugitive needs help getting out of the country, they contact Clements, who puts them in a costume inspired by a local sea creature story to scare off interlopers while he and his people prepare a new identity and look. Once that's ready, the ship signals the criminal, who signals back from Clements' house and heads out into the surf, where he gets a makeover, a new identity, and some transportation across the ocean. Now, the way this episode plays out, it looks like there are 4 or 5 criminals concurrently creeping around as the creature, which does add a lot of needless complications to Clements' criminal concoction. What also adds some complications is the presence of Mystery Inc. Clements has to limit his own involvement in some of these proceedings by pretending that the creepy heap from the deep stole his soul, enabling him to scare Shaggy and Scooby away from the beach for a single scene. The rest of the episode just sees the various sea creatures trying to scare and occasionally kill the gang while they gussy up for their new lives. For how ridiculously complex Clements' operation is, the way these monsters try to get rid of the gang is surprisingly simple. That being said, there's a couple of flaws with their plan. A, Clements apparently has no guards assigned to his freighter ship, which allows the gang to sneak into the chart room unimpeded. I mean, the episode says that there were guards on the ship, but where the heck are they? And B, Clements is the one who gives the criminals the makeover, yet he also wastes a lot of time pretending to be a soulless husk in his house while his client below heads out to the sub. It would probably be a better move to have somebody else take the position in either the house or the sub, because stationing Clements in both places kinda feels redundant. Why not just set the lab up on either the boat or the house? Sure, the sub is conveniently hidden at the bottom of the sea where no police would ever think to look, but I think you could easily hide things as simple as makeup and passports where they'd be hard to find, yet more easily accessible. This plan just feels needlessly overcomplicated. I mean, it's still mostly functional, but it would be much better if it was simplified. Season 2 is going to end with me giving out the very frequent B grade. If I had a nickel for every Scooby-Doo show season premiere that sees the gang going to the border area between Midwest America and Canada to visit Velma's uncle, who has been kidnapped by the villain for getting too close to solving the mystery, I'd have 2 nickels. Man, I wish I was getting paid for the observations in these videos. I could probably retire at this point. This time around, our criminal scheme isn't uranium mining, but smuggling. Gray Fox is the Chippewa mastermind of a smuggling ring operating out of presumably the Great Lakes area. He loads the loot onto a jet-powered helium balloon disguised as the Willowa monster of legends to scare people off, transporting it all over the border. Velma's uncle Dave, a border control agent, comes too close to discovering the location of their base hidden inside a cave by the Painted Rocks. So Gray Fox sends his henchmen disguised as Owlmen to kidnap him. Velma and her friends discover the Strigidae struggle scene and follow in her uncle's footsteps. In response, Gray Fox just goes about his business and leaves his Owlmen to chase the gang a single solitary time and then get captured by their SOCOM Red Heron off screen. Yes, we have another case of contentity. The bad guys are comfortable in their admittedly good scheme, causing them to be passive in response to an actual threat to their operations and leading to their downfall. The final season of this video is going to unfortunately start with a middling C. We now head to a location so ripe with mysteries that it's a perfect fit for a Scooby-Doo episode. The Bermuda Triangle. This naturally provides the least convincing monster costumes yet. Dr. Grimsley is a weather scientist who decides to take advantage of the stories of planes and boats disappearing in the triangle to make some weather research planes of his own vanish. He projects a flying saucer from a submarine that seemingly swallows the seaplanes, when in reality he remote controls them to his base on Diablo Island, where he repaints the planes to sell them overseas. Oh, and he and his henchmen dress up in these silly little skeleton skin suits to scare off anybody who suddenly stumbles upon the stormy island, like the Scooby Gang. When they do show up, Grimsley and the Skeleton Men chase Shaggy and Scooby around. There's not even an attempt at capturing the pair or even a clever gag or anything. They just run around in these ridiculous outfits while leaving their plane hangar and submarine dock unguarded for Fred and the girls to snoop around. I think they might have a booby trap set up in the corner of the hangar, but they don't really have much else. I mean, at least they're more active than Gray Fox and his goons, but there's not a lot to talk about past the initial conception of the scheme, which is fine, though the UFO bit seems a little pointless and over the top. The only people who are going to see the UFO are going to immediately learn that it's fake upon being taken to Diablo Island. Just cut their radio and people will just dream up the Bermuda Triangle stuff on their own. Though it is Scooby-Doo, so I can't really be too harsh about that. The only other thing to talk about is how Grimsley was somehow chasing Shaggy and Scooby around on the island while also being in Miami to talk to Fred on the radio. That don't make no sense. Anyway, I guess this teleporting scientist is barely gonna get a B. The show does a total climate swap, going from the tropic seas of the Atlantic to the tundras of the Great White North. Here, Jean-Pierre Baptiste works as a research assistant for Professor Kruger. During one of his expeditions, he discovers an oil pool under the snow and naturally wants to make some money off of it. Taking advantage of the local Eskimo legends around a vengeful snow beast, this French felon frightens the unfortunate fellows from his fortune with a factory-made monster. With the locals gone, Jean-Pierre then builds oil derricks with an Alaskan oil driller and disguises them as geologically inappropriate totem poles. He pumps the oil and smuggles them out via a souped-up submarine. However, Professor Kruger got suspicious of this scheme, forcing Frenchie to filch his boss. And then Kruger calls in the Scooby crew, and the Inuit tribal chief Manook returns to the village, which means more abductions are required. JPB is successful in stealing off Manook, but he has more trouble with the teenagers, ultimately leading to his own capture. The assistant doesn't really do anything particularly wrong that obliterates his operations, though I suppose he does suffer from the increasingly common affliction of chasing Shaggy and Scooby while the others pose more of a threat. I get that it's a trope, but it is a key decision that ultimately leads to his failure. That being said, I won't hold it against him too much. I will call out how most people in the area would definitely find the totem pole suspicious, since that's something you'd find down south and not in the Alaskan wilds. If anything, it's more suspicious than a couple of random oil derricks. Frenchie's going to find himself with a B. We now have our second and final Halloween episode. I remember there being more than that, but at the very least, they're 2 for 2. Arlene Wilcox is the descendant of Melissa Wilcox, a witch who was burnt at the stake during the Salem witch trials, about 80 years after they actually happened and 2 after the US became an independent nation, but we're not here for historical accuracy. We're here for monsters. As she was burned alive, Melissa vowed to return in 200 years for revenge. Once that time expires, Arlene finds herself inheriting the Wilcox family home and the real estate it sits on. However, she has a secret twin who has been erased from the family tree and really wants to reclaim what's rightfully hers. She bribes the local graveyard caretaker Gar Mooney to build a wiring setup for a witchy get-up to make it glow. This is all for the sake of pretending that Melissa Wilcox has returned to enact her revenge. And not just that, but to convince the superstitious lot of Salem that she has returned to possess Arlene. Mooney brings the local mob coordinator Squire Marley to the graveyard to witness the witch, and then the duo just have to sit back and let the mob do its job. For the most part, they kinda do. This is the one instance in which doing nothing actually works to the monster's benefit. Mooney basically does his part in warning Arlene of the murderous mob to move her into Skipping Town, which works. What works a little less so is when Twin Cox goes to the Wilcox house to scare Shaggy and Scooby, for some reason. On one hand, she's able to lure the Scooby Gang away from the house, leaving Arlene alone and vulnerable for the mob and Mooney's manipulations. But on the other hand, it basically exposes that the whole idea of Arlene being possessed by Melissa was a made-up masquerade, which kind of betrays the whole point of the scheme. Then we have the final appearance of our spurious spellcaster. She is shown running through the cemetery for reasons unknown and then tripping and falling into a hole that Mooney himself dug. I have no idea why she was here, or still in costume, especially when an angry mob is on their way to burn her at the stake, but I guess she just had to be there so we could reveal who she is. So yeah, this is a criminal plan that requires the criminal to do literally nothing, and the more they do as the episode progresses, the shakier the plan becomes. The initial setup for it is pretty clever, having some ignorant fellows do the dirty work of running Arlene out of town, allowing her twin to claim the house for herself. Honestly, I don't even know if these two committed a crime here. Maybe ID theft? Deceit? I mean, Squire was about to commit a vigilante killing based solely on seeing a witch in a graveyard, and he's the one who gets to perform the arrest. What kind of justice is that? Regardless of that, the witch switch plan gets a B. If Twin Cox had done absolutely nothing, she would have gotten an A, but I guess she couldn't help being a Gemini. The final season of the Scooby-Doo show delivers its first iconic monster in the Tar Monster. In reality, he is Mr. Stoner, who surprisingly has nothing to do with Shaggy's extracurricular activities.
You buzzed?
No, he is an archaeology assistant on the site unearthing the ancient city of Byzantius, likely one of the biggest archaeological discoveries of the century. The inner sanctum is said to contain a vast amount of treasure. It is also said to be guarded by a monster from the local tar pits. Stoner takes on the identity of this tar monster in order to scare off all the workers, buying him time to plunder the booty and hide it in a secret room within the sanctum. I guess he was going to come back for it later, or maybe slowly smuggle the stolen goods out one at a time, who knows. In order to get around the Turkish guards standing outside the only entrance to the city, Stoner scuba dives into the tar pits, which connect underground. That doesn't sound possible, especially since Stoner stays in the sticky black goo for most of the episode, but sure, I'll roll with it. When the gang arrives on the site at the request of Stoner's boss Brixton, he attempts to scare them off in the middle of the night, but when that fails, he goes back to Byzantius to finish off his filching, only attacking when Shaggy and Scooby stumble upon him. Again, this is a case where passivity isn't necessarily a bad thing, as Stoner is able to hide all of the treasure overnight, making better use of his time than chasing around the gang. Then he basically hides out in hopes that they just leave, but he gets aired out. It's hard to necessarily hold that against him since he already accomplished his goal and likely didn't want to take an unnecessary risk in jumping the gang again. However, he was a little too messy in leaving all of his stuff strewn all over the place for the gang to find, which enables them to force him out of the tar pits. I guess that's not a knock against his planning, rather his cleanliness, but it is a critical mistake on his part that leads to his downfall. Still, I think Stoner's going to score an A. Next up, Nessie returns to Scooby-Doo, and this time she's teaming up with a ghost that thematically makes more sense and is in a location befitting the name Loch Ness Monster, that obviously being Loch Ness. Specifically, we're turning our attention to Castle Macduff on the shores of the loch, where the castle's chief of staff, Jamie Cragmore, operates a smuggling business out of the lower levels of his place of employment, largely dealing in Swiss watches and other valuable goods from the land of convenient offshore banking for criminals. Unfortunately for Jamie, his boss, Aggie Macduff, started operating the castle like a hotel in an attempt to keep the castle afloat. This interfered with Cragmore's business, so he comes up with a spectral scheme to scare off the sightseers, dressing up as the angry ghost of Aggie's great-grandfather, Finian. He rigs up his smuggling submarine to look like Nessie and is somehow able to control it with his bagpipe music, guiding it to a boathouse on the moat during foggy nights where he can unload the loot and send it back out somewhere. The musically manipulated monster is kind of a neat idea, but it's also kind of stupid, as any Scot who decided to bust out some bagpipes to boogie down is going to create some cross signals that will complicate the criminal activities, as we see when Scooby starts playing them at the end of the episode. On top of that, how is Jamie supposed to send the sub out to collect incoming goods or transport outgoing goods? Halfway across the loch, it would just stop moving. Sound can carry far, but not that far. That's not even to mention the fact that if Jamie drives Castle Macduff out of business, he'd find himself out of a job and unable to continue smuggling his Swiss wristwatches in. You know, the whole business he's trying to protect with the Phantom facade. When the Scooby Gang shows up in Scotland at Aggie's summons, he doesn't really do too much to counter them. He drops Shaggy and Scooby into the dungeons, but also forgets to lock the door to them and guard it properly, allowing the goofy duo to just walk out. Thankfully, he learns his lesson next time, actually locking them up in a storage room, though he apparently forgot that there was a window in there. Then he engages in a bagpipe battle with Scooby-Doo and loses. That's really all there is. What is up with the weirdly passive monsters this season? At least the past couple kind of made sense in how little they did, but this guy really needed to do more. The only note this high-flying Highlander is going to be playing is a D. Even though he kinda seems more like a comic supervillain than a Scooby-Doo monster, Iron Face is still incredibly dope, and one of the most iconic monsters to come from the Scooby-Doo show. And what's more, he's a she! Mama Mione is a former water skiing champion turned cafe owner who uses the culinary company as a cover for her criminal activities, namely being a courier for escaped convicts. She smuggles the fugitives to the abandoned prison Skull Island, and no, not any of the past ones we've talked about so far. She hides them in torpedoes made up to look like sharks that she then rides as the ghost of the fabled pirate prisoner Old Iron Face. On Skull Island, she has converted the lower levels into a fancy mansion that she she keeps stockpiled with luxurious foodstuffs imported in metal crates. I guess at some point she also smuggles the criminals back out to the mainland after enough time has passed. This is where things get complicated for her. Skull Island starts the process of being turned into a tourist attraction, which would definitely spoil her entire operation. This spooks her clients away, specifically when tour guide Captain Morgan shows up on the long-abandoned lockup in preparation for a tourist trip with the Scooby Gang. Mama Mion torpedoes his ship and takes him hostage, but in the process of taking her clients back to the mainland, she runs into Mystery Inc., which then sets them off on their own investigation. To deal with them, she basically spends half of the episode chasing Shaggy and Scooby around, while the other teen sleuths basically learn every detail of her operation. Now, to give her credit, Scooby and Shaggy were technically the bigger threats at first, as they went into the Skull Island Penitentiary right above the hidden mansion, while the others dilly-dally at the docks. Yes, they discover some key clues there, but the core of the criminal conspiracy is technically more at risk of exposure by our cowardly crime fighters. It's just unfortunate that she becomes too preoccupied with them while Fred, Daphne, and Velma actually blow the case wide open. What I will fault Mama Mion for is how she basically does nothing in response to her secret base being open to the public. That's basically a death nail in her operation, and she doesn't do anything about it. Sure, she kidnaps Captain Morgan, but that doesn't really help her. If anything, that only invites further suspicion, as people knew that the tour guide was heading to Skull Island. The smarter move would have been to move the mansion setup somewhere else, call it quits entirely, or do something to make it impossible for the prison to be opened up as a tourist attraction. The Iron Face routine was clearly not doing it. Maybe that's more so a flaw of the episode, as it could have easily reframed the setup as the county trying to open Skull Island to the public, but Iron Face's presence causes too much safety concerns. As the story is presented, though, Mama Mion is kind of dumb for not doing anything about Skull Island inviting guests despite her hauntings, and is just going about her business as usual. This kind of passivity is worse than ignoring some kids, since they can feasibly be perceived as not a threat, but this is businesses and presumably the local and federal government getting involved. They aren't something you can just ignore. Trust me, I've tried. Ironically enough, Mion is one of the better monsters so far this season when it comes to dealing with the gang, and that fact, paired with a fairly decent operation she's got going on, is gonna get her a C. But it's important to stress that criminals need to be paying attention to business and federal operations that threaten the setup they have, and they need to respond to it. Again, I'm not offering criminal advice here. You should not take my advice seriously whatsoever, alright? The worst crime I've ever committed is going like 20 over the speed limit in a small town, alright? Don't actually listen to me and go out and do criminal dealings on your own and go, hey, Spidgey told you to do it. I'm not advocating for you to be a criminal, okay? Jeez, friggin' delinquents. We turn to the Amazon rainforest, where a tribe of native headhunters worship perhaps the strangest monster the Scooby Gang has encountered. Jaguaro, a beast with the body of a non-native gorilla, the head of a saber-toothed cat, and the cry of a screaming middle-aged man. Now, an Aussie documentarian named Barney has been following this tribe of headhunters, learning their ways, their cultures, and customs, and likely witnessed a few ritual killings along the way. He also discovers diamonds in this section of the river, so our director from Down Under weaponizes the legend of Jaguaro against these natives, scaring them deeper into the jungle by pretending to be their vengeful god. He steals their snarling statue of the beast and hides it in their cave entrance. Somehow the headhunters couldn't find it here, even though the gang is able to stumble upon it by accident the second they walk in. I don't know, maybe Barney should have just tossed the statue in the river instead so no one finds it, and thus exposed the fact that his Jaguaro routine is just that, a routine. But I digress. Barney sets up shop in a hut on stilts where he makes like a ye old miner, using a sluice to panhandle for diamonds. He then teams up with South American pilot Luis to ship out whatever diamonds he found in a film reel case. Luis fakes an emergency landing, picks up the diamonds, and then continues on the journey to Rio de Janeiro. However, on this particular flight, lead pilot Jose spots Barney digging for diamonds, so the Aussie abducts him and holds him in the hull of his riverboat. Luis does the plane up to look like Jaguaro attacked, and then the two head out to find the gang who have been investigating. All the devious duo need to do from this point on is get the gang back on the plane and take off. However, the headhunters get a little worked up, thinking that the plane crashing had angered Jaguaro, and they capture Shaggy and Scooby for a pleasant evening that definitely won't end in ritual sacrifice. The others delay departure to deliver the dummies from death. Barney, for some reason, decides to attack them during the escape, leading to his own capture. If he had allowed them to return to the plane, the Scooby crew would have gotten out of his hair, leaving him to continue tormenting natives and thieving their diamonds. Maybe he wanted to deliver the teens to the headhunters, rather just letting them die since they were getting too close instead of giving them passage back to the city. But unfortunately, that's never quite explained. Barney had an okay operation going, if you ignore the awful hiding spot for the Jaguaro statue and the fact that Louise frequently faking emergency landings in the same strip of jungle definitely sparks suspicion after some time. And his needless appearance at the end of the episode spoiled his scheme, causing his capture. This diamond divining duo is deserving of a D. The Scooby Gang continues to fight felines in their next criminal conspiracy. Dr. Bell is a psychiatric doctor who wants to use one of his patients as a cover for a jewelry heist. His plan is to send the lucky patient a cat medallion in the mail from the tomb of the cat creature. He then hypnotizes that patient with the medallion, gaslighting them into thinking that they've been cursed to turn into the cat creature at night and commit common crimes. He'll overprescribe them with sleeping medication to fake this transformation with the help of a turntable wall to really sell the effect. And he cleverly maintains those mechanics for the entire episode to keep that con intact. After the burglary, Bell leaves some of the pillaged jewels on the nightstand to cast suspicion towards his patient while taking some of the more valuable items for himself. The perfect mark presents itself when Daphne's aunt Olivia Dervey proves to be the most responsive of his patients to hypnosis. This of course gets Mystery Incorporated involved in the mystery, so he has to drug Olivia multiple times in a single night in order to don the costume of the cat creature and capture the crime fighters and their canine. Now, each time Bell bounces out of bed does threaten to expose himself and his crimes, but the gang is also close to doing that anyway, so this really becomes a question of what he should prioritize. Stopping the gang from exposing his plans, or making off with the loot he's already lifted. There's the potential that Bell has some other burglaries later, but he probably should have just skipped town instead of chasing some teenagers across a cemetery. Barring that lapse in judgment, he does handle the gang well enough. He doesn't try to capture them or anything, but rather he uses his attempts to scare the sleuths as a way to gaslight them into believing that Olivia is in fact the cat creature, which I suppose helps to take off suspicion from himself for a little longer. And he's quite convincing in that. Again, I really appreciate how he sticks to the basic mechanics of how the cat creature is supposed to work in order to sell the curse. Every time he wants to go out, he makes sure to over-medicate Olivia to put her to sleep and then swaps places with her. A lesser monster would forget that halfway into the episode. Yes, Dr. Bell should have just left when he got what he wanted, but at least there is a somewhat justifiable reason for him to stay behind for a little longer, which lessens the negative scoring he would have gotten otherwise. For a plan revolving around roofing his client so he can run around in a fursuit, it's not too bad. This filching feline is gonna find himself with a B. This next one is very basic and very simple, which in and of itself is a nice reprieve from these past crazy schemes. So, Velma's friend Professor Greer has moved into the botanical gardens of Vulture's Claw, in which he is in the process of finalizing a purchase of the peninsula. While there, he discovered that the gardens hide a deposit of oil, making him really want to buy the property even more. With real estate developer Clive Dickerman breathing down his neck to try to buy the gardens himself, despite Greer not quite owning the land yet anyway, the professor decides to scare everyone off to give him time to finish the purchase. I don't even need to go that much further than that, but I will anyway. Greer sets up a shoddy fake lab with a scientific journal containing only a single entry detailing a failed experiment where an unknown scientist turned himself into a mantis monster, a la The Fly, and then he pretends to be said mantis monster, chasing people away. That's as far as his plan goes. Going back to the original premise, this is a scheme that didn't need to exist. Greer was in the process of buying Vulture's Claw and nobody was even capable of canceling it. Paperwork is just being filed away, so it makes no sense to then scare people away for the sake of getting oil that he's going to own himself in like 2 to 3 business days. If anything, dressing up as a mantis monster to chase off visitors and kidnap a teenage girl would damage his ability to purchase the land he wants. This is yet another instance of the Scooby-Doo show season 3 having a monster who should have done nothing to succeed. Except this time, no scheme needed to even be cooked up in the first place. That's not even mentioning how half-assed the whole scientist lore was set up, with non-functioning lab equipment and a clearly faked journal. This entire thing was pointless and poorly done to boot. I don't know what Professor Greer was smoking when he thought this up, but I need some of it. The only thing that this stupid shenanigan's gonna earn Greer is an F. The show changes its tune by giving us the second monster known only as the Phantom. Except this the Phantom is a rejected member of KISS. Well, he's actually Ace Decade, the nephew of the owner of Decade Records. This Nepo baby has been secretly smuggling songs out of the studio in garbage cans to sell them for his own personal profit. To keep people from looking too deep into this, Ace stalks the halls as this funky Phantom, making him the scapegoat for the missing records. However, songwriter Tony Signs learns too much about what's really going on, so Ace kidnaps him. Before he's caught, though, Signs pins a new song spelling out the song smuggler's identity. The new music is discovered by singer Jimmy Lewis, who decides to record it for his friends in Mystery Inc. Ace, who has to possess perfect pitch to achieve this, recognizes the message in the song, sabotages the recording equipment, and steals the sheet music as the Phantom. Problem solved, A+ scheme. Except that there's a copy of the sheet music, so Ace has to race Shaggy and Scooby to get it. He loses that mad dash and pivots to sending threatening messages through the intercom in an effort to form a fake frame job against himself, likely in preparation of someone discovering the music clue. However, he gets a lucky break when the sound engineer determines that the equipment is too far gone to resume the recording session, and almost everyone leaves, giving Ace the opportunity to sneak in and steal the song. Unfortunately for him, this leads to a chase that sees him captured. For an incompetent Nepo baby, Ace actually manages to pull off a clever scheme, robbing records from under his uncle's nose while setting up the Phantom as the fall guy. Plus, he manages to get a couple of wins throughout the episode, successfully stealing the first copy of Signs' songs and setting himself up when it seemed like he would be exposed. It's a nice bit of preemptive planning. The only thing I can hold against him is that he hid Tony in the cafeteria storeroom, a spot where anybody could stumble in and find him, and he doesn't even bother tying him up or gagging him. Other than that, he composed a competent criminal conspiracy, striking a perfect A note. The gang now goes overseas to China, where they encounter an inheritance scam revolving around a monster from the moon. Kim Chow Ling is set to receive his family's jewels and gold upon turning 25 and taking over their palace. However, his uncle Chin wants the treasure for himself, so the night before Kim's 25th birthday, he brings an old family legend to life. Centuries ago, a monster descended upon Rampu, China, upon a beam of moonlight. He wandered into the local palace and started turning all who stepped into his shadow to stone. Mooney then placed a curse upon the family treasure that he'd come back unless the riches are rocketed into the river. Uncle Chin likes that idea, as the current in the surrounding bay carries everything to a cave under the palace, tossing it up on a cliff. This makes it easy for the corrupt Unk to gather up the goods without anybody knowing about it. All he has to do is bring the moon monster to life, spooking Kim into believing the legends and lobbing his legacy into the wash. Chin largely focuses his scares on Shaggy and Scooby, of course, which works at first, as they are good agents of convincing Kim to dump the money. It helps that he also uses one of his old stone carvers to chisel a statue of himself, making it look like the moon monster enacted his curse. However, an issue arises as the episode goes forward. Chin constantly chooses to scare the wrong people. He sticks with Shaggy and Scooby, even though he definitely has to be aware of the others closing in on his concealed coin collecting cave. He should definitely prioritize those people over the goobers goofing off. But what is likely more consequential is that he never actually goes after Kim himself. His nephew is the one who needs to be convinced to dump the treasure so that he can collect it without anybody knowing about it. Yet he only ever shows himself to Kim once, and that instance is pretty brief. In fact, what convinces Kim to legitimately consider tossing the treasure is Shaggy and Scooby drenched in fluorescent powder before the rest of the gang pushes him into doing it for the sake of the trap. Chin at first does a good job reviving the legend of the moon monster, but he isn't around to actually bring the whole scheme home, just chilling in his goon cave until everyone else does his job for him. If he had actually come after Kim, this would have been a great plan, but he got lazy, leading to a still good but not great B. We now turn from the Middle Kingdom to the Floating City, where we find two descendants of Doge Malvolio IV. 500 years ago, the Italian noble had imprisoned an infamous gondolier for treason, but the criminal escaped and led a group of invaders against his captor, burning down the palace. In the blaze, the Doge's treasure vanished, leaving behind only 4 medallions, which were distributed across Venice. In the present, his remaining 2 descendants start attending at the Venice Art Academy together to restore paintings and look for a clue to the hidden treasure. However, one of them, Mario, decides to hide his lineage from his distant cousin Antonio. Mario discovers a portrait of his ancestor as he works, revealing that the medallions combine together to form a key to a hidden room in the Piazza San Marco. And so Mario sets out as the traitorous ghostly gondolier to steal the medallions for himself. Frankly, he does a pretty solid job. He manages to break into the Venice Opera House to steal 1 medallion, get another off screen, kidnap Daphne while she's wearing one from the Academy, and abduct his friend Antonio, who has the final one he needs. He also smartly hides the portrait of the Doge in a secret room so no one else can discover what he had. In order to get around like a ghost, Mario travels in an inflatable gondola that he can quickly inflate and deflate to appear and disappear at will. It's honestly a really well put together scheme that's simple but works. The only reason he fails is thanks to 2 instances of Scooby engaging in the OP superpower of cartoon physics, which I can hardly fault the greedy graduate student for. Maybe the only thing he shouldn't have done is fake his own kidnapping to go after Antonio's medallion, as it inevitably sets up the easy conclusion that he's the ghostly gondolier whenever his captives are eventually either discovered or released. Unless Mario planned on killing them later instead of immediately. But it seems like a marginal issue in planning to me that Mario could just circumvent upon claiming his coveted loot by disappearing. So that leaves our dastardly Doge descendant with an A+. It feels strange to hit a streak of actual specific locations the gang is visiting so close to the end of the show, but here we are. The Scooby crew makes a landfall in San Juan, Puerto Rico, where fishing guide Captain Eddie has just successfully robbed a museum. He dropped the loot into a tunnel underneath, blocking the entrance with a fake phone booth, and carried it to the nearby El Moro fortress, where he now puts the robbed relics in cannonballs attached to parachutes and fires them across the bay at his fishing boat. Then he collects said cannonballs and stores the goods under deck, planning to smuggle all the stolen loot out of the country once it all flies over the investigating detectives. To keep people away as he does this, he dresses up as the deceased 16th century Spanish General Juan Carlos. I hesitate to say ghost because he just looks like a normal guy. I try not to grade against monsters for unbelievable costumes, since despite the inconsistent depiction in that, the show sells the monster costume magic idea, where no matter how unreal some of them look, they are convincing to the characters. Juan Carlos is an exception, however, because it's so easy to just make a face white and make him look ghostly. This guy is literally walking around looking like a lunatic LARPer rather than a scary specter. What's more, the hollow cannonballs seem good in concept, but in practice this would actually be really hard to pull off, especially since Eddie is working by himself. He has to put the ill-gotten goods inside these hollow balls that are able to survive the ignition of gunpowder and launch them across the bay. And then he has to chase them out to his boat so he can collect them. That's a lot of time for the valuables to be floating in the waterway, which we witness having a semi-active nightlife with cargo ships going in and out. Not to mention police patrolling everywhere. It's almost guaranteed that somebody would stumble upon one of these cannonballs and put 2 and 2 together if they don't actually see a cannonball fly from the fortress themselves. This doesn't seem like the most stable of plans, primarily relying on a good amount of luck to succeed. That's not what you want in a good plan, especially of the criminal kind. Once the gang shows up, Eddie does fine, I guess. He mostly chases around Shaggy and Scooby, almost killing them in one instance. He also captures the entire gang in a cave-in, though there's also a secret door there he definitely should have known about. Perhaps his smartest move is at the end of the episode where he pretends to flee, but in reality lures Fred, Velma, and Daphne and a local inspector into a dungeon trap, where he almost gets away with leaving them there forever while he continues his silly plan. Thankfully, Scooby goofs Fred's trap and traps Eddie instead. All that put together, and you have a shaky scheme that relies on either a partner or a lot of luck to succeed, but a solid effort to get rid of the intrepid teen investigators. Though that's still gonna leave Captain Eddie with a D, though. Part of that's probably bias as well. We now go to jolly old England for a sport of tennis. Here, Jimmy Pelton prepares for a championship match at Wimbledon, which he needs to win in order to keep ownership of his family home. The thing is, however, his manager and gatekeeper are trying to sabotage him. This is because they are both descendants from the wizard Anthos, who was driven out of his family home by the Pelton family of ancient times under accusations of witchcraft. Upon losing his home, Anthos declared a curse on the Peltons, plaguing them with bad luck. And his kin Nick and John seek to fulfill their ancestors' revenge. They pretend that Anthos has returned from the grave to haunt Jimmy the night before his match, faking each of their own kidnappings and possible deaths to really mess with his psyche. Then they put the whammy on him by carving multiple wizard staffs in an underground carpenter's workshop, constantly replacing one when the last is broken or abandoned. Then when it comes to the game the next day, Nick replaces Jimmy's specs with a pair that has specialized lenses capable of seeing invisible makeup, making it look like Anthos is sitting in the stands to throw off the tennis player's game. Alright, I'm gonna stop the accent now. That is a ridiculous piece of technology, but sure, yeah, let's assume that is a thing that can possibly work. And when all that fails, Nick as Anthos shows up in the flesh, which somehow only Jimmy reacts to. A freaking wizard announced himself at a tennis match, and people are acting like he doesn't exist. Now, barring how strange this technology is, I guess this scheme works well enough, basically just being a far more needlessly complicated version of the Scorpion's faculty plot against the Globetrotters, and done a little worse. For some reason, Nick focuses a lot of his time chasing around Shaggy, Scooby, and for a bit, Velma, instead of fully focusing on scaring Jimmy. You know, his target. What's more, I don't know why he showed up at the game in person if the whole plan was to rely on the glasses. Sure, Velma swapped the specs out, but there's no way Nick knew about that so soon, and if he did, then why did John stick around way past being useful? It seems like he just got bored, as he wastes time in the locker rooms with Shaggy and Scooby instead of standing courtside menacingly. It also probably would have helped to keep Jimmy up a little later at night so he would be more tired at the game instead of relying solely on the magic glasses. Still though, I guess this is a good enough, though sort of shaky plan that somehow fits together to be mildly clever. These wizarding brothers are gonna get a B. The Scooby-Doo show and this video ends on the Scooby Gang yet again going back to the US-Canada border for like the 15th time now. So naturally, this is a border smuggling scheme. This one is being headed up by Julie, who has commenced a Klondike gold robbery 3 weeks prior to the episode. She sets up shop in an abandoned cabin near the famous bottomless lake, where she uses some plastic explosives to create a cavern at its non-existent bottom, which also causes the water levels to drop and the nearby river to flood. Then as the fabled beast of bottomless lake, she swims the stolen gold down there while scaring off the locals. The gold is then put into crates fitted with inflatable pontoons that are ejected from an airlock into an underwater tunnel and into a stream where a pair of henchmen catch it in a net. That all seems a little overly complicated when sneaking through a forest across the border sounds a little easier and less expensive, and probably less time. But taking the scheme for what it is, I guess it works nice. The explosive mining creates an effect that naturally drives people away from the lake anyways, even without a monster chasing them off, as people come to Bottomless Lake for the really deep lake. Plus a flooded river is not going to be great for the community either. That's really all I have for that. As for when the gang arrives, Julie just jumps down Shaggy and Scooby's throats. She's on their case the entire episode, ever since they stumbled upon her as she walked back to her cabin. Even when it makes more sense to go after the others, she just badgers the boys every time. There's a couple of moments where this is pretty detrimental to her planning, like when she ignores Fred, Daphne, and Velma going down to her hidden cavern to spook the goofs into the lake, which adds more witnesses to her crime, and when she prevents Shaggy from driving away from Bottomless Lake, which is completely counterintuitive to her goals. But there are occasionally times where it works for her benefit, like when she tries to scare Shaggy and Scooby away from LeBeau's gas station to prevent them from getting the scuba gear needed to dive into the lake. I don't know why Julie only targets Shaggy and Scooby, but it's definitely not the smartest move. Maybe she was pissed at them for nearly breaking into her home? Maybe she just hates canines? Or maybe, and this is most likely, this is our first indication of Shaggy's insurmountable riz. This man collects female simps like they're infinity stones. But regardless of the reason, it hurts her ultimate goals. Naturally, we end the classic pre-Scrappy-Doo era of Scooby-Doo on the most middling of scores, giving Julie a C. Well, much like its predecessors, the Scooby-Doo show delivers a consistent amount of decently competent villains. There's a handful that are intentionally written to be absolute morons, which is a nice change of pace, though there are still a fair share of dummies that weren't designed as such. But fortunately, they get balanced out by some more impressive true masterminds. However, we once again see a heavily weighted middle section, with most of the criminals' conspiracies being just fine. And with this show having a significantly greater amount of episodes, that made the B and C sections incredibly crowded, and even harder to read with my bad handwriting, so I apologize there. Still, I'm impressed that even in its early days, Scooby-Doo was able to pull off not just one, but 21 ghosts and ghouls the gang has faced that have put together pretty great plans and carried them out with pretty great competency. And that's not to mention the likely twice the amount of that are still fairly good. So, what have we learned here today? I was gonna make a point about how even kid shows can and should have well-written villains or something, but then there are also bad guys in the show intentionally written to be dim-witted, not to mention the cartoon logic and physics going on at all times. Look, are any of these characters going to join the pantheon of villainous greats? I mean, barring a couple, probably not. We only really remember the monsters from Scooby-Doo, and not really the people behind the mask, and I do think that's for a reason. They're just goobers dressed as monsters. So, I'm kinda left with nothing that substantial to end on. I just wanted to talk about a franchise that I love in a way that at least sort of aligns with the way I do things on the channel. Plus, it's Halloween, and I wanted to have some fun with a shorter, silly video. Obviously, that didn't go fully according to plan. And that being said, I appreciate those of you who stuck around for this long. Thanks for watching, stay blessed, and always remember that boy am I glad that you're frozen in there and that I'm out here and that you're the sheriff and I'm frozen out here and that I'm in there, and I just remembered I'm out here.
What I want to know is where's the caveman?
This video's getting to me. I'll see you next time. Happy Halloween.